Make up mind. Fight.
You know, for a guy who made an entire series about item subcategories in TF2, I've never made it entirely clear what I consider a whole TF2 weapon category to actually be. Basically, I consider a weapon category in TF2 to be any group of weapons that share a unified set of concepts, mechanics, and animations, regardless of what classes they're on. For instance, every rocket launcher and sniper rifle would obviously be a category, in the same way that every backpack, throwable, and set of boots are. It's all about unified designs, equip regions, animations, and concepts. But that's led to a bit of a conundrum, as some TF2 weapons do not share a category with any others. With exception to reskins, let me repeat, with exception to reskins, some TF2 weapons are entirely their own in terms of their concepts and animation sets, and in this video, I want to talk about a few of them. I want to note that the discussion guidelines for this video are incredibly vague and nebulous. Like, do I count things like the beggars, thermal thruster, and shortstop? It was tricky to narrow the discussion down to 4 weapons for this video, so I hope my selection leaves you satisfied. All that said, let's roll.
Don't take it personal when I bullseye an arrow through your skull!
You're gonna try to out-archer me? Good luck with that.
Let's start this video off with one of the hardest weapons I've ever had to talk about for this series. It's an iconic weapon and one of the most subclass facilitating singular tools in the game, yet one that I cannot for the life of me figure out the objective viability and use cases for: the huntsman. This is such a funny weapon concept, being a simple wooden bow and arrow for sniper. I love the thought of this trained, professional, literal hitman choosing to forego one of the most effective and inconspicuous killing tools on offer in favor of an actual piece of caveman technology. But how effective is it? Let's try and figure it out. The huntsman is an unlockable primary weapon for the sniper. Rather than being a sniper rifle, it's a simple recurve bow with a wide assortment of unique stats. At a base, it deals less damage than stock, cannot scope, carries less reserve ammo, and most importantly, is subject to being a projectile weapon. This means that unlike the simple hit-scan bullets fired by other sniper rifles, the huntsman shots have to be tracked and led, and are at the mercy of gravity and travel time. As a few positives, this weapon flourishes in close to mid-range combat, its time to reach max charge is significantly shorter than any other sniper rifle, and its projectile hitbox is about the size of East Texas. This allows it to secure incredibly cheeky, borderline random feeling headshots from pretty much any range. It can still insta-drop any class from full health with a fully charged headshot, and makes blind firing it into crowds of enemies totally effective and worth doing. So that was a brief rundown of the huntsman's stats, but what about its unique mechanics? Well, this weapon is pretty much the projectile older brother to the classic. Rather than simply tap firing, holding mouse 1 will cause the sniper to charge a shot, drawing the arrow back, and releasing mouse 1 will cause him to shoot, with the speed, arc, and damage being proportionate to how long the charge was held. At any point, you can switch weapons or press mouse 2 to cancel a charge, and if you hold mouse 1 for over 5 seconds, the shot will become a misfire and go off in a random direction while also dealing less damage, indicated by the sniper's hands visibly shaking. Additionally, and uniquely for sniper primaries, this weapon can be charged while in midair, enabling some very funny 360 shots. Lastly, friendly pyros can set your arrows on fire, causing them to deal afterburn to enemies struck. Boy, that's a lot of words for some wood. You'd think this was a sleazy romance novel. Regardless, the huntsman is a unique and interesting weapon because its mere existence completely turns the sniper's intended role and game plan on its head. A class who's typically, and controversially, a potent long-range instant killer, instead becomes a close to mid-range skirmisher with the potential for instant kills without the mobility or bulk of the game's other dedicated close-range fighters. I can genuinely, sincerely not tell you how objectively good or bad this weapon is, because it changes Sniper so much that he basically becomes another class. Not a subclass, but the straight up hidden 10th class. If any dedicated sniper mains want to chime in with a more experienced perspective on this thing and tell me if it's actually really good or really bad, I'd genuinely be interested in hearing how you feel about it. As for its application, the huntsman flourishes as a weapon that grants the sniper the ability to fight on the front lines. While this might sound a bit useless, as he's not exactly the tankiest or most mobile class, being able to chunk any class for 120 damage or even outright one-shot them can be a surprisingly effective knowledge check on enemies who think you're helpless. Enemies will frequently see a huntsman sniper as a free kill, and if you're able to line up a shot and put them down, you can handily put them in their place and teach them otherwise. It might seem like a fringe novelty, but you'd be surprised how easily you can rack up kills with this thing when you get in the groove. It's got a bit of an adjustment curve by virtue of being a projectile weapon, but it shouldn't take too long for you to adapt. That said, it is worth noting that the huntsman is not capable of one-shotting light classes with a body shot. Because of this, and the lengthy period between fully charged shots, I would always recommend taking an SMG with this weapon. The bonuses afforded by the Jarate and shields don't really combo that well with this weapon's intended playstyle, and the ability to chunk someone for 120 health and then quickly clean them up with a few SMG bullets is really indispensable. With this combo, you can become a shockingly effective light class counter, and you'll often catch scouts, spies, and other pesky flankers completely off guard. Luckily, this is far from the huntsman's only means of dealing with enemies, as we've ignored a pretty key aspect of this weapon's identity up to this point. The huntsman is really jank. This thing goes by a wide variety of community nicknames, from the Luxman to the,
Yep, with a capital C.
And the reason for this is because it's entirely, almost unavoidably, easy to rack up completely unearned kills and headshots with this thing. For some reason, its projectile hitbox is fucking gargantuan, as is the area that registers as a headshot on enemies with it, so just blind firing this thing in the general direction of enemies can yield surprising results.
I'm going to blind fire an arrow across the battlement to get an epic frag. What am I telling you?
The amount of times I fired a shot, looked away, and heard that distinct crunchy hit sound effect and seen the kill in the kill feed about a second later is simply absurd. I'd imagine this was Valve's way of compensating for the hypothetically high difficulty of lining up shots without a scope, but just like a soldier with a $4,000 unusual, they may have overcompensated a bit. This also makes the huntsman a devastating weapon at point blank range. If an enemy is right up in your face, there's not a lot they can do to avoid an instantaneous headshot from any level of charge, simply due to the size of this weapon's projectile hitbox. If you've ever seen huntsman gameplay on YouTube, you've probably seen the fabled accidental kill, where a player shoots someone they didn't even see or weren't aiming at simply because someone entered their peripheral during a charge. The main thing to keep in mind while using the huntsman is not getting good or learning the optimal play for it. It's to weaponize the jank. Use the jank, sniper. It's your best friend. This thing is kind of an uncontested weapon in terms of granting hype, oh shit, that killed type of moments in TF2. Ain't nothing quite like throwing out a Hail Mary arrow in a life or death situation and instantly dropping whoever was pestering you. Or on the flip side, sending an arrow across the map and killing someone in a different area code that you're not even sure existed or which class they were playing. This is, at the very least, an extremely fun and novel weapon that definitely brings the laughs. All in all, the huntsman is a conceptually simple weapon with a bizarre contextual place in the game and an equally bizarre execution. The thought of giving the game's dedicated long-range sniper character a mid-range skirmisher replacement for a sniper rifle is really wild, and something that I'm surprised the game went for, especially as early as 2009. There's a reason that this is one of the most standout and iconic weapons in the game. That said, I also understand why Valve never added another bow with unique stats. Let me repeat, with unique stats to the game, as this one kind of barely functions, and I can't really think of any ways you could iterate on its design outside of simple number adjustments. It's definitely jank, not perfect for every situation, and kind of spits in the face of sniper as a class, but I'd be lying if I said that I didn't value the huntsman's place in TF2. It's a quintessential charming TF2 weapon, and one that I genuinely can't imagine the game without, until I die to it, then screw this thing.
Hey, Patrick, what am I now?
Stupid?
No, I'm Texas.
What's the difference?
So, you know how the engineer famously only has 3 unique secondary weapons and only 2 aside from his stock pistol? I'm not gonna lie to you folks, both of his unlockable secondaries are in this video. Somehow, Valve made every option within this class's secondary slot a unique category weapon. Let's start out with the much more iconic and much more reviled one of the two, the Wrangler. The Wrangler needs no introduction. It's simultaneously one of the most ubiquitous and widely hated weapons in TF2. A tool that's infamous for facilitating extremely tanky engineer nests at the cost of virtually nothing to the engineer. Let's discuss the Wrangler. Also, I know there's like a 30-minute deep dive about this weapon with millions of views made by a widely respected professional engineer main YouTuber out there, but let's just ignore that for now. The Wrangler is an unlockable secondary weapon for Engineer. A small satellite dish attached to an Atari controller, this weapon allows the Engineer to take manual control of his sentry gun. What this actually means isn't made entirely clear by the weapon's tooltip, but in essence, using the Wrangler while the Engineer has a sentry up allows the Engineer to control where his usually automated sentry gun aims, being able to aim it and fire at his own discretion. This allows him to effectively pick off key targets, focus potential hazards, and most importantly, pester enemies outside of his sentry's normal range. On top of this, the Wrangler comes with a modified aim assist, with the sentry auto-locking its aim onto enemies within the immediate vicinity of the Engineer's crosshair. In addition, the Wrangler grants the sentry a shield while it's active, which reduces all incoming damage and repairs by a whopping 66%, giving sentries 2/3 more tankiness at the cost of also giving them 2/3 less healing. And lastly, sentries are disabled for 3 seconds after the Wrangler is taken off of them, even in the event that the Engineer dies while having it out. Oh yeah, this thing also increases your sentry gun's firing rate while it's being wrangled for good measure. The blue team had better watch out. This laser pointer has made many hefty promises. For real, the Wrangler might come off as a somewhat innocuous weapon, like taking manual control of your sentry gun might not seem like a huge deal, but rest assured, this thing single-handedly facilitates the entire defensive Engineer playstyle, but never for the reason you might think. Also, fun fact, I personally don't really like it. Not just fighting against it, that's obvious, but I also really don't like using the Wrangler. I'm not even trying to be a contrarian or epically set myself apart from Uncle Dane's video YouTuber style. I've just never really liked using this thing. I've always found the Wrangler to be incredibly powerful in its secondary purpose, but kind of clumsy and not very fun in its intended purpose. The shield is inarguably huge, granting the most powerful and effective area denial tool in the game access to what's essentially 2/3 more health is pretty insane, and turns a lot of what are otherwise the sentry gun's biggest counters on their heads. Outside of 8 sticky bombs, there's not a lot that can contend with a wrangled or tanked level 3 sentry. The Herculean effort required by the enemy to output enough damage to kill your sentry is simply not proportionate to the amount of required investment on the Engineer's part. When sentries start being able to tank full heavy Ubers and direct hit clips, I kind of start raising an eyebrow. The intended negative of the sentry receiving 66% less healing is kind of mitigated by the disproportionate impact of healing versus damage. The enemy team has limited ammo and limited time windows to deal enough damage to a wrangled sentry gun, whereas an Engineer with a nearby dispenser has virtually unlimited metal with which to keep healing it, especially with the Rescue Ranger, or god forbid, a cooperative friendly Engineer. Even if it's being done at a significantly weakened rate, an Engineer tanking a sentry gun with the Wrangler will be able to output more healing than the enemy can damage off without an extremely coordinated push. And the biggest problem with this is that the Engineer doesn't have to do a whole lot. The enemy team might have to spend minutes of a match coordinating a push, building banner and Uber, and putting themselves in the perfect position to attack, whereas the Engineer just has to have the Wrangler equipped to completely shut them down. This is a fundamentally lopsided imbalance of effort within the game's design, and one that a single unlockable weapon should not be able to passively facilitate. The shield is just a poorly conceived and very overtuned stat that I feel doesn't entirely mesh with this weapon's core or intended design, and as a result can feel pretty damn broken in the right circumstances. Now, back to what I said about not liking using this thing. The shield is obviously strong and the best thing about it, but I'd be lying if I said I particularly enjoyed taking manual control of my sentry gun. To me, it's always seemed a bit too game state and map dependent. In situations where you've only got 1 or 2 areas to focus on, it's incredibly strong, but on map stage with a lot of flanks or areas for enemies to attack from, I find that pulling out the Wrangler can often lead to choice anxiety as I try to pinpoint which enemy is most important to target, while also simultaneously making me as the Engineer more vulnerable. Without the cover of an auto-aiming death machine, there's not much stopping a particularly aggressive scout or soldier from bombing in on me, thus requiring me to take my attention off of my sentry gun or the enemies I was just fighting to deal with them. On top of that, I've never been able to fully adjust to aiming with the Wrangler. This is totally a me thing, I realize, a total Ullapool skill issue, but having my crosshair and the origin of my gunfire come from 2 separate sources really disorients me, and I often find myself unable to fully capitalize on powerful Wrangler spots because I just can't adjust in the moment. Again, totally a me thing, but it ultimately results in actually using the Wrangler for fighting enemies to feel exceptionally clumsy, sloppy, and inconsistent to me. Whenever I use it, I often only find myself whipping it out to tank Ubers, pester faraway enemies, and rarely jump. This is probably my favorite thing about the Wrangler, the elusive sentry jump. While it's not anywhere near as safe or practical as a rocket or a sticky jump, being able to blast yourself up to a high, unexpected position and rescue ranger your sentry to it is really fun. It enables some absolute absolutely insane sentry spots and in-the-moment plays, and aside from the shield, is the trait that I find the most beneficial about the Wrangler. I know Uncle Dane proposed this in his video, and I'm trying really hard not to just quote that video here, but a dedicated sentry jumper or no self-damage on the Wrangler stat would be really cool. All things considered, the Wrangler is a lopsided weapon that's primary positive is disproportionately situational compared to its much stronger passive secondary abilities. The shield is absolutely ludicrous, and turns its already one of the deadliest area denial forces in the game into a nigh unkillable wall of damage. By comparison, I find the taking manual control of your sentry stat to be much more situational and difficult to capitalize on, with its best case scenario being a likely unintended bit of movement tech. The Wrangler is an incredibly backloaded weapon that facilitates a ton of plays and tech for the engineer, yet in its rawest state is also his most brain-dead tanking tool. It's a favorite of nobody besides dedicated defensive engineer mains, and is a clear choice for one of TF2's most hated weapons. At least we can play Pitfall with it though.
Nice. Fucking beautiful.
Electronic, supersonic, supersonic, electronic.
The Short Circuit is Engineer's other unlockable secondary for this video, and I know what you might be thinking. Shouldn't it be disqualified for technically sharing animations with the pistol? But joke's on you, dumbass. That's not a pistol. That's a plug. Jokes aside, the Short Circuit is a super unique weapon in TF2 and stands entirely on its own in both concept and design. Also, not unlike the Von Erich family and hit wrestling biopic drama The Iron Claw, this weapon couldn't escape in your constant stream of misfortunes within a comparatively small time frame. This weapon was being significantly changed by Valve in virtually every major TF2 update right up until they stopped balancing the game, and as a result, its current version bears almost no gameplay resemblance to its original iteration. But just what is the Short Circuit, and is it any good in spite of all that? Let's find out. The Short Circuit is an unlockable secondary weapon for Engineer, a strange plug-like apparatus that replaces the Engineer's right arm. This weapon's primary fire shoots out a small burst of electrical energy that deals 10 damage to enemies immediately in front of the Engineer, and consumes 5 of its metal as ammo. As an alternative choice, pressing right-click with this weapon consumes 65 metal to blast a slow-moving ball of electrical energy that cannot be stopped save for obstacles and being reflected, deals 15 damage every half second to anyone in its path, and most importantly, deletes any projectiles it crosses paths with. As a few trade-offs, this weapon cannot crit under any circumstances, deals pitiful damage to buildings, and uses the Engineer's metal reserve for its ammo. So, full disclosure, this weapon's primary attack is virtually useless, and I don't think I recorded more than 2 or 3 clips of me using it. It's an incredibly short-range, narrow, pitifully weak little zapper that has no application outside of being a literal mosquito to enemies. I've heard some people propose removing the primary attack altogether, but I'm not a huge fan of this idea, as I think it would give new players a much worse understanding of this weapon's intended purpose and the uses of its much more important alternative attack. If this thing was on Mouse 1, you know that every little Timmy you found it through random drop would be spamming it. As for that alternative attack, it's the main thing you want to be doing with this weapon. It's such a bizarre concept, being this huge anime-esque full power energy ball that travels in an unstoppable path for a few seconds before bursting. I'd make the Mega Man joke, but I already did. As for the applications of the energy ball, they're actually pretty layered. For one, the ball passes through enemies and can't be stopped by anything but walls, map objects, and being reflected before bursting, and it deals damage to anyone caught in its path at a rate of 15 damage every half second, so while a single tick isn't that amazing, if you manage to line this thing up in the path of a fleeing enemy or group of enemies or use it as a gap closer, then you can really soften people up for eventual kills. In addition, the ball's primary application is deleting projectiles. This might seem like it's transparently designed to help your sentry survive, as you can delete a wave of spam as it comes your way to destroy your nest, but in actuality, this is pretty damn wasteful, as you're not preventing too much damage you couldn't more easily and cheaply heal off by just tanking your gun with your wrench, and the cost of 65 metal per ball makes this strategy all around not great. No, I found that the actual best case scenario for the Short Circuit is as an incredibly aggressive, team-oriented pushing tool. If you're situated on a cart where you're granted infinite metal at the rate of a small dispenser, there is nothing stopping you from throwing out ball after ball at no cost. This makes the usual strategies of spamming contested points and carts with projectiles and explosives pretty damn ineffective, as you have a constant wave of delete beams flying in every direction for the enemies trying to stop you. You can be a very effective shield for your team with this thing, preventing damage and cleaning up projectiles so long as you have metal to spare. It's a bit hard harder on non-payload maps as you don't have a constant stream of metal, but even then, with conservative and patient use of the energy ball and backing support of your team, ammo packs from defeated players shouldn't be too hard to come by. On top of that, this weapon significantly levels the playing field between engineer and projectile classes in fights. What's usually an easy 2-rocket stomp for an enemy soldier becomes a much trickier, more mind game heavy duel, as both players assess their options and wait for the right opportunities to strike. This might sound familiar, as it's basically the soldier v pyro matchup. It's also very funny to delete a soldier's rocket as he jumps to make him crater. I've been talking about soldier a lot so far, but this weapon also crushes Demo Man. A single energy ball can delete an entire sticky trap in one fell swoop, and a spam happy demo will quickly find his strategy crumbling in the face of the delete ball menacingly floating towards him.
What could be worse than a giant bubble?
Oh, I know. 2 giant bubbles.
This weapon effectively turns engineers' typical hard counters on their heads, but in a much more interesting and skill-intensive way than the Wrangler. One last application I want to note for this weapon is probably its most commonly known one, which is its unique utility at clearing spawn gates at the start of rounds. If you know, you know. Dust Bowl first matches were never the same after 2018. Being able to spam out energy balls and erase all manner of crit-boosted pipes and rockets while also clearing sticky traps is very funny when you do it right, and infuriating when it happens to you. This is definitely a less universal use case and depends heavily on the map and game state, but is still a use case nonetheless. Now, I just said a lot of positive things about the short circuit, but rest assured, this thing is not engineer's best secondary, and it does have quite a few concrete bits of counterplay and negatives that keep it in check. For one, bullets completely shut it down. Against a heavy scout, sniper, or enemy engineer, your energy ball is nothing but a brightly colored distraction that means them no bother. Same for fire. They can still kill you all the same. On top of that, the 65 metal per ball cost is very pricey, and means that any observant enemy can very easily gauge when you've expended your entire supply after 3 shots and attack accordingly. This weapon mandates extremely patient, careful use of its energy balls, and just randomly chucking them out there as soon as you leave spawn will mean swiftly running out. All said and done, the short circuit is a very cool, very thought-intensive weapon that really livens up some of Engineer's more problem aspects as a class. Its use cases might be a bit more specialized in the much more flexible pistol and much more universally useful Wrangler, but in the right hands and game state, this is a frighteningly potent tool that can allow Engineer to go one-on-one with some of his most dangerous hard counters. It's not a must-equip, but it's far from a gimmicky novelty and can absolutely put work in. Also, I'm sorry I called you a dumbass earlier. Unless you're a soldier or demo main who's mad at me for this section, in which case I'm absolutely not sorry.
Charge your gun! Oh, right!
Our last weapon for this video is the Righteous Bison, and I'll be brutally honest, I do not understand or like this weapon one bit. I've already covered its tumultuous update history in my Weapons Valve Actively Hates video, but for a brief synopsis, Valve seems to really despise it, hitting it with a steady stream of potent nerfs throughout the years and passing these changes off as bug fixes, despite the game itself actively stating that they weren't intended mechanics. This weapon was almost always viewed as a funny novelty and not a serious contender within the game's highest levels of play, so Valve's explicitly targeted nerf campaign against it was puzzling to say the least. But where does that leave it now? Let's try and figure it out. The Righteous Bison is an unlockable weapon for the soldier. A small, retro-futuristic ray gun with a pumping mechanism, it fires a slow-moving projectile that cannot be reflected under any circumstances, passes through enemies, and hypothetically has no limits in the number of times it can hit a single player. On top of this, the Righteous Bison doesn't require ammo save for needing to reload after 4 shots, giving it an infinite ammo reserve. As a few trade-offs, this weapon deals pitiful per tick damage, it deals even less damage to buildings, and its projectile is incredibly slow, disjointed, buggy, and difficult to line up. All of this might sound pretty reminiscent of the Short Circuit's alternate attack, firing a slow-moving projectile that passes through enemies and hits multiple times, but whereas the Short Circuit fired a large, linear energy ball that organically passed through targets and effectively dealt multiple ticks of damage within its radius, the Righteous Bison does none of that. I'll put it plainly, this weapon is absolutely fucking terrible, and I have no idea what its intended use case or best application is. I know it has its fans, I know it has its truthers, and I know it has people who swear by it, but from my experience, everything, let me repeat, everything this weapon does is done better by other options in the soldier's lineup. For the life of me, I cannot figure out why you would ever equip it or pull it out in a fight. For starters, the damage is both startlingly inconsistent and very low at the same time. I swear, from any range, I was unable to connect more than 1 or 2 ticks on any given enemy, and the plotting pace and small size of the projectile made it borderline impossible for it to effectively rack up damage in the same way as the Short Circuit. I actually don't understand the intended design or vision for this thing, thing, since Valve claims that its base damage is 20 and that it's unlimited in the amount of times it could hit an enemy, but I was hitting for anywhere from 20 to a maximum of 48 damage every time I fired it, with seemingly no rhyme or reason as to how much damage each shot would do. On top of that, the projectile is alarmingly slow and borderline impossible to line up beyond close range. It has an insanely lengthy wind-up period after you've actually pressed mouse 1 before the projectile actually comes out, and by that point, it's committed to a straight arc that the enemy can easily dodge. I know everyone got mad at me for my bison aim and my weapons Valve actively hates video, but rest assured, this is the experience of using the bison. The only time shots are at all easy to consistently land is at point-blank range or in choke points, and at that point, you're dealing more damage by hitting enemies with your melee or your rocket launcher. The unlimited ammo doesn't really matter when you're not able to connect any of your 4 shots, and even if you do, the reward is a paltry 20 to 50 damage from any range. This is the biggest problem with the Righteous Bison. There is no reason to equip it over other soldier options. Anything that the Righteous Bison does is done better and more consistently by soldiers' other secondaries. An unreflectable close-range pyro counter, shotgun, a combo tool, reserve shooter, a trapping tool. You have a fucking rocket launcher that does splash damage. The Righteous Bison offers nothing outside of funny memes and quote-unquote styling on your enemies, and I don't know about y'all, but I generally prefer weapons that I can actually use over haha funnies. I dislike Fat Scout for the same reason. I'm not a big fan of handicapping myself for the funny. If a weapon's bad but also fun to use, I'll absolutely give it a try, but this weapon is neither fun nor funny from my experience. It's just very bad and very frustrating. I fully realize that the Bison does have fans and is a popular weapon in spite of its issues, but for me, I just can't rationalize using it. Valve's targeted nerfs against it, combined with its already lackluster damage and jank, results in a weapon that feels borderline unusable, and anytime I whip it out in a fight, I often feel as though I'm either actively handicapping myself or straight up throwing. Why would I not just shoot enemies with my rocket launcher? Why would I not just bring a banner or a shotgun? I understand that games are supposed to be fun and that you can't be a meta slave or always play optimally, but considering that I find the Bison to be neither fun or optimal, I think I can personally go without it. All in all, the Righteous Bison is a bad weapon. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. I've heard people propose a lot of potential use cases for it, from a trapping tool to a follow-up tool, but from my experience, the juice is never worth the squeeze of this weapon. I don't find any ironic meme enjoyment in it like I would with something like the Ullapool Caber. It's just an all-around anti-fun throw weapon, and a possible contender for my least favorite weapon in the game. I apologize that this video turned into a stealth bombing assassination mission against the Righteous Bison. I promise my next video will be more positive all around. But if you like it, more power to you. Never let some dumb shit casual YouTuber tell you what weapons to enjoy. I may dislike it, but this weapon can still be righteous to you. And that's a few wholly unique TF2 weapons. Weapons that don't share their categories or mechanics with any other weapons in the game. Between the Wrangler and Short Circuit being great, the Huntsman being gimmicky if fun, and the Righteous Bison being that, I think it's safe to say that these weapons stand comfortably on their own within TF2's lineup of weapons, even in spite of their unique stats. I honestly kind of love that TF2 is such a varied game in terms of its weapon design. The Valve could go out of their way to design a bunch of unique mechanics and animation sets for a few singular items. It really goes to show how unique and one-of-a-kind this game is, or at least was, and I for one welcome anything that makes this already one-of-a-kind game stand out even more. Even if I'm not a huge fan of the Righteous Bison, I would never want it removed. Thanks, hope you have a fantastic day before, during, and after watching, and I'll catch you all later. Cheers! Team Fortress 2, as a game, has a tumultuous relationship with the concept of knockback. Between Pyro's air blast, Soldier and Demo Man's explosives, and virtually every weapon in the game being capable of hitting people around, the TF2 community is well acquainted with being bounced around like beach balls in the average player versus player match. Because of this, you'd probably think that TF2 doesn't have much of a need for dedicated special case weapons that feature knockback as a core part of their designs, but you'd be wrong. TF2 actually has exactly 3 weapons with dedicated knockback mechanics, and they range in reception from gimmicky novelties to widely hated so-called crutches. In this video, I want to talk about them. Please note that we're not discussing literally every weapon in the game capable of inducing knockback or CC, as again, that's virtually every weapon in the game, and are instead focusing on ones that have knockback featured as one of their advertised stats in their tooltip. That said, let's roll. Ah yeah, you know we had to start here. If there's one TF2 weapon that's synonymous with the concept of knockback, it would definitely be Scout's
Force of Nature.
In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if some people watching this video thought this was the only one of these in the game. Regardless, the Force of Nature is an iconic weapon within Scout's lineup. Not only was it added all the way back in 2009 Scout update, making it one of the oldest unlockable weapons in the game, but its name also references what's arguably Scout's most iconic quote. I think you'd have a hard time finding someone who outwardly hates the Force of Nature and its unique knockback mechanics, either on the using it or fighting against its sides. Even famous curmudgeon Great Blue came around on it while actively working on a section of a video about why he disliked it. Everything's coming up Force of Nature, but why is that? Let's find out. The Force of Nature is an unlockable primary weapon for the Scout, a double-barrel sawed-off shotgun. Not unlike the soda popper, it only loads a maximum of 2 shots at a time compared to stock 6, and features a lengthy reload between clips. On top of this, it also features a flat 10% damage penalty. Has a few aspects to compensate. This weapon fires significantly faster than stock, allowing it to dump both of its shots in rapid succession into a single target, and it features more pellets per shot, which, should they all connect, actually offsets its per shot damage penalty. Most importantly though, it deals knockback with each shot. This knockback is contingent on the Scout's position when the shot is fired, with enemy shot being blasted further away the closer they are to the Scout, and the Scout being knocked backwards should he fire it in the air. This enables some very fun and cheeky third jump tech, and augments the Scout's already potent mobility even further. Right off the bat, we have something important to note here. It's a very often echoed sentiment in the TF2 community that, despite the Force of Nature having a damage penalty, the 20% extra pellets per shot actually mitigates this and causes it to deal more damage. This is
Technically correct. The best kind of correct.
but not entirely true in practice. If every pellet from a Force of Nature shot connects, then it does indeed deal a higher per shot damage than stock, but this will only ever happen in the first shot on point blank range, especially on servers with random bullet spread enabled, and the weapon's small clip size and slow reload speed actually result in a significantly lower DPS than stock. While it does technically deal more damage than stock, if the stars align, this will not happen every time you fire it. As a result, this weapon noticeably struggles in sustained battles or dealing with larger numbers of enemies. Against tanky classes or groups of enemies that can't reliably be dropped with your 2 allotted shots, you're left pretty naked using the Force of Nature. It doesn't have the rapid damage output or flexibility of a lot of Scout's other primary options, and does not flourish in every game state. As a purely combat-oriented, damage-dealing, kill-securing primary, this weapon pales in comparison to stock and its cousin weapon, the soda popper. Sounds pretty rough, right? Well, not really, because despite all of this, I actually really like the Force of Nature, and it's entirely due to the namesake of this video and its primary mechanic. The Force of Nature's knockback is one of the most weapon-defining singular stats in the game. This is one of those stats that changes your entire class's playstyle on its own, rather than just being a simple number adjustment. It's also really goddamn fun. At a base, the knockback blasts enemies away based on where they are relevant to the Scout when they're shot, so if they're right up against you, they'll go flying, and if they're far away, they'll barely be affected. This makes hefty hit-and-run attacks against key targets entirely viable and effective. Rushing in, blasting someone to a different area code, while also dealing over 100 damage in their HP, and using the space you've put between you and them to either beat a hasty retreat or clean them up. It's incredibly disorienting to be blasted by this thing, and an opportunistic Scout player will always capitalize on that. In addition, this weapon flourishes not on the front lines, but on the flank. If you run into a Force of Nature Scout on the flank and you're by yourself, then you're in a pretty bad position, as if the Scout can connect his shots, then he controls the pace and flow of the battle. You can't rightly try to secure an advantageous position or control neutral when the Scout is capable of instantly displacing you with a well-placed meat shot. It's the Scout who gets to decide where the battle begins and ends, so long as he can land that first shot. This weapon is pretty uncommon and casual, so it's entirely possible to be thrown for a crushing loop when you eventually do get hit by it. It does less damage for sure, but is also far from a dedicated utility weapon, and is still very capable of facilitating some very aggressive play. And we haven't even talked about mobility yet, which might just be the strongest thing about this weapon. By looking down or behind you and firing a shot with the Force of Nature while in midair, you can perform what's essentially a third jump. And this isn't some unintended bit of Source Engine movement jank like shrimping. This is an explicitly intended aspect of this weapon's design. Scout literally has voice lines for it. But yeah, would you believe that giving the most mobile class in the game immediate risk-free access to even more mobility is kind of insane? With the third jump, Scout becomes adept at clearing huge distances and reaching places that even he's not supposed TF2, and when combined with this weapon's power on the flank can make him a real menace. Plus, this weapon's knockback also allows players to take advantage of their environment to secure some cheeky kill confirms. Not only is it totally possible and very funny to launch enemies to their deaths on maps with pits or hazards, shoutouts to Upward, but you can also really effectively secure kills by blasting enemies into walls to anchor them in place for a crushing, unavoidable follow-up. It's a pretty common criticism of the Force of Nature that the knockback frequently pushes enemies out of your effective double tap range, but with smart positioning and use of your environment, there are ways around it. I honestly really appreciate how intuitive and simple to grasp this weapon's concept is. Like, when you hear shotgun that does knockback, the Force of Nature does pretty much everything you'd expect it to. I can understand why a weapon like this was added in Scout's first significant update, as it's a really genius and intuitive design that functions exactly how you'd want. I'm sure Valve was really excited to get this thing pushed out. So between added mobility, advanced tech, ability to displace enemies on command, ability to control the pace of 1v1s, and all-around utility for both aggressive and strategic play, I'd consider the Force of Nature's knockback to be one of the most layered singular mechanics in TF2, and one that handily grants its host weapon a ton of merit. While I know the opening of this Force of Nature segment skewed a bit negative, that was only me discussing it before the knockback had been put into play, because once you add it to the discussion, the scales are decisively tipped in this weapon's favor. It's a very fun weapon that rewards experimentation in spades. I'm never gonna argue that it's meta, best in slot, or even anything much more than a fun gimmick, but I'll be damned, it's a very fun gimmick. It's not a weapon that I bust out often, but one that I frequently do get the itch to try out and push some folks around with. While it may just seem like a fringe novelty, this weapon is honestly one of Scout's more interesting and layered primaries, and opens up so many avenues for a player who knows how to capitalize on its unique strengths. It might be a bit gimmicky, but there's a reason that this weapon earned its name.
Grass grows, birds fly, sun shines, and brother, I hurt people.
Loose cannon cop, who doesn't play by the rules?
From a very intuitive and simple weapon to one of the most loaded designs in the entire game, the loose cannon. Yes, this weapon does deal knockback and does feature it as one of its primary mechanics. This weapon is also one that some people fucking love. Like, this thing is right up there with the Beggar's Bazooka as a weapon that some TF2 players basically center their entire personalities around using. It's inarguably a cult classic weapon, yet not unlike the Force of Nature, it's also definitely a bit gimmicky, so we're gonna try and suss out exactly what makes this bomb tick. Let's dive in. The loose cannon is an unlockable primary weapon for Demo Man. A large cartoonish pirate ship cannon, this weapon fires equally large cartoonish cannonballs that, unlike Demo Man's other grenades, do not explode on impact with an enemy. Rather, an enemy hit with a loose cannonball will receive 50 damage and a hefty bit of knockback, with the ball exploding on its own after a second. The Demo Man can hold M1 to run down the bomb's fuse while it's still chambered before firing, allowing him to time the explosion and maximize damage. Should a player hit an enemy with both the ball itself and the explosion within a half second of each other, they'll be rewarded with a unique double donk mechanic, at which a loud sound effect will play and a unique particle effect will appear, with the enemy suffering a guaranteed mini crit. The damage of both the direct hit and the mini crit explosion combined is actually enough to one-shot light classes from full health, and this combined with the weapon's knockback can allow for some very cheeky kill confirms. Now, that's the weapon's baseline stats and mechanics, but it's worth noting that the loose cannon is also a particularly misleading weapon. Not buggy, though that reload animation could definitely use some work, but just misleading. Its stats mention that its cannonballs travel 20% faster than stock, but due to TF2's projectile physics and the large cannonball model, it actually travels noticeably slower in practice. In addition, the cannonballs share their projectile hitbox with the much smaller stock grenades, making the effective area to actually hit enemies much tinier than the cannonball model would lead you to believe. So basically, the cannonball model is like me in my day-to-day, in that it inadvertently causes a ton of problems by just existing. Because of this, there's about 5 or 6 necessary skill checks to even begin using the loose cannon. You need to understand its mechanics, you need to know about its unique technical quirks, you need to be able to land pills at a base, you need to also be able to adjust to landing cannonballs specifically, you need to be able to time the fuse to maximize damage, you need to be able to gauge the perfect distance between you and your enemy to secure a double donk, and you need to be able to follow up on that double donk to secure kills on non-light classes. This weapon asks a lot of the player to even begin grasping it at a base foundational level. I can kind of understand why so many people seem to have formed a cult around this weapon. I'd probably never shut up about it if I got good at it too. But yeah, the loose cannon is not an easy weapon to get to grips with. Luckily, it pays off that significant learning and adaptation curve with some of the most fun and satisfying feedback in the game. I'm not gonna pretend this weapon is amazing. It consistently outputs less DPS ass with a bigger skill floor and investment than stock, but that's not what the loose cannon is about, man. This is a bona fide fun out of 10 weapon. The kind where you don't care if it's suboptimal or non-meta because it's just so goddamn fun. Remember when I made fun of the Righteous Bison and said that a weapon needed to be either good or fun at a base to be worth using? Well, this is the weapon I was thinking about when I said that. The loose cannon is a weapon that trades the consistent reliability of 100 damage pipes for a playstyle that features dizzying highs, terrifying lows, and creamy middles. It'll definitely be rough at first, as you miss every cannonball you fire out and only secure the occasional kill when an enemy walks into one of your bombs, but when everything clicks and you start securing double donk after double donk, nothing can match it. Valve knew what they were doing, giving this weapon a unique sound and particle effect for successful donks. They know how to get a guy hooked. Combine that with a very fun knockback mechanic and a surprisingly versatile fuse charging ability, and you've got a recipe for one fun weapon. That's not to say that it's only useful as a goofy, silly weapon though, as the loose cannon does have genuine standalone use cases that no other demo primaries share. For one, being able to manually detonate your bombs allows you to hit enemies around corners or behind cover with airburst explosives without sacrificing your sticky trap. This can be really effective for pestering enemies off of points or forcing them to engage, at which point you can fight them from a much more advantageous position one-on-one. It's basically Demo Man's equivalent to Pyro's detonator, being able to manually airburst projectiles whenever you may need. It's especially valuable due to not requiring any investment from your secondary, so you can keep stickies placed or have a fallback shield for an escape. On top of that, the ability to one-shot light classes is undeniably powerful. Non-instant kill weapons in TF2 that can one-shot are kind of few and far between, so being able to catch particularly aggressive flankers and overextending enemies off guard with a Hail Mary double donk is really satisfying. It's also a pretty effective flex, as it does genuinely require skill, positioning, and timing to pull off double donks consistently. 131 damage in a single projectile is nothing to scoff at, and with potentially 4 of them at your disposal at all times, you're rocking some pretty potent killing power. It takes some time to get into the groove, but once you start landing them, you'll never be able to look back. Lastly, for positives, and to call back to the namesake of this video, the knockback is genuinely incredibly helpful. I've had situations where I've effectively no-sold Ubers by just donking the shit out of the medic and his heal target to keep them at bay. Being able to displace enemies from a distance without placing yourself at risk, with the potential for huge chunks of damage or outright one-shots along the way, is unironically really huge. I can't say that the knockback comes into play for this weapon as much as it does the other two in this video, but it's still a helpful stat when it does come in clutch. However, the loose cannon does have some pretty noteworthy downsides that keep it from being a genuine contender within Demo Man's primary slot at serious levels of play, and they mainly come down to its lack of raw damage against enemies that it can't one-shot. Against tankier classes, there's not really much you can do to outpace their damage, and in the event that they're still alive after a double donk, you're left incredibly exposed. The knockback is kind of a double-edged sword here, as hitting them with the initial donk likely knock them out of range for a second one. Compare this to the reliable consistency of any other grenade launcher, which require at most 2 direct hit pipes to kill 8 of the game's 9 classes from full health. Also, this weapon really sucks at destroying sentries. You can't knock them back or double donk them, so you're left shooting 50 damage peanuts at them and hoping the explosive damage adds up enough to finish the job before the engineer can heal it off. But regardless of anything else, the loose cannon is just kind of a fun and very satisfying weapon. This is the TF2 equivalent to like that cool bachelor uncle everyone wishes they were. He's not entirely put together and kind of coasts along on hope and good vibes, but he's just so charming, fun, and well-meaning that everyone likes having him around. I'd be exaggerating if I called the loose cannon a great weapon. Its steep learning curve, bugs, gimmicky nature, and lack of consistency compared to stock kind of keep it from being anywhere near a serious contender. But it is very much a weapon I enjoy, and one that I would strongly advocate for earnestly getting good at. It brings such a unique flavor to the average TF2 match, and always manages to put a smile on my face when I use it. The loose cannon is not great, it's not terrible, it's just very, very fun. And that's what matters. Until I get Ubered and fumble all of my shots.
Burn to the ground! Burn to the ground! Burn to the ground! Burn!
And finally, we've arrived at what I'm sure will be the most popular and least controversial weapon in this video. The Scorch shot. If you've never played TF2 or haven't had much exposure to this weapon, you'd probably be forgiven for looking at its stats and thinking absolutely nothing of it. What, it's a flare gun that knocks enemies back on hit and does like 20 damage. Big whoop, wanna fight about it? Doesn't seem like much. However, in practice, you'll come to find that the Scorch shot is actually one of the most hated and widely contested weapons in the game. People despise despise the Scorch shot. But why is that? What did this little gun do to earn such vitriol? Let's find out. Well, the Scorch shot is an unlockable secondary for Pyro, a small flare gun with a different paint job than Pyro's other options. This weapon fires flares that deal 35% less damage than its alternatives and have 35% less self-knockback force on jump than the detonator. While these two stats might seem pretty damning, trust me, this weapon more than compensates. For one, its flares deal knockback to enemies on direct hit and explode upon impact with the ground, allowing it to do something similar to the detonator and double tap enemies with both a knockback direct hit and an explosion afterwards. On top of this, its knockback force and its damage are both amplified on burning players, with it dealing additional knockback and a guaranteed mini crit if you hit anyone who's on fire with it. On top of this, it'll explode when it touches the ground regardless of if it hit an enemy, allowing you to blind fire it in the general direction of enemies to ignite people with splash damage. This weapon also has a flat 60 afterburn damage or 75 with a mini crit and can destroy sticky bombs because it definitely needed that. So what you should have gathered from all that is that the Scorch shot is an incredibly front-loaded weapon. While it does deal less damage, it's also a knockback weapon, a guaranteed mini-crit weapon, a fire damage weapon with a guaranteed 60 damage and afterburn, and an explosive weapon that can ignite multiple enemies at the same time and combo players with singular shots. Simply put, this thing does a whole lot for what's essentially just a differently painted flare gun. Gone are the days of carefully lining up flare punches and perfectly airbursting your detonator shots. The Scorch shot does all of that for you and more with only one input. Starting from the top, the knockback is huge. It's basically what I said about the loose cannon being capable of no-selling enemies and displacing them from a distance, but applied to a much easier to land, faster, longer range, and more consistent projectile that also ignites enemies and doesn't explode after a set distance or time. The potential for a single well-placed shot to completely throw off an enemy's push is staggering, and if you can consistently land shots, you can basically stun lock someone as you rapidly strike them with what are essentially back-to-back direct hit into explosive combos. This weapon's knockback is an incredibly versatile trait, and one that's only made stronger by its double tapping potential and amplified nature on burning enemies. You've basically got a long-range air blast that ignites people here. That's not to say that you even need to use the knockback or land direct hits though, as this weapon is also an explosive that ignites enemies for 60 afterburn damage, regardless of where the explosion hits them from. Because of this, blind firing shots in the general direction of enemies is incredibly effective, and even if you're not securing any kills, you're very effectively pestering and applying afterburn to enemies from a safe distance with all of the usual trappings that come with both. Hell, you can actually still ignite people even after a direct hit on one of their teammates should they be caught in the explosion, so there's really no situation where you should have this thing equipped and not be constantly hammering away at enemies from a distance with it. And of course, this weapon deals guaranteed mini crits to burning players, which is also pretty multi-layered, as not only does it give this weapon the same combo utility as Pyro's other flare guns, but it also means that a direct hit into an explosive will reset the enemy's afterburn counter with a mini crit afterburn. This raises the damage from a guaranteed 60 over 7.5 seconds to 75, which when combined with this weapon's 20 base damage and lack of damage fall off, means that it does over 100 damage all said and done with full afterburn. This is, while not a one-shot on light classes, a gargantuan chunk of health to lose for being pecked by one long-range flare. The amount of times I've landed a Scorch shot attack, died, and then saw a kill in the kill feed about 5 seconds later after I'd respawned is really criminal. Unlike the flamethrowers, which apply afterburn based on how long you've been directly attacking enemies for, a single hit from the Scorch shot will always deal a guaranteed 60 or 75 unless stopped, which is extremely generous for such an easy to connect and safe weapon. Also, in case I didn't have enough reason to dislike this weapon, it also combos exceptionally well with the Phlogistinator. Due to its generous afterburn, safety, and long-range pestering, it allows you to very easily charge up your Phlog's meter while playing quite passively from a safe distance. Doing the math, it only takes 4 to 5 max afterburn durations on enemies to completely fill your Phlog meter, and that's assuming you've not done any additional fire damage nor connected any mini crits along the way. If you had, it'd be even faster. The Phlog rewards dynamically shifting between passive and aggressive playstyles based on whether or not you have your meter, and this weapon greatly facilitates it. And as a few additional positives, this weapon allows a Pyro to perform a weakened flare jump, which while not nearly as effective as the detonators, can still allow you to reach some tricky locations and perform some some very cheeky flanks. You can appear in places that people simply do not expect a pyro to. Also, for some baffling reason, this weapon can destroy sticky bombs, which is a trait otherwise reserved for hit scan weapons and Demo Man's unlockable sticky launchers. Did this weapon really need that? Kinda feels like the other flare gun's 13th reason, doesn't it? So basically, this weapon does quite literally everything that you could ever want a flare gun on pyro to do. It sets enemies on fire, it explodes to make doing that easier, it combos both by itself and with other weapons, it deals extra damage to burning players, it knocks enemies back, it clears sticky traps, it allows you to jump, and most of all, it's incredibly safe. This weapon does all of this while not requiring the pyro to place himself anywhere near the front line or in the danger zone. This weapon does quite literally everything you could reasonably ask it to. Valve really front-loaded this weapon with every positive that a flare gun in this game could have. This is why it is so hated. While it does theoretically only offer weakened versions of the other flare gun strengths, it also has every other flare gun strengths in addition to its own unique mechanics. This is like one of those fighting game characters that has an amalgamation of every other character's movesets, except actually good. A single weapon should not be able to do all of this. And you want to know what's fucked up? Like, I mean really fucked up? I still use this weapon, and I'm sure you do too. You kinda have to. I realize how bullshit broken and annoying this weapon is, but it's like, why would you ever not equip it? Sure, you can't deal 90 damage flare punches, do crazy detonator jumps, or bring a shotgun or non-damaging utility, but it offers so much versatility and such a layered set of use cases for a single weapon. It lacks a generally specified niche, and rather just does everything that a pyro player could possibly ask a secondary to some extent. This is one of the best all-around general utilities that any class has access to in the game. While all of Pyro's other secondaries offer specialized use cases, this thing just kind of augments Pyro's abilities at a base. It's a jack of all trades. It's incredibly safe, versatile, annoying as hell for enemies, and is basically the best of every world for Pyro. I fucking hate the Scorch shot, and I think it could very much do with a full rework, but I also know that not equipping it is handicapping myself. Why would I bring a more specialized utility when I have one tool that does it all? You know what they say, some people might want to watch the world burn, but a true maniac likes to watch the fireworks. Fuck this thing. So that was a deep dive into TF2's dedicated knockback weapons. Something you might have noticed is that outside of the force of nature, we didn't spend too long actually talking about knockback. And that's because, for some reason, Valve really likes front-loading these weapons. It's as if they view a tool that simply knocks enemies back as not being interesting or layered enough to commit more than one weapon design to, and as a result, they feel the need to really gild the lily with these types of items. In the case of the loose cannon, I'd say it worked really well. In the case of the Scorch shot, not so much. And the force of nature is just kinda happy to be here. Regardless, considering the state of CC in games like Overwatch, I'm glad that Valve has played it generally safe with knockback in TF2. Always remember, things could have been a lot worse. Thanks, hope you have a fantastic day before, during, and after watching. Thanks again to Raid Shadow Legends for sponsoring this video. Make sure to check them out using the link in the description below, and I'll catch you all later. Cheers! If there's one understated thing I respect a lot about Team Fortress 2, it's that the game does a great job balancing its silly and serious gameplay elements. More so than pretty much any other FPS, TF2 features a lot of dedicated, by design, goofy weapons and playstyles, but they don't distract from its more serious balance or gameplay. Some of these, like the loose cannon and Beggar's Bazooka, obviously skew a bit on the unserious side, yet can also comfortably carry a team with enough knowledge and skill. Others, like Trollger and Demo Knight, are definitely a bit more map and game state dependent, yet can still be totally effective in the right hands. However, there does exist a small subset of quote-unquote goofy TF2 weapons that even the most dedicated of silly-pilled players would never consider using. These weapons, which I'm electing to call throw meme weapons, are interesting in that they were explicitly designed by Valve to be just that, but also boast a unique lack of either a fun or use factor. They pose to provide a laid-back, fun experience, yet only deliver crushing disappointment and an assured wasted slot on your team. In this video, I want to talk about them. Weapons so bad that even the righteous bison is too good for them. That said, let's roll.
Gary! There's a bomb strapped to my chest! It's gonna explode in 3 seconds unless you take a bath!
We're going to be starting this video out with the Ullapool K-Bird, not only because it pretty effectively embodies the design mentality we'll be seeing throughout the entire thing, but also because it's probably the best weapon we'll be discussing. Yeah, would you believe that this is the peak of the mountain for this discussion? And it sucks too, because in terms of concept and presentation, I've got no complaints with this thing. A throwable stick grenade that Demo Man instead hits people with is not only a very on-brand and in-character concept for him, but it also just suits the game's overall vibe and sense of humor extremely well. I love seeing firearms and history experts reacting to TF2 weapons always have horrified responses to this thing. As far as its design goes, no notes, but ideas only go so far, and gameplay is what determines a weapon's worth. And unfortunately, the Ullapool Caber isn't worth much. The Ullapool Caber is an unlockable melee weapon for Demo Man, a stick grenade with a long handle. This weapon acts as a close quarters melee weapon that deals both melee and explosive damage independently. In theory, this results in a weapon that can hypothetically one-shot light classes and act as a potent surprise tool. In practice though, it's not great. Not only does it boast a slower deploy speed, a swing speed penalty, and even an unlisted damage penalty on its melee attack, but it also features ramp up on its explosive, meaning that, combined with the game's generally unreliable melee hit reg, it can very often fail to kill even the squishiest of classes in a single swing. It also deals self-damage to the demo and blasts him into the sky for guaranteed fall damage on each hit. Lastly, it only explodes once per life, with it being left as a slow, weak stump until the player either dies or returns to a resupply cabinet after each use. If I had to use one word to describe using the Ullapool Caber, aside from bad, it'd be committal. Despite the appealing prospect of whipping out a 120 plus damage death stick and blindsiding some overly aggressive player with it, the act of actually doing this is alarmingly clumsy and requires a lot of in-the-moment investment. Not only does the slower deploy speed and slower swing speed make actually pulling this weapon out and hitting an enemy with it in the moment incredibly sluggish, but the guaranteed self-damage and self-displacement makes it all but assured that you'll be reeling after each use. And that's not even mentioning needing to either die or run back to spawn to get another use of its explosive, which is a really neat little bow on this unwanted package. Chandler Bing would be shaking in his boots at this level of commitment. And all of this required investment and sacrifice for what? A single big hit. A big hit that's not even guaranteed to one-shot a light class. Due to the generally unreliable nature of melee hit reg and the cloudy at best range of this weapon's explosive ramp up, it's entirely possible, more likely than not actually, to bash a scout, sniper, spy, or engineer with this weapon and leave them with just enough HP to counterattack. And guess what? Because of the slower swing speed, you can't immediately follow up for the kill even with the weakened stump. Imagine being a weapon that's entire existence is defined by single-use enormous burst damage, but still needing 2 hits or the same as any other melee weapon to kill a light class. Couldn't be me. I realize that this weapon's current design is primarily because competitive medics complained about being one-shot by it, but it's like, I'd rather a fringe novelty that can one-shot once per life than a completely useless gimmick take up a slot in the game's weapon lineup. I'm sorry if that's a controversial statement. Oh, and also, fun fact, aside from being incredibly sluggish, clumsy, and overly committal, it's also extraordinarily buggy. For a weapon that's core conceit is big hit, this thing barely works for some reason. It has enough bugs to fill its own Oogie Boogie. Or Riku, I don't know.
Mickey! It's Riku! They put bugs in him!
What?
Among its known bugs are frequent issues where it'll fail to deal one or both of its types of damage, still exploding on an unregistered melee hit, visually appearing either exploded or not regardless of its actual gameplay status, and most importantly, not mini-critting with Demo Man's shield. This includes the Tide Turner's guaranteed mini-crit, which means that this weapon does not get a damage bonus at all when using the Tide Turner. This is genuinely a failing on every level of melee weapon design in TF2. How is a weapon that's one core use is to deal a lot of damage once per life barely capable of doing that on a good day? All of these aspects combined result in the Ullapool Caber being one of the least fun weapons to use in the game for me. It's just so clumsy, inconsistent, unreliable, and any attempt to whip it out in a fight just ultimately ends up feeling like a multi-layered gamble that could go sideways at any moment. There are so many things that can go wrong using the Caber, and surprisingly few of them have anything to do with using a grenade as a melee weapon. This weapon fails on so many technical and execution levels that it's genuinely surprised that it's allowed to exist in the game in its current state. It genuinely feels as though Valve hates this weapon and have tried everything in their power to disincentivize people from using it without straight up removing content from the game. But I do still think that this is the best weapon we're discussing in this video. Out of everything we'll be talking about, this weapon has the closest approximation to a salvageable design and concept. It does have a few small legitimate use cases, and that's more than any of the other weapons we'll discuss in this video can say. Let's talk about them. I want to stress that most of these use cases are better performed by other demo melees and are not exclusive to this weapon, but they're still use cases all the same. For one, this weapon's pretty effective at cleaning up low health enemies. In situations where you or a teammate have done substantial damage to someone and they're fleeing on death's door, a quick charge into a caber hit can be the perfect overkill type of kill confirm. It's oftentimes a suicide mission, or at the very least extremely dangerous, but in the face of especially important picks like medics, sometimes the good old you stay, I go is necessary. This is especially handy in the face of an enemy who knows how to dodge or play around your pipes. Even if they can dodge your ranged attacks, they can't dodge a charging screaming Scotsman with an explosive in hand and nothing to lose. In addition, the caber works really well as a cleanup combo type of tool for singular enemies. If you're not confident or consistent in your ability to secure a kill with pipes, landing a single one and then cleaning up the enemy with a caber hit can be a really effective linchpin in a battle. It's all about the surprise element. Enemies generally don't expect you to whip out a caber and instant kill them, so when you can make it happen, it can be a very strong knowledge check on your enemies. Especially on the flank, you can kill the fuck out of someone before they can begin to react. Lastly, and I want to stress that this is an extremely niche use case, but you can use the caber for movement in a pinch. If you don't bring stickies to jump with, then blasting the wall or the ground with a caber swing can give you just the boost you need for a one-time escape or flank. It's important to note that this does huge self-damage and can only be done once per life, on top of also consuming your caber use for that life, so I wouldn't recommend doing it willy-nilly, but it is still something you can do. And that's pretty much it. Again, the caber is a disappointing weapon due to the sheer simplicity of its concept contrasted against the game's seeming lack of an ability to deliver on it. I have no idea what it is about this weapon that made it so difficult for Valve to consistently make it work, but its distinctive jank, committal nature, and lack of grace, combined with its plethora of weapon-killing bugs, really result in a weapon that is just not fun. I can understand the silly appeal of its concept, running in and blasting you and your enemy sky high, but in practice, it's just so sloppy. Why would you ever risk this weapon not working and getting you killed when you have pipes that work infinitely better, or a more consistent and rewarding melee option just a few clicks away? Using the Ullapool caber never feels like it's working. It just feels like you're coasting along. And for what's effectively a bomb on a stick, it really shouldn't be that difficult. It's a funny, appealing weapon, yet one that the game simply couldn't capitalize on the comedic potential of.
Bobby, what are you doing? Don't insult a man's steak without tasting it. You'll get us killed.
Next up is what I earnestly believe may be the single worst weapon in TF2. Look guys, I know I've made fun of a lot of weapons on this channel, and every time I do, at least one person comes out of the woodwork to defend it and provide some use cases that it can be good in. That's just the nature of TF2, everything has a niche. But if any fucking clowns are gonna go into my comments and tell me that the buffalo steak sandwich is actually really good and underrated in your main heavy secondary, then I will assume by default that you're baiting a reaction and disregard your comment. This is a truly awful weapon, and one that completely unambiguously lacks a use case or genuine applicable niche. It's a food item for heavy that does not heal, does not provide a meaningful buff, and actively takes abilities away from your class. This is a throw weapon in its purest form. Let's talk about it. The Buffalo Steak Sandwich is an unlockable secondary weapon for heavy. A consumable food item, this time being a large cartoonish ribeye steak, this weapon can be eaten by pressing mouse 1 or taunting while it's active. Upon consumption, the heavy is not healed for any amount of health, and he instead enters a temporary rage state for 16 seconds. During this time, his move speed is increased by 30%, and all of his attacks mini-crit. As a few trade-offs for these incredibly strong buffs, during the buff period, heavy is locked into using only his melee weapon, and as an unlisted negative, he takes 20% more damage from all sources. This means that eating the Buffalo Steak strong arms the heavy into a glass cannon rushdown melee fighter playstyle who runs faster and deals 88 damage per punch, on a class who otherwise outputs the highest close range sustained damage in the game. So yeah, I'm just gonna be totally transparent and just fully lay my balls on the table here. The Buffalo Steak is genuinely terrible. I'm sorry, I know this weapon has its fans, but I am a heavy main, so I tend to scrutinize weapons for this class a bit more than I would any other class. There is no general purpose situation where you'll be benefiting you or your team by equipping and consuming this weapon. It is purely a self-debuff disguising as a buff that exists solely for funny epic haha meme play. Haha epic funny meme play that in practice is neither epic nor funny. This is an interesting weapon as it appears to be transparently designed with this intention without any inclination towards it being anything more than a throw meme weapon, and that's just kinda silly to me. For starters, you might think that the speed boost may have legitimate utility as a rollout tool. Fun fact, I actually made a now long deleted video about this in about 2018, and documented that the Buffalo Steak rollout is actually significantly worse than using something like the Gloves of Running Urgently, purely due to the eating animation. It's true that the Fast Gloves and Buffalo Steak both buff Heavy's movement speed by 30% or the same amount, but the guaranteed 4-second eating animation causes the Steak to have a built-in delay on its speed boost, and puts you behind the Fast Gloves by a significant margin 9 times out of 10. That one time where it doesn't is really only useful if you eat it at the very beginning of a match, during the countdown period in which classes can't move but can still fire their weapons, and even then, that's a lot of setup for a one-time move speed buff, and the fact that you'll have to equip this weapon beforehand and then unequip it afterwards kind of counteracts that. To be fair though, that's obviously a more consequential use case rather than an explicitly intended one, as the Buffalo Steak's primary use should be very clear: turn Heavy into a potent rushdown melee fighter. This is funny in theory, as rushing at people and punching them with what's otherwise the slowest class in the game definitely does have some charm, but in practice, you're really only handicapping yourself. For one, a mini crit attack with any of Heavy's gloves except the Warrior Spirit, which despite the item bonus you do not want to be comboing with this thing, only deals 88 damage. So on everything except an unbuffed Kunai Spy, you'll still need at least 2 punches to kill any class. Compare this to non-mini crit punches, which also take at least 2 punches. Let the good times roll. While this does mean that you're now killing medics in only 2 punches as opposed to 3, there is a large drum-fed elephant in the room that bears mentioning in this discussion. Yeah, Heavy does the highest close range sustained damage in the game, and it's not even close. While you can get out 88 damage a second with each punch using the Buffalo Steak, you can just as easily get out over 500 in that same second using Heavy's minigun, while also carrying a secondary that actually does something, and not strong-arming yourself into a glass cannon playstyle. Want to know why most games don't make their tanks glass cannons? Because tanks are kind of meant to be tanky. The Buffalo Steak takes away Heavy's primary role and niche on the battlefield as a damage soaking and dealing team anchor in exchange for a playstyle that he is not suited for. And what's really fucked up is that the Buffalo Steak actively nerfs you while you use it on top of this. You take an additional 20% damage from all sources while this item's in effect, which funnily enough is not listed anywhere in its tooltip, yet absolutely exists. I genuinely have no idea why Valve thought this was at all necessary or required to balance this thing, as a Heavy running at you with his melee who cannot heal himself or pull out his primary is already pretty easy to kill. It just kinda strikes me as an extreme case of insecure overbalancing, Valve's paranoid belief that someone somewhere would have found a way to make this weapon broken without it, but I'll be honest, Chief, I don't really see that happening. If you want to equip the Buffalo Steak, it should always come with the conditional understanding that it is a self-owned to do so. Nobody should ever operate under the misguided belief that they're helping themselves or their team by using this thing. By taking away Heavy's minigun, his ability to self-heal, his ability to deal range damage, and his ability to tank all at once in exchange for slightly stronger melee attacks, you are fundamentally throwing away your primary team utility as Heavy. This weapon should only ever be used in the presence of another Heavy or team tank who is doing their job properly. But you know what, I try to be fair in these videos, so let's talk about how to best use the Buffalo Steak in casual from my experience, if you really feel like ruining you and your team's experience. The first thing to consider is which melee weapon to bring, which I find to be the Fists of Steel. While this does make it so you're basically instantly turned to vapor by melee attacks, it leaves you with a net 20% resistance to ranged attacks, and can help you last longer as you attempt to close the distance on someone for a punch. Otherwise, you should eat the Buffalo Steak around the corner from a fight and use the third-person camera to peer around and gauge whether or not there's a target worth aggressing on. In the presence of 2 or more enemies, let them come to you for an ambush, or otherwise attack a singular enemy aggressively. I'll be real with you though, anytime you use the Buffalo Steak and run at an enemy, there's like a 90% chance that you'll secure a kill or 2 and then immediately die. You're basically running at enemies taking more damage with only linear single target attacks to defend yourself, and even if you survive the entire effect duration, you'd likely have taken a lot of damage and significantly overextended along the way. Just operate under the goal of getting some good hits in before you inevitably die, rather than attempting to steamroll an entire team. You'll be much better off that way. Also, you can still throw this item to heal teammates, but that just raises further questions about why Heavy himself can't heal with it. And honestly, that's why the Buffalo Stake pisses me off so much. It pretends it's providing a meaningful buff and alternative playstyle, a real charging charge for Heavy, but in reality, it's strictly a negative self-debuff that completely lacks a legitimate positive use case. Anytime you eat the Buffalo Stake and start swinging, you could have just as easily killed your enemies with your minigun and had health or an actually useful lunchbox item to spare. My big idea for this weapon is really just to give it self-healing on hit or kill, that way Heavy could stay in the fight longer and wouldn't be immediately running to his death anytime he used it. This did used to be a stat on the Warrior Spirit, but I think migrating it to this weapon would be pretty cool. Fun fact, this item was originally meant to be a peyote cactus, but this design was scrapped due to it being deemed potentially offensive. A fair change to make, but maybe needing to redesign the entire thing visually was an omen to just redesign the entire weapon. This might be the single worst weapon in the game in its current state, and one that I don't think any serious Heavy player is ever well off using. But hey, at least it knows it's bad.
Started talking shit, wouldn't you know? I reached back like a pimp and I slapped the hoe.
And lastly, we have Pyro's iconic hand, alternatively known as the Slap Attack or the Hot Hand. It's a noteworthy weapon because it was added in Team Fortress 2's as of right now last significant major update. But hey, we just got that 64-bit thing, so anything could change these days. Jungle Inferno's weapon pool was polarizing to say the least, with the Dragon's Fury, Thermal Thruster, and Second Banana generally being pretty well liked, yet the Gas Passer and especially Hot Hand generally not being. Valve adding a weapon like the Hot Hand, which is pretty transparently designed to be a silly, unviable goof weapon, as late into the game as 2017, it feels like a pretty visible attempt to appeal to that ever-growing goofy side of the TF2 community in what was otherwise a very earnest, balance-oriented update. And considering that people thought the Hot Hand was funny for about a week and then swiftly forgot about it, I think we all know how well that appeal went. The Hot Hand is an unlockable melee weapon for Pyro. A long, soot-stained fireman's glove, the Hot Hand boasts a relatively simple stat lineup, all things considered. By pressing mouse 1, the Pyro will throw out 2 consecutive slaps, each dealing 28 damage for a total of 56. This gives it a net 14% less damage than stock, though its tooltip incorrectly lists it as 20%. Each hit with the Hot Hand will grant the Pyro a brief 1-second move speed bonus, the same type granted by the Big Earner and Whip, and will display each individual slap in the kill feed, with kills being double highlighted, not unlike the Holy Mackerel or Unarmed Combat. This is mostly cosmetic, though some very annoying and insistent TF2 players will dedicate their lives to reminding you that it does technically expose Dead Ringer spies, and is a net positive as a result. These same people get bullied at school. So right out of the gate, the Hot Hand's nature as a weapon should be entirely clear. It is wholly transparently and purely intended to be a funny, pestering meme weapon that's explicitly designed to annoy people on the server. Its lower damage results in more slaps before death, and more slaps means more notifications in the kill feed, and also more funny slap sound effects. This is a weapon that exists purely to butter the biscuits of dedicated silly TF2 players who like to engage in alternative strategies and generally be nuisances to whatever groups they're playing in. I want to stress, there is absolutely nothing wrong with this. Video games are meant to be fun and not taken deathly seriously, and TF2 is really well suited to weapon ideas like this, but I do want to try and earnestly evaluate the Hot Hand compared to Pyro's other contemporary options. TLDR, it's not great. First of all, the fact that Valve decided to dedicate one of the 5 unlockable weapon slots in what we didn't know at the time would be TF2's last significant major content update for quite some time to a deliberately unviable meme weapon is definitely a choice. I honestly do kind of think the Hot Hand is pretty funny, the act of bitch slapping an enemy to death and all, but it does beg the question if this specific design was really worth the dedicated balance effort and programming. I'm not one to cry about wasted slots, since I do know enough about game dev to realize that the alternative to the Hot Hand would have likely been no 5th weapon in the update at all, but I guess Valve really does know their audience. As for the actual gameplay, the Hot Hand is pretty much dead on arrival. While it is very funny and charming, it's net lower DPS on a class who already specializes in close range damage with their primary and has a very competitive melee slot does not really impress. You know everything bad that we all say about the stock fire axe and the 3rd degree and the sharpened volcano fragment? Yeah, that, but for a funny slap glove this time instead. There's really no practical reason to whip out the Hot Hand and attempt to slap one-tap someone with it, as outside of dedicated throwing and memeing, Pyro is infinitely better off just running people over with their flamethrower or using a much better melee utility. Pyro has very little use for an on-hit effect type of melee, unless it's a very potent on-hit effect like in the case of the Extinguisher. When it comes to that on-hit effect, it's the only real tangible bonus this weapon has. A small burst of movement speed on hit is genuinely effective as a means to help stick to enemies to keep the pressure on them, but the incredibly brief length of the speed boost and committal nature of landing a single slap means that you won't be using it for much else. It doesn't last long enough to have the flexibility of something like the Big Earner or Disciplinary Action, and is mostly relegated to enabling you to keep the pressure on enemies for more slaps. You're not going to be hot hand speed boosting your way into a really fancy rollout or anything. And of course, we have the kill feed effects. Every slap you land on someone with the hot hand will be displayed in the kill feed for all to see, with a kill being double highlighted for extra humiliation. This is mostly cosmetic, but as much as it does pain me to say it, it does have a legitimately niche use case. It can expose dead ringer spies, as upon activating his ringer, it'll count as a normal slap rather than a slap kill. The thing is, I find this to be exceptionally niche. A spy really has no reason to proc his ringer in the face of a hot hand Pyro. He can easily trick stab or just outdamage with his revolver, and honestly, how many times has this actually helped you? No, seriously, I want you guys to tell me, no lies, if you've ever experienced more than 1 or 2 occasions in the 7 years since this item released where exposing a disguised spy with the hot hand actually had a significant tangible impact on the match. It really strikes me as just something that can happen rather than something that actually does happen. And would you believe me if I told you that that's all there is to talk about with the hot hand? No, seriously, apart from being exceptionally buggy, which is a common thread among Jungle Inferno weapons, there's really not much else to mention. The hot hand really is a what you see is what you get kind of TF2 weapon. Do you like the thought of deliberately playing suboptimally yet slapping people to death? If the answer is yes, then you'll probably like the hot hand. However, I think the fact that you barely see people running this thing, even compared to other silly meme weapons, is a real testament to the fact that TF2 fans simply didn't latch on to this specific brand of humor. It's a charming weapon, yet one that lags behind its alternatives both as a pyro weapon and as a silly meme weapon. And that's the video. I think that these 3 weapons speak to a fundamental misunderstanding of what makes a community-accepted, funny meme playstyle in TF2. Notice how all 3 of these weapons were explicitly designed from the outset to be funny. Also note how all 3 of them are generally disliked and not often used. You cannot design an aspect of a game to be funny or a meme. You can't manufacture something like this. People will latch on to things that they think are funny because oftentimes the humor is unintended or consequential of a playstyle found by the player base. If you put a weapon in the game and tell people that it's funny by design, then there's no experimentation or community camaraderie in finding the humor in it. It's a very silence brand, how do you do fellow kids type of design, and one that I think TF2 would be better off without. People like Demo Knight and Trollger and the Beggars because they found that those weapons could be funny, not that Valve told them they were. TLDR, it's the community that decides what's a meme or an in-joke. You can't force it. Regardless, thanks, hope y'all have a fantastic day before, during, and after watching, and I'll catch y'all later. Cheers! Do you want to know why Spy is such a popular class pick amongst new TF2 players, despite its high skill and knowledge requirements? It's because the concept of slinking in undetected, infiltrating the enemy team, and securing a clean, efficient instant kill is incredibly enticing. There are entire game franchises based around this concept, so for Valve to have implemented it into a multiplayer game as early as 2007 is an inspired choice. That said, I think we'd be kidding ourselves if we ever pretended Spy was anywhere near the best class in the game, so sometimes you want to experience the thrill of sneaking around and instantaneously dropping foes from advantageous positions on a more consistent and reliable body. In this video, I want to talk about the weapons that allow you to do that. These are TF2's non-spy backstab weapons, or as I call them, stealth weapons. These are weapons that only grant their tangible bonuses when striking enemies from behind or where they least expect it, and can turn the classes that they're featured on into honorary balaclava-wearing chain smokers. I want to stress that we're only talking about weapons that deal extra damage or otherwise provide bonuses on back attack, and not any weapon with a stealth mechanic like the Tomislav's Quieter Rev, for example. All that said, let's roll.
The enemy's coming from behind. Take care of the guy behind me, Fox!
We're going to be starting this video off with a discussion on the backscatter, which is basically the TF2 video equivalent to opening a 10-course meal with plain unflavored rice.
Yeah, but what's the flavoring?
Fries flavored.
I want to stress right out of the gate, I don't at all think that the backscatter is a bad weapon. In fact, while recording footage for this video, I was pleasantly surprised with its performance and very quickly found myself consistently racking up small kill streaks. That said, I do think that this weapon at a base level is staggeringly, sinfully boring. It's got an incredibly simple first draft-esque lineup of stats, and to me, almost feels like a concept that could have been modded into the game. Like, this is the kind of weapon design you see in a Steam Workshop thread or a Weapon Concepts YouTube video, not the actual game. Its complete list of patches since release on its wiki page is only like 4 lines long. All that is to say, I enjoy using the backscatter, but find it to be a pretty uninspired weapon. But why is that? Let's dive in and find out. The backscatter is an unlockable primary weapon for Scout added in the coveted Love and War update. A phallically shaped lever-action shotgun, this weapon's primary attribute is its ability to deal mini-crits when attacking enemies from medium to close range and behind. This, combined with its otherwise uncompromised damage compared to stock, means that it can comfortably one-shot light classes when the chips stack precisely in its favor. To offset this powerful ability, this weapon only loads 4 shots before needing to reload compared to stock 6, and features a noticeably harsher and less accurate spread, making it even more reliant on close-range flanking engagements and smart positioning than Scout's other scatter guns. So right out of the gate, the backscatter is a weapon that wears its intended function on its sleeve. This is a weapon that flourishes as a powerful flanking and chasing tool, allowing the player to use Scout's slippery movement and potent area traversal to sneak around behind enemies and rack up some real damage. As a trade-off, it noticeably suffers as a mid-range direct combat tool, with its combination of fewer and less accurate shots, making it pale in comparison to Scout's other options and face-to-face with enemies who were actively fighting back. That said, it's also extremely fundamental, asking very little in the ways of significant playstyle adjustments to make the most out of it. You'll likely already be flanking a Scout, and it's not completely unusable as a close-range weapon, just a little bit more awkward. The most glowing endorsement I can make for the backscatter is that at its absolute weakest, you're basically just dealing with a moderately more awkward version of the stock scattergun, and at its absolute best, you're dealing with a version of it that can one-shot semi-consistently. It basically takes Scout's fundamental role as a class as a potent close-range flanker and burst damage dealer, and accentuates both its positives and negatives to a very specific degree. It deals the same amount of damage, has the same number of pellets, and fires at the same rate as stock. It is strictly defined by being stronger in one specific instance and weaker in most others. If you can get down with that, you'll probably like the backscatter a lot. If you're in the mood for something a bit more interesting though, this weapon will definitely leave you wanting. At a base, you'll be getting the most out of the backscatter when attacking enemies' backs. Great script, Opal. The range and positioning you need to attack enemies from to actually deal a mini-crit is incredibly vague and sometimes poorly designed, and is often indicated entirely by lag compensation and hitbox jank, leading to somewhat frequent situations where you'll either fail to deal a mini-crit when you really should, or will deal a mini-crit when you otherwise really shouldn't. This is not an exclusive issue to the backscatter or even to this video. Virtually every position-dependent mechanic in TF2, aside from headshots, suffers from this trait to some extent, but on a weapon that lives and dies by the consistency of its one positive, it's especially noteworthy. I do find it to function as intended more often than not, and find the jank to honestly be more beneficial than it isn't, so I'll take it over a weapon just straight up not working. When the backscatter works though, I'll be honest, it really works. Sneaking behind enemies and just firing shot after shot, pelting them with hefty mini-crits that leave most classes hurting after only 1 or 2, is very fun and effective. With some smart positioning and attacks of opportunity, you can be an absolute menace to the enemy team with this thing. A very frequent and satisfying situation I found myself in was sneaking behind an entire group of enemies and cleanly taking out each member before they could react. Aside from Spy, this is the closest I get to feeling like a genuine assassin in TF2. Additionally, this weapon is exceptional for cleaning up particularly important single targets like medic, snipers, and enemy team anchors. Scout is already one of the strongest flankers in the game and does these things with gusto at a base level, and this weapon takes his ability to efficiently clean up key targets and just sticks it with about a horse tranquilizer's worth of oomph juice. Additionally, this weapon is great as a chasing tool. This isn't the only weapon in this video that we'll be saying this about, but it really can't go understated just how effective this thing is at cleaning up enemies when they foolishly try and escape from the person shooting them with a gun. Any enemy who's non-observant enough to turn their backs on you while you're using this thing will be treated to a swift and decisive mollywhopping. It's almost like people just don't see what weapons their enemies are using, and this is a cognitive failing on their parts that is very easy to capitalize on. Plus, just maneuvering intelligently around enemies and taking attacks of opportunity when you see their backs can be a very strong knowledge and mechanical execution check for those enemies. So, in essence, the weapon designed to deal extra damage to enemies from behind is very good at dealing extra damage to enemies from behind. It meshes very well with Scout's base mechanics as a class, and despite my belly aching about it being boring, does make sense as a concept for the class. It's definitely a bit white bread flavored, but it works, it's fun, and that's all that matters. That said, it is still an astonishingly middle-of-the-road weapon, and it's primarily due to its two main negatives contrasted against its uninspired positive. Starting with what I find to be the less severe negative, its lower accuracy and harsher spread can definitely make things a bit difficult. It's not exceptionally damning or weapon ruining, it's not like the Beggar's Bazooka's projectile deviation, for example, but it is noticeable beyond close range. It makes fights from medium to longer ranges totally out of the scout's control, even more so than usual, and significantly hampers his usual strategy of dodging around enemies while delivering his own attacks. I swear that the pellets on this thing just go wherever the hell they want, and it can make lining up what should be guaranteed meat shots noticeably less consistent than it would be otherwise. Combine this with the already present random bullet spread, and you've got a gun that's basically shooting blanks a good 30 to 40% of the time. That said, there are fringe situations where the accuracy penalty can allow a pellet or two to line up and secure a cheeky undeserved mini crit on a fleeing enemy, so it's a bit of a two-way street, if one of those ways led to a crack den. No, the stat I find to be way more severe on the backscatter is its clip size penalty. It cannot go overstated just how much Scout lives and dies by his clip. His lengthy reload and committal firing speed mandate making good use of each shot, and on a weapon that's notorious for missing what should be guaranteed high damage hits, and already asks for very strategic attacks of opportunity to get the most out of it, having 2 less shots per clip is exceptionally rough. It does feel proportionate to the weapon's strength as an ambush tool, since it'll likely take a shot or two less to kill someone with mini crits anyways, but in any situation where you and the enemy are actively exchanging bullets and you are not behind them, this is strictly a negative that aggressively accentuates what's already one of Scout's biggest weaknesses. Due to this combination of negatives, and the somewhat janky nature of this weapon's only positive, I'd say the biggest fault in the backscatter on a gameplay level is just that it's very inconsistent. It feels like any given exchange with it could go any number of entirely different ways based on how many pellets connect and whether or not the game actually registers your mini crits. It's a very fun weapon, make no mistake, and can absolutely dominate servers with proper usage and a bit of luck, but it's also remarkably awkward and very unreliable. So me at work. All in all, the backscatter is not a bad weapon. It's a weapon of tepid highs and uninteresting lows, and one that comfortably skirts between either end of TF2's ever-contentious balance spectrum. It's like the dictionary definition of a middling weapon. No extremely overbearing positives or weapon-killing negatives, just a lineup of so-so mechanics that ultimately result in a fiercely inoffensive weapon. If you want to play TF2 with like the Bob's Burgers of Scout primaries, then this will be the weapon for you. It's charming, fun, and novel, yet also inconsistent and fails to hit either the highs or lows of its contemporaries. Okay, maybe that was unfair. I like Bob's a lot more than the backscatter. Either way, the backscatter is the premier example of a meh TF2 weapon, or mid as the kids call it. Not bad, not great, it's just a bit boring.
Tomorrow in my butt.
From one back-based weapon to another, it's Pyro's Backburner. This is an interesting case to me, as despite the weapon's age and standing as one of the oldest unlockable weapons in the game, it's never really at the top of anyone's mind for serious balanced discussion. It's one of the more low-key weapons in the game for sure, especially in regards to Pyro. Like 1 in every 10 conversations people have about TF2 will be complaining about Pyro and their weapons, so the fact that you don't often hear people bring up the Backburner is interesting. Oh, it's brain dead, it's W plus M1, it's a gibbous weapon, you say. Bro, I made heavy, that's not balanced discussion, that's every 4th comment on one of my YouTube videos. So I want to talk in earnest about the Backburner. See just what it is about this weapon that's caused it to lag behind in terms of technical discussions of Pyro's weapons. The Backburner is an unlockable achievement flamethrower for Pyro, and its stats are as follows. It deals guaranteed critical hits when striking enemies from behind, making it extremely effective at dealing with fleeing enemies or for ambushes, at the cost of requiring 50 damage per air blast as opposed to stock's 20. This means that from full ammo, you can air blast exactly 4 times in the Backburner, less than half of the 10 that are possible with stock. It also boasts all the other perks that affect every other flamethrower, such as healing 20 health upon extinguishing teammates and slowing down medic healing while flaming them. This ultimately results in a weapon that accentuates Pyro's role as a close-range combat-oriented ambush killer, while moving away from their role as an air blast-focused team supporter. So, funny story, the Backburner was added in 2008's Pyro update, the second significant content update in TF2's history, and one that was explicitly focused around livening up Pyro as a class. On release, Pyro was frequently criticized as the game's weakest and most boring character. Prior to this update, they couldn't even air blast. It was added in this patch, and Valve, in their infinite wisdom, decided to bolster their then newest class-specific update focus on fixing the game's problem character by adding a weapon that lacked that update's most important new mechanic. Yes, like the modern-day Flog, the released Backburner could not air blast at all. I'm telling you this primarily to demonstrate just how fucking far this weapon has come. It could could be so much worse than it is. Starting from the top, the Backburner's namesake positive is really fun to put into practice. A stream of constant critical flames deals anywhere from 260 to 520 damage a second, or enough to melt every class in the game in around 2 to 3 seconds max. Compared to a non-critical flame, this is an obvious and massive increase in potential damage, and significantly truncates the amount of time required to kill any given enemy. It is worth noting though that the hitbox of what's considered an enemy's back is a little bit vaguely defined. Compared to a backstab, which has an effective range of about 180 degrees behind a player's immediate view, the Backburner's radius is more so around 90 degrees, making the actual area you need to hit in order to deal critical damage on enemies significantly more strict. You won't be seeing a lot of Backburner face stabs, for example. This can actually make lining up an enemy for some crits surprisingly tricky and inconsistent, so at a base, I'd recommend treating the crits more as a potential bonus that applies sometimes, rather than a fallback you should be defaulting to all of the time. While this might make the Backburner seem a bit useless, I'd say the crits trigger just often enough in the average match for it to be worth it. Plus, this weapon is functionally identical to stock otherwise when it comes to flame specifically, so no playstyle adjustments to direct combat will have to be made in order to accommodate it. When you're using the Backburner, an important thing to keep in mind is that when talking specifically about pressing mouse 1, you are functionally using the stock flamethrower with the ability to deal situationally guaranteed crits. So anything you could do with the primary attack of the stock flamethrower is equally possible with the Backburner. Not unlike the backscatter, it's very common for enemies to not realize what you're attacking them with and attempt to flee. This puts them in prime backburning position, and all around demonstrates just how strong this weapon is as a pure fire damage oriented weapon. If Air Blast didn't exist, this thing would just straight up be an objective upgrade over stock. Its flames are entirely identical with an additional extremely strong situational positive. With the right combination of tools, a Backburner pyro who knows what they're doing can be a frightening thing to contend with. Combined with the thermal thruster or detonator, which both grant pyro on command mobility and self-repositioning, being able to crop up exactly where the enemy team does not expect and melting them with a stream of flames so strong that even the Fury would be shaking in its boots is very fun and rewarding. More so than any other pyro primary, the Backburner rewards smart positioning and picking your battles intelligently. It has a reputation for being a very brain-dead weapon, and it absolutely can be. You can totally just W plus M1 at people with it and call it a day, but the difference between a W plus M1 Backburner player and a Backburner player who knows how to capitalize on its strengths is night and day. Unfortunately, all of this only applies to mouse 1, and there is another button on your mouse to press. With it comes this weapon's absolutely huge soul negative, a plus 150% air blast cost, or a requirement of 50 ammo per air blast. This is pretty damn important. In situations where you're attempting to displace an enemy, reflect large amounts of spam, or extinguish multiple teammates at once, you will very quickly find yourself running out of ammo. Keep in mind that you only get 4 air blasts from maximum ammo, and that if you flame for just 1 second, you only get 3. Air blast is such a fundamental part of Pyro's game plan that I can easily see this being a make or break stat for a lot of players. It exists right alongside the Flog in that regard, and if you know my opinion about the Flog, then you should know that I'm not a huge fan of that. That said, I don't have nearly as much beef with this weapon as I do with the Flog. My primary grievance with the Flog is that it completely strips away Pyro's ability to air blast, thus narrowing Pyro's game plan significantly and severely limiting the number of plays they're capable of making. I firmly believe Pyro is not the easiest class in TF2, simply due to the number of avenues Air Blast opens up. Reflect is obviously one, but there's also stuff like rocket surfing and disconnecting Ubers. It does take skill and knowledge of the class to get good at these kinds of things. Stripping away that ability severely narrows Pyro's gameplay and lowers their skill ceiling dramatically. But here's the thing, the Backburner doesn't really strip that ability away. It just makes you have to be smarter and more selective in how you use it. Whereas the Flog completely removes the ability to Air Blast, the Backburner simply adds more consideration for when and how to use it. If you're using the Backburner for combat, like air blasting an enemy to combo or trap them, the cost likely won't mean much since you'll be picking up their ammo pack anyways. In other situations, you simply have to be smarter and more calculated in how you use it. I wouldn't say the Backburner discourages using air blast. It just requires more thought when using it than stock. You'll have to carefully consider each individual air blast, patiently awaiting the perfect reflect or selectively extinguishing the right teammate, rather than just air blasting someone over and over again willy-nilly. It's much harsher in terms of how many times you can use it, but otherwise functions identically. A lot of enemies seem to think you're completely unable to air blast when you use this thing, and I've caught quite a few opponents off guard by reminding them that yes, my gun can still in fact blow hot air. The amount of times I've seen a demo man just deactivate after being air blasted by this thing is too high to be coincidental. This obviously does not apply to every situation though. There are 100% times where you'll absolutely notice a stricter air blast cost than others. Specifically, situations where you'd be using the air blast for consistent defense are where I feel it really falls flat. that. Attempting to repeatedly airblast a single target to disconnect Ubers can be exceptionally difficult and unsafe with this weapon, and you won't be able to counter rocket spam or otherwise interrupt the enemy plays as effectively, which are some of Pyro's most important roles in a defensive setting. Additionally, dealing with large influxes of spam and incoming damage, or trying to keep your team topped off in the face of an aggressive enemy Pyro is really difficult, and borderline impossible if enough fire is going around. It's simply not as versatile or safe to fall back on as the stock flamethrower. And that's ultimately the dichotomy of the backburner. Its primary attack is, all things considered, just stock but better. It's like the backscatter again, just the same thing with a situational upside. However, the significance of its increased air blast cost cannot go ignored. This thing is a liability to your team to bring along. It does hamper Pyro's class-defining team utility, and while it isn't as strict about it as the Flog or even the Dragon's Fury, there will be situations where you'll be standing around shrugging as your team dies around you. I wouldn't necessarily describe the backburner as selfish, but it is most certainly a flamethrower that focuses on the Pyro using its enjoyment and not their team's enjoyment. Pyro is air blast, and air blast is Pyro. And while every unlockable flamethrower does nerf it in some capacity, I hope you're damn good at taking advantage of those crits to justify bringing this weapon over one that can more consistently help your team. It's not anywhere near bad, just a weapon you have to know what you're signing up for when you equip it. So I sure am glad it's a new player achievement item.
Look out, Earth. I'm dreaming of a red Xmas.
Ah, we're finally on my home turf. The Holiday Punch is a weapon I've discussed in the Weapons Subcategory series before, specifically in the Christmas Weapons episode, which I'm pretty certain is the least viewed episode of the series, but that's neither here nor there. In that video, I discussed it being my favorite heavy melee and one of my favorite melee weapons in the game, and spent a significant chunk of the video generally gassing it up as an underrated contender within Heavy's melee lineup. That said, a few people were quick to call my bluff, pointing out several situations where the Holiday Punch fails to deliver as consistently as I may have led people to believe. I try to take comments like this seriously, as I generally want my videos to be as close to the true TF2 casual experience as possible, so I've been eager to revisit the Holiday Punch for a bit. Let's dive in. The Holiday Punch is an unlockable melee weapon for Heavy, a pair of festive Smith mittens. These gloves function identically to the stock fists in terms of damage, attack speed, and range. Their main positive, however, is their ability to force an enemy into their laughing taunt or schadenfreude upon either a successfully landed critical hit or a punch from behind. This effectively stuns enemies in place for the duration of the taunt and takes them out of whatever animation they were performing at the time the punch landed. As an arguable negative, critical hits and back punches with this weapon deal no damage, instead always forcing the enemy into their laughing taunt. Additionally, Heavies wielding the Holiday Punch will always be made to laugh when attacking other Holiday Punch Heavies. This is an item that, from first impressions, may seem like nothing more than a goofy novelty or funny meme weapon, and in a lot of cases, it is. If you're just pulling out your Holiday Punch and running at enemies fishing for a crit, you're basically throwing. There is a legitimate argument to be made that you'd be better off in most situations just shooting enemies with your minigun, rather than lengthening the process of killing them by making them laugh first. Using the Holiday Punch for its own sake isn't too dissimilar from any other throw meme strategy in TF2. That said, this is a weapon that flourishes the most when the player realizes when and how to use it. When you're just throwing out punches willy-nilly, this weapon is definitely a bit of a meme, but when you're taking advantage of its unique technical quirks, it's one of the most impactful melee weapons in the entire game. Here's the thing, forcing an enemy to taunt or emote in a skill-based, execution-based FPS is incredibly strong at a base conceptual level. Taunts cannot be cancelled in TF2, and think about how many times either you or an enemy has been killed because they chose to do a funny animation at the wrong time. Being able to force an enemy into a several second long, unskippable, and uncancelable animation is borderline broken on a base conceptual level. This is comparable to an on-command stun or CC effect disguised as a funny meme, and it's further compounded by the specific taunt it's forced being the laughing taunt, which tends to be on the longer end of each class's taunt lineups. For example, Spy's Schadenfreude taunt is only slightly shorter than the length of an Uber charge. Simply put, you can no-sell the hell out of some very impactful plays with the Holiday Punch. Most notably, this weapon's stun goes through Uber charges, allowing a properly timed Holiday Punch attack to completely stifle an enemy's potentially game-winning Uber push. This is fucking hilarious, and objectively an incredibly strong trait. There are very few consistent stock Uber counters in TF2, so the fact that this weapon can not only potentially act as the most effective one on offer, but also do it to any other type of Uber charge or buff is very funny. From my experience, enemies don't often tend to identify the immediate threat of a Holiday Punch Heavy poking at them, and tend to turn their Uber focus towards sentries or other key targets, and this is very easy to take advantage of. With Uber Charge comes tunnel vision on what's deemed the most important target, so with proper positioning and timing, you can be the thing that saves your team from an impactful push. You may think that heavy slow movement speed and general inconspicuousness would make securing consistent holiday punch stuns difficult, but from my experience, it's remarkably easy to position yourself in such a way that you won't be the enemy's immediate first target. In the event of an uber push, the holiday punch heavy will likely not be the enemy's highest priority to shoot. Plus, if you're really evil, you can crouch and backpedal and pretend you're friendly, and then swiftly betray anyone who's foolish enough to believe you. Who says heavy can't be spy? Again, when you're just running at enemies fishing for crits, the holiday punch is a certified gimmick. But when you use it intelligently and opportunistically, you can get some real mileage out of it. Now, that's all well and good, but there is one key trait of the holiday punch that does keep it in check against particularly astute enemies. You cannot make airborne targets laugh. Taunts can only be activated on solid ground in TF2, meaning that all it takes for the enemy to no-sell your no-sell is to jump repeatedly. This is the definitive counter to the holiday punch. All you have to do to avoid being stunned is mash your spacebar. And while it is possible for the heavy to find the perfect opportunity to punch you between your jumps, this is exceptionally difficult and requires a lot of server end timing on the heavy part. It's not always applicable, like obviously a revved up heavy doesn't have the option to do this, but any other class can comfortably skirt around a potential holiday punch stun by simply jumping. Additionally, on servers where random crits are disabled, or in situations where you can't comfortably secure a cheeky back punch, like on maps where you can't get behind the enemy, the holiday punch is pretty much dead on arrival, unfortunately. This weapon is gimmicky and reliant on specific circumstances to flourish by nature, and it won't be much of an all-around generalist utility as much as something like the Fists of Steel or Fast Gloves. It's incredibly impactful in the right situations, but only in those situations. Because of this, as the name of this video would imply, the holiday punch works best as a stealth weapon. It's very fun and funny to run up on enemies and brute force a stun through random crits, but the holiday punch works best when you're able to hit enemies with it before they realize what you're doing. The moment an enemy realizes what you're attempting to do is the moment the holiday punch crumbles, so more so than even the backscatter or back burner, this is a weapon that mandates extremely careful positioning, timing, and opportunistic fight picking to make the most out of it. It will not be perfect in every situation, and it does have concrete counterplay, but when it works, it really works. This isn't a weapon you equip expecting to make use of it constantly. It's a weapon you equip in case the circumstance where it's useful pops up. And when that circumstance does pop up, it is the most impactful weapon in the game. Ultimately, the holiday punch is still my favorite heavy melee by a fine margin, but it'd be disingenuous of me to pretend it doesn't have any shortcomings. It's incredibly effective and fun at its best, yet situational and easily countered at its worst. It's still hilarious to block an Ubersaw or interrupt a potentially game-winning play, but I appreciate the comments in my Christmas weapons video for helping me realize that the holiday punch isn't as perfect as I initially thought. It's still great, still fun, and still effective in the right situations, but requires careful finesse and a lot of luck to make the most out of it. Just like Christmas shopping for a particularly picky family member, the holiday punch is a gamble. Sometimes it'll bring loads of Yuletide joy, and other times it'll only bring crushing disappointment. I still love it though. So there's a look at TF2 stealth weapons, or its non-spy backstab weapons. Something you might have noticed is that, with exception to the holiday punch, these weapons tend to be pretty boring on a design level. It's like Valve views situationally guaranteed bonuses based on positioning as like a singular weapon-defining trait all on its own, and absolutely refuses to iterate on these concepts aside from that. That said, I still think these weapons are very fun to use and make you feel like a legitimate big brain badass when they work. I'll take some conceptually boring weapons that are fun in practice and work over overly ambitious weapons that fail to consistently deliver. All in all, this discussion should have shown that Spy isn't alone as TF2's assassin archetypal character. Maybe he has more in common with his fellow mercs than he thinks. Or maybe not. Either way, thanks, hope y'all have a fantastic day before, during, and after watching, and I'll catch y'all later. Cheers! Team Fortress 2 has a lot of unlockable weapons. I feel like that's something people tend to forget when they're clamoring for new ones and pretending that they're the only things that can make a potential new update worth anything. But yeah, TF2 has over 130 unlockable weapons with unique stats across its 9 classes. Because of this and the game's age, the general meta for each class is pretty comfortably set in stone. You don't often see people deviate from what's expected of them at serious levels of play, and when they do, it's usually just a meme around with an off-meta playstyle. That said, there genuinely are a few legitimately good TF2 weapons that have kind kind of slip through the cracks. Weapons that, in my opinion, can more than comfortably carry their weight within their respective classes' lineups, despite the community at large kind of ignoring or viewing them as bad. In this video, I want to talk about some of them. These are 3 slept-on weapons in TF2. Weapons that, while not broken or completely class-defining, I feel deserve significantly more dues than they get. I want to stress that I can't possibly cover every base in this video, so if I don't talk about your favorite slept-on weapon, sing its praises in the comments. Also, we're going to be talking about casual pub TF2 in this video and nothing else. I figured that was important to mention. All that said, let's roll.
Keep out of Team Rocket's way. How about I fucking blow you up, huh? What about that?
So, funny story. This was originally going to be a filler video where I talked about one weapon for each class for about a paragraph each. It was going to be like 11 minutes long and I'd comfortably call it a day. But then something happened. I earnestly used the Scottish Resistance for the first time ever in my 10 years of playing TF2. I equipped it, got the hang of it, and set out to record footage of it. And after a bit, I immediately knew that I wanted to talk about it at length. This weapon deserved more than a paragraph. It deserved a full Weapons Subcategories deep dive. To say that this weapon left an immediately strong impact on me would be a tremendous understatement. Let's talk about the Scottish Resistance. The Scottish Resistance is an unlockable secondary weapon for Demo Man. A slightly repainted and modified sticky bomb launcher, this gun boasts the primary unique ability to allow Demo Man to selectively detonate sticky bombs. By looking in the general directions of the bombs of his choice, the Demo Man can choose which bombs to detonate individually rather than triggering them all at once. To aid in this, Demo Man can uniquely see this weapon's sticky bombs through walls, and can place up to an additional 6 compared to the stock sticky launcher for a total of 14. This allows the Demo Man to place multiple traps and selectively activate them wherever he sees fit. Additionally, this weapon also boasts a 25% faster firing speed than stock and 50% more reserve ammo. Its damage, range, and projectile speed are also otherwise uncompromised. As a sole singular negative, this weapon's sticky bombs take 0.8 seconds longer to prime than stock, meaning that they can't be airbursted or spammed in enemies' faces nearly as effectively. So, you see all these positive stats in this item's tooltip? You see all these funny blue lines of text contrasted against that one red one? They mean something. This weapon fucking rocks. The Scottish Resistance is so goddamn fun. And I am embarrassed, humiliated, and deeply regretful that it took me over a decade of playing TF2 to give it an earnest whirl. I can't really give a good reason as to why. I always just kind of heard this weapon was underused and wasn't really interested. I was gaslit into thinking this weapon was bad. But rest assured, this is not a weapon ruined by one stat. This is not a weapon hampered by one stat. This is a certified, front-loaded, great TF2 weapon, and one that I truthfully recommend giving an earnest whirl after you finish this video. I feel like a lot of people get really caught up on that longer sticky bomb arm time. This weapon's one negative, the fact that you can't comfortably use this weapon for sticky spamming or juggling aggressive enemies. And that's true. If you're the kind of brainless, bitchless, pocket medic needing demo player whose one joy in life is pub stomping with your Australian sticky launcher that you've inevitably renamed a slur, then this stat will probably take some adjustment. It is genuinely worse as an aggressive sticky spamming weapon, and I will not deny that. However, if you enjoy using your sticky bomb launcher for literally any other purpose, then I am speaking the word of the righteous when I tell you that this weapon is unironically incredible. Aside from the increased bomb arm time, it is genuinely just the stock sticky bomb launcher with more choice, more bombs out at a time, a faster firing speed, and otherwise uncompromised damage and killing power, and it is good. Right out of the gate, you can just straight up carpet bomb the enemy team with this weapon, just standing from an advantageous position and raining sticky bombs on them at a rate and speed that even the most astute player can't react to. If you have a good angle and a solid handle on how to position your bombs, then you can quite literally rain hell on your enemies. While this might not seem super effective due to the longer bomb arm time, in practice it's incredibly easy to just lay a bunch of bombs around the enemy's feet and selectively detonate them as enemies walk over them. The ability to manually select which stickies you blow up and the sheer number of them you can have at a time allows you to set up situations where the enemy is simply never safe. Anywhere they step could be a potential sticky bomb's resting place. With a good grasp on your enemy's movement and a bit of map knowledge, it's very easy to cover quite literally every base you need with this weapon. Being able to see sticky bombs through walls makes smart and predictive detonation based on your enemy's movement a sensationally rewarding skill to get good at, and even if you're just blind firing stickies into their general direction, sweeping through a crowd of enemies by holding M2 and detonating all of your bombs in one glorious wave is very fun. Despite this weapon's reputation as a trap or defense oriented weapon, it's remarkably easy to make very potent use of it as an offense tool with a bit of resourceful play and map knowledge. Your strongest tool with the Scottish Resistance is knowledge, using your map and game state savvy to predict where enemies will be and giving them a glorious send-off.
Help! I require assistance!
That's not to say it isn't useful as a trapping tool though, as that genuinely is one of this weapon's stronger suits. Aside from funny spawn camping and teleporter camping, this weapon is an uncontested king at setting traps and punishing enemies for attempting to walk forward. You have 14 bombs to make use of at any given time, and can detonate whichever ones you need at any moment, so there's very little stopping you from just walling off every potential access point to the enemy team, and making use of whichever trap you need at whichever given opportunity. This weapon's uncompromised range and damage compared to stock means that no concessions ever have to be made with each individual trap, and you can just have multiple down at a time. You can put the fear of God into your enemies with this weapon, making them unable to push forward out of fear of there being a sticky trap around every corner. And even with all of that said, you can definitely still sticky spam to some extent with this weapon. While it is true that you won't be airbursting stickies and juggling enemies with it, the bomb arm time is still only a little over a second, and a good chunk of that is accounted for by the travel time. This means that you can just spam mouse 1 and lay sticky somewhere in the ballpark of fucking everywhere, and basically turn the map into a minefield. It is so remarkably easy to just have stickies laid in every corner of the map with this thing, and whether intentionally or not, have a sticky ready for every occasion. Combine this with the weapon's other positive stats, and you've got a surprisingly effective tool for both offensive and defensive play. The Scottish Resistance really is just the perfect storm of little quality of life features and neat little stats. All of its individual traits come together to ultimately create one of the most fun, satisfying, and rewarding alternative playstyles in the game, and one that makes you feel like a true big brain gamer for taking full advantage of it. All that is to say, why are we not running this? Like, this is a truly great and fun weapon, and one that aside from one very specific aggressive playstyle, is barely hampered at all compared to stock. With the later weapons on this list, I can kind of understand why some players might not want to use them. But with this one, it's a damn effective and very, very strong alternative to the stock sticky bomb launcher, and one that I would genuinely encourage giving an earnest try. Any notions about this weapon being awkward, stiff, or uncomfortable to use will go right out of the window once you get used to using it. All in all, if I may blow my load a little bit early here, the Scottish Resistance is the slept-on TF2 weapon. It's underrated because it's underrated, because the community has gotten used to the narrative that it is, and not for any reason to do with its quality or strength. I am speaking in earnest sincerity when I say that this may just be my new preferred secondary for Demo Man. It's not as immediately rewarding as a stock sticky bomb launcher, and both definitely have their merits, but if you want a weapon that's strong, flourishes in multiple situations, and makes you feel very cool and smart when you use it properly, then this weapon will offer very little resistance.
Yeah, America's great, isn't it? Except for the South.
Next up is probably the definitive example of an underrated TF2 weapon, Engineer Southern Hospitality. This thing has a reputation for being totally fine and effective in its core use, but also being dreadfully boring and failing to offer any substantial bonuses over Engineer's other wrenches. This thing gets included in pretty much every underrated weapons video on YouTube, and virtually every one of them mentions in some capacity that its only real problem is that it's very boring. And you'll be happy to know that I'm gonna do the exact same thing here. Let's talk about it. The Southern Hospitality is an unlockable melee weapon for Engineer, a jagged spiked pipe wrench with a pointy knuckle guard. This weapon's primary trait is its ability to induce 5 seconds of bleed on a successful melee hit. This, combined with its 65 base damage, can theoretically allow for up to 105 damage in a single swing, should the bleed go uninterrupted. As a few primary trade-offs, this weapon makes Engineer take 20% more damage from fire while it's equipped, and it cannot get random critical hits. Boy, that was a short stat lineup. Surely I can pad this paragraph out a little bit. Hey, watch The Golden Girls. It's a good show. Alright, I think this section's long enough now. So, this is an incredibly simple stat lineup for an Engineer weapon. Fun fact, this is the only one of Engineer's unlockable wrenches that doesn't interact with his buildings in any unique way, offering no differences from stock when it comes to construction, upgrade, or repair rates. This weapon could hypothetically be given to any other class with these exact same stats, and lose none of its mechanical function. This is, not unlike the backscatter from the stealth weapons video, a very boring and borderline fan weapon-esque lineup of stats that feels more at home in a weapon concepts Reddit thread than the actual game. This weapon almost feels like it sort of slipped through the cracks, maintaining a very 2010s design philosophy as TF2 progressed into the late 2010s and 2020s. Fun fact, this weapon's only ever functional change was replacing its no random critical hit stat with a 25% damage penalty instead in 2011, which lasted less than a day before being reverted. You may have also noticed that I actually mentioned this weapon's lack of random critical hits, which is something I don't tend to do in these videos. I usually ignore this stat because because it's a totally tertiary attribute on most weapons that doesn't significantly figure into their gameplay or balance, but in the case of the Southern Hospitality, it actually is pretty notable. Engineer has more to gain from random melee crits than any other class. Being able to instantly murk spies with 195 damage swings in order to remove their sappers or repair buildings before it's too late can be vitally important to your game plan. Not being able to do that is genuinely a pretty big deal in casual, and can absolutely lead to deaths or destroyed buildings that could have otherwise been avoided. On literally any other weapon in the game, the no random critical hit stat is entirely negligible, but it is truly an important part of the Southern Hospitality's balance. Luckily, this weapon's core upside does go some ways towards offsetting this. This is one of only 2 non-scout bleed-inducing weapons in the game, and you'll be happy to know that it is the better of the 2. This weapon induces 5 seconds of guaranteed bleed at 8 damage per tick on swing, on top of otherwise uncompromised melee damage, allowing it to deal a single swing maximum of 105. This is heavily reliant on the enemy you hit actually allowing the bleed to go through for its maximum duration, as all it takes is 1 health kit, medic, or dispenser to remove it on most classes. I'd say this is best used as a pressure tool on most enemies, where it can be handy for putting them on borrow time or forcing them to retreat as their health ticks down. It takes exactly 1 swing to put light classes at significant threat of bleeding out, and it does the same amount of damage as the stock wrench, so a second swing is a guaranteed kill either way. Against classes with more than 125 HP, the bleed can be a great way to apply a condition to the fight that makes them either have to engage or flee. While the bleed is pretty much an inconvenience at best on most classes, its real intended application should be entirely clear. It is a spy counter. Bleed, not unlike Afterburn, induces a visible particle effect and animation on anyone who's afflicted by it, meaning that you can use the Southern Hospitality to weed out and track, disguise, and cloak spies. Plus, if a spy happens to be using an unbuffed kunai, then all it takes is 1 swing and 2 ticks of bleed to send him packing. It isn't foolproof, as the bleed duration is cut in half on a cloaked spy, and he takes less damage while cloaked, but in general, giving Engineer his own equivalent to Pyro's Afterburn can make him more independent at tracking and dealing with pesky Frenchmen. I can't understand the desire to give a weapon like this to Engineer specifically, as he has a lot to gain from being able to apply a visual debuff to enemies. If the bleed isn't what secures the kill, then a second melee swing or follow-up from an astute teammate certainly will be. And speaking of visual debuffs, this weapon's other negative is pretty damn minor, all things considered. This weapon has a super arbitrary 20% extra fire damage vulnerability while equipped, which sort of feels like Valve threw darts at a dartboard to pick this weapon's main downside. I'll be frank, Engineer does not care much about taking extra fire damage. While it can be pretty rough if you get caught out while playing aggressively or attempting to move your buildings, in general, Engineer tends to play pretty close to his nest when running this weapon, and anything that can set him on fire won't make it very far in the face of a leveled sentry. Even if you do happen to get pecked by a long-range Scorch shot round or something, just retreat to your dispenser. The only time it really matters is on the rare occasion that an Ubered Pyro pushes in, and in that case, you'd probably be dead regardless of which wrench you're using. This is one of the most pointless and dismissible downsides in the game, and does really contribute to this weapon's slapdash feeling design. But aside from that, you're pretty much just using the stock wrench. Your building, maintaining, and upgrading are completely unaltered, meaning that if you're accustomed to playing stock wrench Engineer, you can continue doing it completely uninhibited with the Southern Hospitality. In essence, it really is just a stock wrench with a situational upside, and even more situational downside, and no random critical hits. If you've noticed that a lot of the footage I've used in this section is just me playing defensive level 3 Engineer, it's because that really is what you're doing with this weapon. None of its stats are definitive or weapon defining enough to facilitate an alternative playstyle. It really is just stock with some extra bells and whistles. So as for why I think this weapon is slept on, it's primarily just because it's kind of boring. It's not bad by any stretch, and there is a legitimate argument to be made that it is a straight upgrade over the stock wrench in most defensive situations, but it's also a profoundly simple and uninteresting weapon. Compared to the speed of the Jag, the utility of the Eureka effect, and the playstyle facilitating design of the Gunslinger, the Southern Hospitality just doesn't have an interesting enough hook or strategy to make it an immediate first option for most players. I definitely did enjoy using it for this video, like look at some of these kill streaks I went on, but I can also kind of understand why some players tend to forget about it. Still though, the Southern Hospitality is not a bad weapon at its core. It may be boring and a bit white bread flavored, but it's still plenty usable and useful as a weapon. If you're someone who tends to run the stock wrench, you've really got nothing to lose by trying the Southern Hospitality. It won't redefine Engineer for you, but it's consistent, functional, and plenty usable, and that's more than some other TF2 weapons can say. I may be from New York, but even I can appreciate some good Southern Hospitality.
I want you to meet the Enforcer. I want my name to be Spaghetti. Alright, Spaghetti. Whatever, I don't care.
And our final slept-on weapon for this video is Spy Snub-Nosed Little Sprunkly the Enforcer. This technically is a weapon I've talked about on YouTube before this, and quite negatively too. However, that was in the Weapons Valve Actively Hates video, which was literally the first TF2 video I made after a 2-year break from the game. I barely knew what I was talking about at that point, and didn't even know how to disable a resample, so my opinions on the Enforcer in that video are best left ignored. My modern opinions on the weapon are much more positive, and while I do agree with the general community notion that it is the weakest revolver in Spy's lineup, that does not at all make it a bad or useless weapon. Let's dive in. The Enforcer is an unlockable revolver for Spy, a small snub-nosed revolver with a pearl grip. This gun boasts one unique stat amongst Spy's revolvers and one unique stat amongst the entire game. Its first upside is a flat 20% damage bonus while disguised, meaning that the weapon allows you to jump scare enemies out of a disguise with a noticeably stronger reveal shot. Additionally, this weapon features an entirely unique resistance piercing ability, allowing its shots to ignore enemy resistances and always deal its ordinary amount of DPS. As a primary trade-off, this weapon features a 20% slower firing speed than the stock revolver, making its overall DPS lower, and it can't get random critical hits. Whoa, who put that there? The Enforcer is an interesting weapon within TF2, as both of its positive stats are completely unique to it. No other Spy revolver features an interaction with its disguises that's even remotely similar to this weapon, and its resistance piercing ability is entirely unique to the whole game. Damage resistances tend to be unsung heroes within TF2 matches, considering how important consistent damage thresholds are to the game flow, so having a weapon that goes through them is remarkably novel and useful in the right circumstances. That said, the Enforcer is also a notably unremarkable weapon, providing a very consistent and useful set of positives, yet failing to reach either the highs or lows of some of Spy's other revolvers. Starting from the top, the 20% extra damage while disguised is a surprisingly fun and effective stat. All things considered, you should have a disguise up at all times while using the Enforcer. Even if you don't intend to use it for infiltration, the one shot of boosted damage you get before dropping your disguise can be exactly what you need to blindside an enemy with either a crippling fight opener or an unexpected fight ender. It's incredibly fun and BM to drop a fleeing low health enemy with a boosted Enforcer shot out of a disguise before they can even react, and in the event that you sneak up behind a light class or a wounded important pick, the boosted damage can be all you need for a clean 1 or 2 shot. This actually works in tandem with this weapon's resistance piercing as well, as there are some very impactful damage barriers you can breach using this combination of stats. Specifically, this weapon's boosted damage and resistance piercing allow you to cleanly one-shot unbuffed kunai spies through their dead ringers, which is basically the Spy main equivalent to being told that everything you've ever known and believed is wrong. This weapon is an unironically great check to fellow enemy spies and light classes in general, and I can't take that away from it. However, the utility of being able to surprise unaware enemies and cleanly 1 or 2 shot specific targets kind of conflicts pretty heavily with some of Spy's other noteworthy weapons. Specifically, yeah, Spy has weapons like the Diamondback and Ambassador that are arguably just as capable, if not even better, at blindsiding enemies out of disguises. A roughly 75 damage one-time attack can't really compete with a guaranteed 102 damage one from any range. That said, the Enforcer does have 2 concrete upsides over these weapons that I feel give it more of a niche than people give it credit for. One is that it's unconditional. So long as you're disguised, you won't need to hit the enemy's heads or have secured a backstabber sap beforehand to guarantee the extra damage. And unlike those 2 weapons, its per shot damage is otherwise identical to the stock revolver. The other upside is this weapon's damage piercing. Now, I'll be honest, the damage piercing effect doesn't come into play too terribly often. While it does pretty effectively counter everything you'd want and expect it to, save for the damage resistance on sapped sentries for some reason, shooting an enemy under the effects of a Vaccinator, Uber, or Brass Beast Res with your revolver shouldn't exactly be your first choice. If you're just attempting to outdamage enemies raw with resistances using the Enforcer, then you can expect to be thoroughly and decisively humbled. That said, as I mentioned earlier, this stat works exceptionally well in tandem with the Enforcer's damage bonus while disguised. The 2 of them together basically allow you to become, for lack of a better term, your team's Enforcer, securing clean, efficient kills on low health enemies who think they're safe behind their resistances. From the outset, this is clearly not a gun you're meant to use for full-on front-facing gunfights. You're meant to use it as a surprising cleanup tool for weakened, overconfident, or fleeing enemies. To this end, I honestly think it's one of the more thoughtfully and elaborately designed weapons in the game. Its overall DPS is lower than the stock revolver due to its slower firing speed, but to its credit, it's not trying to match the same niche as the stock revolver. For what it is and what it's clearly intended to do, I find the Enforcer to be a fun and effective weapon. It only falls off when you try and use it in situations it's not suited suited for. When you use it as an assassin cleanup type of weapon or to catch enemies who assume they're in the clear off guard, it's startlingly solid. So all in all, I don't find the Enforcer to be a bad weapon at all. It is most certainly Spy's worst revolver, but Spy's worst revolver is still better than the best of some other TF2 weapon categories. While I understand this is definitely a niche and to an extent outclassed by other options weapon, it's still a surprisingly fun sleeper tool that I unironically enjoy busting out every now and then. Nothing matches one-shotting a low health medic or demo as they flee. All in all, not bad. Also, it's so damn cute. And there's a few slept-on weapons in TF2. This does not at all cover the base of every slept-on or underrated weapon in the game, so if y'all are interested, I'd be more than happy to someday make this the first Weapons Subcategories episode to get a direct sequel. Either way, I find all of these weapons to be fun, worthwhile additions to the game that people generally tend to sleep on. If this video has taught you anything, try and make it that you don't always have to rigidly adhere to a meta. Sometimes trying alternative options can be fun, unless it's the righteous bison.
It's the most fun you can possibly have.
Thanks, hope y'all have a fantastic day before, during, and after watching, and I'll catch y'all later. Cheers! Getting kills in Team Fortress 2 is fun. And for most weapons in the game, that's all they really need to encourage you to do it. The instant gratifying dopamine rush of outplaying, or outlooking, an enemy gamer and seeing that glorious white box in the kill feed. Sometimes it's really all you need. However, there does exist a small subset of TF2 weapons that poise to reward players a bit more tangibly. Weapons that may start the player off at a significant negative base compared to stock, yet pay off consistent skill and smart usage of them by making you even stronger than you would be otherwise. These weapons go by many names, from snowball weapons to Eylander likes, but in this video, I'm electing to call them head-collecting weapons, despite the fact that only 2 of them actually collect heads. We'll talk about that. I want to talk about these weapons, as they're one of TF2's longest running and most prevalent weapon subcategories, yet one that I've ignored up to this point and feel they deserve their dues. Also, no, I'm totally not just making this video because I got a strange festive Eylander at all. Shut up.
Shut up!
All that said, let's roll. Also, before we begin, I do want to mention that I do have a funny YouTuber Patreon now. The perks are all listed at the link in the description. I do still work a real-life job. I'm not just trying to avoid work or e-beg. This is purely a means to help me continue being a TF2 YouTuber and continue doing what I love here for you guys for as long as I can. So if you're at all interested, that's in the link in the description, but it's not at all required or mandatory of you to continue enjoying my videos as you always have. Thanks, and let's get on to the video.
There can be only one!
Let's start off with the original poster child of the head-collecting weapons brand in TF2. It's one of the game's most iconic subclass facilitating tools, and one that wears its intended design and inspiration on its sleeve. Demoman's Eylander. This weapon is so damn cool, being nothing more than a large, worn, blood-soaked claymore that Demoman can use to decapitate his enemies. It's such a badass design, and one that, through its extensive lore, in particular spotlight within the game's branding, is unmistakable within TF2's weapon lineup. It's also a pretty elaborate reference to both Demoman's origins in the Scottish Highlands and the movie Highlander, which I like because it's also the basis for one of my favorite power metal songs of all time. The Eylander is all in all a very multi-layered weapon on a design and concept level, despite the relative simplicity that could come with the concept of just a big sword. You know what they say, there can be only one, so let's discuss the Eylander. The Eylander is an unlockable achievement melee weapon for Demoman. A large, blood-spattered claymore haunted by a malevolent spirit, this weapon boasts a longer melee range, a slower holster and deploy speed, and no random critical hits, which are all stats that are typical of Demoman swords. As for this weapon's unique mechanics, it causes the Demoman using it to start each life out with 25 less max HP, putting him at the same HP threshold as a medic and making him susceptible to one-shots from an uncharged sniper headshot. However, each kill the Demoman gets at the Eylander will increase his maximum charge and movement speed by 15 and 8% respectively, up to 4 heads. This caps Demoman out at 210 max health or 235 with the Alibaba's Wee Booties, stronger than a soldier, and makes him only slightly slower than a scout. Additionally, his shield bash damage is increased with each head up to 5, and he'll always be healed for 15 health after getting a kill, regardless of how many kills he has. Lastly, all of Demoman's secured heads are lost on death, resetting him back to his base regardless of how many he had when he was killed. So this is a pretty good baseline to start out at for this video, as it clearly demonstrates what kinds of items these are within TF2. It's almost like this was the first one or something. At a base, these are all weapons that start the player out at a noticeably worse place than stock, often debuffing core key aspects of their classes, yet reward getting consistent kills and staying alive with insane sustainability and snowball potential. Additionally, these weapons tend to interact with each other, transferring heads and kills should a user of one kill a user of another. These are snowball weapons in their purest form, putting the classes they're featured on a sharp incline towards potentially becoming the most threatening thing on any given server they're on if they can stay alive, yet quickly melting to nothing if the player can't get the ball rolling. The Eylander specifically is the most simple and front-loaded in its use cases of all of these weapons. Extra health and movement speed are both very good to have on any class, and being rewarded them passively for securing a few kills is very enticing. On Hybrid Knight or a Demo Man using this sword, a shield, and a grenade launcher, it takes only 2 kills to be ahead of default Demo in terms of HP, and on full Demo Knight, it only takes 1. Combine this with the passive health of the Alibaba's wee booties, and you can very quickly find yourself becoming the scariest goddamn thing the enemy team has to deal with. Honestly, talking about this weapon without going into a full Demo Knight deep dive is kind of difficult, and I know I'll inevitably piss someone somewhere off in this video either way, so I guess it's all an exercise in futility regardless of how we look at it. My personal preferred way to use the Eylander is on full Demo Knight, as I find Hybrid Knight to be exceptionally clunky and gimmicky, and as a full Demo Knight, I can definitely see the appeal of the playstyle. Demo Knight is gimmicky and reliant on favorable maps and game states by nature, but in situations where you can get a roll going, there is very little that can stop you. Your first priority at the start of any given life should be weeding out a particularly daring light class, especially a sniper, spy, or engineer, and swiftly beheading them to get your snowball rolling. Then start working your way up the server's food chain, securing more and more important picks until you're eventually nigh unkillable. Thanks to your baked-in tankiness and longer melee range, any class who struggles to engage one-on-one at close range is virtually a free head, so selectively picking your battles and targeting particularly vulnerable opponents is the key to getting your snowball off to a good start. Once you have a few heads, you'll very quickly find yourself surviving some absolutely wacky shit. When you combine the baked-in buffs and self-sustain of the Eylander with the additional tankiness granted by Demo Man shields, you basically become a dedicated melee-oriented tank for your team, having an effective health against certain damage types that can even eclipse a heavy. The shield you bring along with this weapon plays a huge role in what specific flavor of Eylander demo you end up playing, as the Charge and Targe makes you incredibly tanky, the Splendid Screen makes you incredibly aggressive, and the Tide Turner incredibly mobile. Whichever one you end up bringing will inevitably be what decides the type of Demo Man you're locked into, so picking one that complements your preferred playstyle is paramount to your success. I find Eylander Demo Knight to flourish exceptionally well on symmetrical game modes like King of the Hill, 5CP, and Capture the Flag. That's not to say he can't perform well on asymmetrical game modes, as they tend to have great flank routes and tripping opportunities. However, they also tend to have some more sentries and large groups of enemies working together, which, don't tell anyone, actually hard counter Demo Knight pretty handily. On symmetrical game modes, though, not only your full engineer nest relatively less common, but you're also much more likely to get an unexpected drop on a singular overextending enemy, which is the best way to get a ball rolling. I cannot stress enough how fun, rewarding, and satisfying it is to turn one isolated sniper spy pick into an unstoppable aggressive kill streak. And honestly, that's the main appeal of the Eylander. If one cocky out of position enemy is foolish enough to feed you ahead, then you can very quickly turn that momentum into an insane kill streak. And I don't know if you've heard, but Valve games really like their momentum. I cannot deny the satisfaction and unbridled feeling of power that comes with a successful Demo Knight role. Just being the tankiest thing on the server and terrorizing enemies behind their own lines or on the flank. It's undeniably incredibly fun in the right circumstances, and one of the most effective and enjoyable alternative playstyles in the game. I can understand why Valve dedicated so much of Demo Man's unlockable weapon kit to facilitating this subclass, as it is very fun and novel and brings an incredibly unique flavor to the average TF2 match. Eylander Demo Knight is fun. That said, I'm a little cooler on Demo Knight in general than most others. I've pretty notoriously made my stance on subclasses and meme playstyles known in the past, and while I do consider Eylander Demo to be much more effective and useful to a team than something like Fat Scout or Stake Heavy, for example, there certainly are situations where it just isn't the optimal play to bust out. I cannot stress enough how frustrating it is to be on attack on an asymmetrical game mode, having a sentry nest and enemy hold on the opposing team keeping you from pushing forward, and having the one fucking Demo Knight on your team, refusing to use a real gun because he watched one Solar Light video and insists on throwing himself at the enemy team over and over. Despite the opinions of some very insistent players, Demo Knight is not always the objective optimal play for every match. As I said earlier, Demo Knight is contingent on a favorable map and game state to work properly. You're not going to get much usage out of this subclass on a choke-heavy map with very few flank routes. At a certain point, you're just kind of standing around waiting for an enemy to overextend to get a single head. You need to be able to secure kills to get a Demo Knight roll going, and there will be situations where the enemy team just isn't going to let that happen. A melee-only playstyle can only do so much in the face of an enemy who are hiding behind a wall of guns. Also, this goes for every weapon in this video, and is not at all exclusive to the Eylander or Demo Knight, but you are so severely at the mercy of casual fuckery while using these weapons. All it takes to end your 10-head roll is one astute spy, crack sniper, unexpected sentry spot, well-positioned heavy, or unfortunate random crit that just so happened to catch you off guard. Anything that can consistently one-shot or outdamage you will surely be the cause of a lot of headache using the weapons in this video. But even with all that said, I do still enjoy Eylander Demo from time to time. Even if I don't find it to be the singular most fun thing in the game, it's still damn fun when it works. And hey, if you're having trouble with the things I mentioned here but still want to use this weapon, just try Hybrid Knight. The Eylander as a weapon is reliant on things going your way and enemies allowing you to become unstoppable to flourish, but there are concrete ways to tip the scales in your favor. With the right game state, enemy team composition, and map, there is very little that can oppose a competent Demo Knight. It isn't my personal first pick for every game mode, but when it works, by golly, it really works. And all of it was made possible by one funny little cursed sword.
There can be only one! I am the end. I am here to send you to your ultimate fate.
We've arrived at this part of the video. For those of you who don't know, I've referenced in the past that Sniper is far and away the class I'm conventionally worst at in TF2. While there are individual things I struggle at more, like rocket jumping and trick stabs, Sniper is the class whose core conceit I am consistently the worst at putting into practice. I just can't click on those heads. And that doesn't bode well for this video, as our next weapon, the Bizarre Bargain, is easily the most strict, least lenient, and most reliant on consistent skill to make work out of all of Sniper's primaries, and arguably all weapons in the game. In the hands of a competent, skillful Sniper player, this thing is arguably the single best item in the game at shutting down entire servers. Yet in the hands of someone who struggles to click heads, it's significantly less so. But how can a weapon exist in such a dichotomy? Let's talk about it. The Bizarre Bargain is an unlockable primary weapon for Sniper. An ornate, wood-carved rifle resembling a Giselle, this weapon's primary trait is that it heavily alters the Sniper's charging mechanic based on head secured. At a base, his weapon shots charge 50% slower than Sniper's other rifles, taking over 6 seconds to reach maximum charge. As you secure headshot kills, however, this process is steadily sped up, matching the stock Sniper rifle at 2 heads and taking just under 2 seconds to reach max charge at 6 heads or more. Additionally, all of this weapon's heads are lost on death. This allows a Sniper who can consistently secure headshots to become an extremely threatening source of rapid-fire instant kills, yet severely hampers a Sniper who struggles to click heads on a regular basis. So, right out of the gate, this should seem like either an incredibly strong, damn near game-killing weapon, or an incredibly weak fringe pick based entirely on where your skills as Sniper lie. More so than any other weapon in TF2, this is an entirely skill-dependent tool that's balance lives and dies by the capabilities of the person using it. In the hands of a Sniper who can click heads like it's nothing without a second thought, this thing is pretty much a direct upgrade from stock and a no-brainer to equip. For an inverse type of Sniper though, it's exactly the opposite, requiring 2 heads to even match stock and essentially being a pure debuff without them. What's worth noting though is that this weapon used to be even more strict. On release, the Bizarre Bargain lost 1 head on body shot and completely wiped its head counter on a miss. This was extremely brutal to say the least, and seems pretty much tailor-made for cheaters, as even the best, most accurate Sniper players couldn't be asked to consistently perform perfectly at all times. This weapon quite literally mandated perfect play on release, severely punishing players for hitting heads anything short of 100% of the time. It was pretty much the ultimate flex weapon, requiring blistering overconfidence and a sureness in your aim that was almost delusional at regular human levels of play. Or, you know, LMAO box, that worked too. I tell you this to demonstrate just how bonkers this weapon's current design is, as it's not exactly healthy where it's at now either. Because while its original iteration was incredibly strict, its current version is arguably the opposite. It cannot go understated just how easy it is for a competent, consistent sniper player to shut down a casual server with this weapon. If you're a part of the sniper should be removed from the game crowd, then this weapon is almost certainly your strongest tool in an argument for that case. It's kind of Diamondback-esque, rewarding the player extremely handsomely for performing basic functions of their class well, except on sniper instead of spy, which is kind of a meme statement if you know the general community opinion on these two classes.
You suck.
Once a sniper gets on a roll with this weapon, it is exceptionally difficult to stop him, arguably the most difficult out of every weapon in this video. He becomes capable of dropping anyone with 150 less health in a body shot in less than 2 seconds after only a few heads, and can do the same thing to anyone with a headshot in even less time. Good luck counter-sniping this guy when he's already demonstrated that he's more than capable of reliably headshotting whoever he needs. It's also worth noting that the Bizarre Bargain is the only one of these weapons that doesn't transfer the heads of anyone else who's using them to you when you kill them, which is good because Sniper has to put himself at way less risk to kill other people using this weapon, and he probably shouldn't be able to instantly gain 10 heads for headshotting some hapless Demonite from across the map. Even the heads are lost on death stat isn't as big of a deal on this weapon as it is for any of the others in this video, because in general, it's much easier and safer for a good sniper to regain those heads. Okay, so you managed to counter-snipe, backstab, or dive him, great work. That said, he's already demonstrated that he is fully capable of clicking heads good enough to get a roll going, so what's exactly stopping him from hunkering down at the next point and doing the same thing again? The problem with this weapon at high levels of play is that being good at sniper is a safe, transferable skill in any game state. Even if you manage to kill a Bizarre Bargain sniper who's on a roll, he can always post up and start all over again. There is no definitive counterplay to stop him from doing it like sentries or heavies to Demo Knight. All it takes is being fed by a few light classes to get his roll going again, and all he needs to do is stand back and click some heads. But this really only applies in the case of an exceptionally cracked and consistent sniper player. The vast majority of authentic human players you'll encounter in casual will not be these kinds of snipers. While it is inevitable to eventually be matched up against one of these guys, more times than not, you will not have to deal with a plat Bizarre Bargain sniper pub stomping your server and preventing you from leaving spawn. As I said earlier, this is an exceptionally skill-dependent weapon, and at lower or even average levels of sniper play, this thing is mostly fine. I can say this because I'm bad at sniper, and I know from experience just how detrimental getting on a roll with this weapon can be to your game plan, and just how easy it is to die and lose all of the heads once you do. Look at me, I don't even have a cool Bizarre Bargain. This thing's Civil Servant Mark II. I have this and this, but don't want to shell out for this. That should tell you how often I make good use of this weapon. The Bizarre Bargain, to me, is the ultimate dangling carrot in TF2. A weapon that promises unmatched pub stomping potential and an assured direct upgrade from stock if you can use it well, but only if you can use it well. This thing is insane when turned over into the hands of a competent high-level sniper player, yet only brings crushing disappointment and humbling to any of us lowly plebs in casual. It's the rich get richer TF2 weapon. If you're already well off as the most oppressive class in the game, this thing just kind of tips you fully into Mr. Burns' mega capitalist territory. Yet the vast majority of casual TF2 players are the Homers, Lennys, and Carls of the game, the working class ordinary folk who can only aspire to reach the top someday. Also, people who use the classic and Sydney Sleeper are like the Frank Grimeses. I'm honestly not sure if this capitalism analogy works, but basically what I'm trying to say is that a good Bizarre Bargain sniper is like the 1% of the casual skill economy, and everyone else are the 99%. In a non-social commentary way of putting it, the Bizarre Bargain is kept in check on a balance level simply because not every sniper is a UGC plat god. It is difficult and takes a lot of mechanical execution to land every headshot you fire, and it's even more difficult to stay alive after painting such a large target on your head. If this exact same design was on a heavy minigun or pyro flamethrower, getting stronger and stronger with each kill, it could definitely ruin the game, but it's less severe on a sniper rifle due to the higher required baseline of mechanical skill. I know some people believe getting headshots as sniper is the easiest and most brain-dead thing in the game, just stand back and click heads, but if that were the case, then everyone would be playing Bizarre Bargain sniper at every level of play. All things considered, the Bizarre Bargain is a fucking conceptually wacky TF2 weapon that gets even wackier the better the player using it is. In the hands of a dominant sniper player, this thing is uncontested and genuinely arguable as the single best weapon in the game. Yet in the hands of anyone of a lower skill level, any other sniper rifle is better. This thing only hits its true stride with hypothetically perfect and optimal play. And while I don't think this is objectively a very healthy or good weapon design for a game like TF2, it honestly is kind of a miracle and marvel that it hasn't had more of an impact on the game's overall health than it has. As it presently exists, the Bizarre Bargain is an occasional pub stomping tool when the top brass of sniper players want to bust it out, and not an entirely over-centralizing game-ruining pick. And considering the state of TF2 for the past few years, I'll gladly take that over the alternative.
Good shot, mate.
Justice reigns from above.
Next up, we've arrived at Soldier's Airstrike, a weapon that I'm not entirely sure how to speak about without triggering YouTube's demonetization flags for being incredibly culturally insensitive. We're just gonna have to hand-wave everything to do with this weapon's name and design, and just talk about it as a weapon within TF2. The things we gotta do to be YouTubers for this 16-year-old game. Regardless, the Airstrike is interesting, as it's the first weapon in this video that doesn't actually collect heads, but rather just collects kills in general. Functionally, it's otherwise identical to the other weapons in this video, but I guess doing this to people leaves a bit more than a head behind. It's also probably the closest approximation to a pure gimmick out of everything in this video, and I say that with full knowledge of the Eylander. Regardless, let's discuss some stats. The Airstrike is an unlockable primary weapon for Soldier, a large cylindrical rocket launcher resembling that one thing Oppenheimer made. This weapon's primary trait is its focus on rocket jumping and attacking enemies from above. At a base, its rockets deal 15% less damage to both enemies and the soldier using it, and have a 10% smaller blast radius compared to stock. Neither of these stats affect the soldier's ability to rocket jump, however. When rocket jumping, this weapon's firing speed is increased by a whopping 185%, and its blast radius is further reduced by 20. What all of this basically means is that when you're blast jumping, you can hammer enemies with rapid fire rockets from above. As another primary mechanic, this weapon gains 1 extra rocket in its clip up to a maximum of 8 with each kill, allowing for up to 7 rockets to be rained on enemies after expending 1 for a rocket jump. These are, of course, lost on death. So this is a very neat and fun concept for a weapon in TF2. What we've basically got here is a weapon that allows a soldier who frequently rocket jumps and bombs in on enemies to turn otherwise normal aerial attacks into full-on assaults. The speed and efficiency with which you can pile on damage to enemies with this thing after a few kills and a smart rocket jump is really crazy, and while it is most certainly gimmicky, I can't blame anyone for being enticed by it. Jumping up and hammering enemies with up to 7 or 8 rapid-fire attacks is unmatched in terms of the level of dopamine levels it delivers in TF2. That said, I want to properly stress just how dependent this weapon is on external circumstances to flourish properly. Not only does it basically require a map with either an open sky or high ceiling to work properly, but this weapon is also the most contingent on a smart secondary choice out of all of Soldier's primaries. The immediate obvious choice might be the base jumper, as they were added in the same update after all. However, I found that using these two weapons together makes you an exceptionally predictable aerial sitting duck that's very easy for enemies to counter. My preferred secondary with the Airstrike is the gunboats, as it allows you to rocket jump even more frequently and perform very short regular burst attacks on the enemy team. You can legitimately rocket jump like 4 or 5 times before even reaching half HP with this combo. Also, take the escape plan, and you'll thank me later. Once you've met all of these requirements and found a favorable map to play on, you should very quickly find this weapon being a lot of fun. One thing to remember is that despite everything the weapon is screaming at you to do, you do not always need to rocket jump before engaging enemies with this weapon. On the floor, it fires at the same rate as stock, deals more damage than the Liberty launcher, and has a bigger blast radius than the direct hit, meaning that not too much is sacrificed by using this like any other rocket launcher in a pinch. I found that staying grounded and engaging with enemies like normal is a great way to get a snowball rolling with this weapon, allowing you to safely accumulate a few extra rockets in your clip before you start fully bombing in on enemies. Plus, the extra rockets in your clip can absolutely still help at normal soldier play. The Liberty launcher's best stat is that it has 1 extra rocket, so up to 4 on a much stronger per hit weapon is pretty crazy. However, when you start using this weapon as intended, you'll find its true strength shining. This thing fucks singular enemies raw and divine, and there is nothing in the game that can withstand a 7 or 8 rocket barrage from an Airstrike soldier who positions himself intelligently. Even if you don't secure the kill, you've likely softened the enemy team up significantly for your team. The amount of damage you can pile onto enemies of this thing is insane, and if you use it to repeatedly peek and barrage barrage enemies over vertical cover or on a high ledge. You can be the thing that keeps them from getting too comfortable or setting up a hold. I found that this weapon's strongest niche to be finding a position where the enemy team thinks that they're safe and using the safer rocket jumps and rapid damage afforded by this thing to teach them otherwise. When it works, there is nothing else like this weapon in the game. All of this is helped too by this weapon's particular interactions with TF2's random crit mechanics, specifically due to the fact that you're piling on a lot of damage in very short bursts very quickly using this weapon, and the random critical hit chance scales based on how much damage you've done recently. You'll get a lot of random crits with this weapon. Nothing feels quite as undeserved yet undeniably satisfying as throwing out an extra 3 times damage rocket in your otherwise already very strong barrage. It's like a funny Christmas present that deals over 200 damage. However, there are most certainly a few downsides to this weapon, and in all honesty, most of them seem like honest-to-god oversights rather than explicitly intended negatives. For one, you chew through ammo really quickly with this thing. If this weapon were ever to be buffed, a faster reload speed and more reserve ammo would be the first and second things on my list to give it. You're definitely firing 8 rockets at a time with this thing at peak performance, but that also means you're reloading 8 rockets at a time with the normal rocket reload speed and taking a huge chunk out of your 20 reserve ammo every time you do it. Again, this seems like an honest-to-god oversight, and something that I'm surprised has gone unaddressed with this weapon through every balance patch TF2 got in the 10 years since its release. Additionally, it's surprisingly tricky to actually secure kills on tankier enemies with this weapon thanks to a little universal mechanic known as damage fall off. Due to the fact that you're likely rocket jumping most of the time you fire this weapon, you're putting significant distance between yourself and the enemy with each engagement, and as a result are dealing significantly less damage with each rocket. Combine that with the splash damage fall off and this weapon's slightly inaccurate nature, and you've got a gun that'll sometimes only be dealing about 25 damage with each successfully landed shot. This really hampers this thing's utility as a pure barraging weapon, and again feels like an oversight. Valve kept transferring universal rocket mechanics to a weapon that, by all accounts, is an exception to TF2 and Soldier's universal rules. All in all, the airstrike is a very fun and satisfying TF2 weapon when it works, yet one that is contingent on a lot of outside circumstances to work, and one that's significantly hampered by the base mechanics of the game and class that it's featured on. This feels like a weapon with a lot of untapped mechanical potential, yet one that's massively hurt by just existing in a game with TF2's mechanics. More so than any other weapon in the game, I'd love to see a full rework to the airstrike, addressing some of its fundamental issues as a weapon that are entirely out of its control. Maintain its barraging potential, yet iron out some of its issues as a gimmicky weapon that doesn't exactly play nice with the rules of TF2. All things considered, I do like this weapon, but I fully acknowledge that it's not perfect for every situation. It's gimmicky and reliant on external aspects of the game to flourish, and all around not a carry weapon in any sense of the word, on a class who's otherwise typically very good at carrying. Okay, we're done with that one now. Please don't demonetize me.
That one too fat. This one too tall. This one too symmetrical.
And we've arrived at the final weapon for this video, and easily the weirdest one both in terms of function and in terms of its actual place in the game. Medic's Vita-saw. Would you believe me if I told you that this was the second one of these ever added to the game? Well, technically not, as it did earn its collecting mechanic in a patch in 2016, but the weapon itself has actually existed in TF2 since 2010, and boy did it cause a lot of headache for Valve back then, as its obviously unlicensed Bioshock-inspired design and associated legal red tape has resulted in this being one of the only non-promotional or reskin weapons in the game that can't be strange and can't be bought on the Manco store. It's presumed that Valve wasn't allowed to directly profit off of this weapon's existence for years. Boy, I sure do hope all of this drama was worth it and gave us a cool weapon. About that. The Vita-saw is an unlockable melee weapon for Medic, a rusty cobbled-together syringe clearly modeled after the Atom Harvester from Bioshock. This weapon causes the Medic to receive a flat 10 less max health debuff on equip. This puts the Medic at a very awkward 140 max health value. As a trade-off, this weapon collects the enemy's organs with each successful hit, and for each organ, allows the Medic to retain up to 15% of his Uber charge after death. This maxes out at 60% after 4 organs, and the charge is only maintained if the Medic had it when he died. You will not gain an instant instant 60% Uber if you died after landing 4 hits with the Vita-saw. You need to have already built it up when you died. So I can fleetingly see the appeal of this weapon. In casual specifically, you will likely be dying a lot as medic. He is either team's highest priority target and the most important class to pick on the battlefield, and Uber charge is the most important mechanic in the game. Uber is the game winner in TF2. It is either team's win con, and a poorly timed medic death resulting in a wasted Uber can be the thing that loses a team a match. To this end, I can understand designing a weapon that cushions the blow of dying with Uber as medic. It is a natural part of the medic gameplay loop, so designing a weapon around it does make some degree of sense. Hell, I can even understand the 10 less max health, as being able to maintain an Uber after a death is undeniably powerful and can undermine a lot of the enemy team's work, so a proportionately significant downside is probably warranted. The 140 max health value actually isn't too big of a deal and doesn't cause the medic to cross too many damage thresholds he wasn't already. He's still 1 shot by a body shot or a headshot, is still 3 shot by a hit from most stock melee weapons, is still 2 shot by most primaries, etc. It definitely can come into play. Any amount of decreased max health is significant, but a meager 10-point decrease on a class who was already over the 125 line is definitely on the generous side of what Valve could have given this weapon for a negative. All that said, this is one of the most perplexing goddamn weapons in the game. Its core conceit is solid, maintaining an Uber charge after a death, but for the life of me, I cannot figure out how Valve expects you to put this weapon into practice. The two halves of the Vita-saw's design are directly at odds with each other. It expects you to be both healing your team, steadily gaining and holding onto an Uber charge, but also aggressively attacking enemies at least 4 times a life to be taking full advantage of its only positive. So you want a passive, Uber safety oriented melee weapon that's also aggressive and encourages you to attack enemies? This is such a contrary and self-combating weapon design that I'm surprised more people don't talk about it. It's almost like it wants you to waste Uber and throw yourself at enemies, always tempting you with the promise of a safety net, like some kind of fucked up TF2 Mr. Widemouth. Somebody will get that reference. On top of that, the amount of circumstances that you need to line up to make the most use out of this weapon is almost cosmic. You need to have both died with at least 60% Uber charge and landed exactly 4 swings on an enemy before dying to take full advantage of it. If you have 60 or more charge and only landed 1 swing, then 45% of it goes to waste. If you landed 4 swings but have less than 60% Uber charge, then those swings go to waste. Taking advantage of this weapon, even if you are objectively maintaining an Uber charge, just feels like shit due to how often the circumstances don't line up in your favor. Honestly, I find the most applicable use case for the Vita-saw to be as a panic button. If you know for certain that you're going to die after your heal target is killed, but want to maintain a bit of your Uber as a cushion, then just pull it out and start swinging to get some good hits in before you inevitably go down. This is like the one thing I see this weapon excelling at compared to other options, as a panic button when you know you're going to die. And all of that's not even mentioning the huge elephant in the room, which is the Ubersaw. Why would you ever bring a melee weapon that weakens your class with the promise of maintaining 60% of your Uber charge on death after 4 swings, when you can get 100% with those 4 swings with one of the other options? I realize that this game isn't a binary, there are nuanced situations where either of these weapons could be helpful, but in general, the immediate usefulness of a guaranteed 100% Uber charge for 4 successfully landed attacks will tend to beat out the delayed usefulness of 60% after death for those 4 attacks. You could have used that guaranteed Uber charge to survive and escape and not had to worry about how much you had after dying. This is what makes me so confused about the Vita-saw. It feels so at odds with itself and medic as a class that it's genuinely a wonder that its current design made it past the concept phase. When it released, this weapon had the same negative, yet caused you to passively maintain 20% Uber after a death guaranteed. And while I realize this was not a healthy design and it was a bit too strong for a passive ability, I genuinely prefer it to its current design because at least it's straightforward and not actively beating itself up. If Valve could find a way to bridge these two designs, then I think the Vita-saw could be worth something. As is though, I'm comfortable calling this medic's worst unlockable melee. Every other medic melee has a niche. The Ubersaw builds free Uber, the Amputator provides AoE healing, the Solemn Vow provides the gift of knowledge, and even the stock has the highest no drawbacks DPS. The Vita-saw, however, is just a confused Frankenstein of a weapon that wouldn't be out of place in one of Medic's freak show experiments. It does nothing but cushion death in a way that's slower and less reliable than doing the same thing with the Ubersaw, and is all in all a clear loser for this video. I'm glad that this is the weapon that can't be strange. And there's a look at TF2's head, kill, and organ collecting weapons. From fun, if gimmicky, alternative playstyles, to damn near over-centralizing pub stomp weapons, to whatever the hell the Vita-saw is, I'd say this is one of the more mixed bags of weapon subcategories we've discussed in TF2. It's interesting how a group of weapons this old that share such a unified design concept vary so wildly in their usefulness and strength, but I guess it does just go to show the deeper nuances of TF2's balance and design. Even if a bunch of weapons do share something in common, they're not always likely to get along. Just like mixing different groups of nerds in real life. Regardless, thanks, hope y'all have a fantastic day before, during, and after watching, and I'll catch y'all later. Cheers! A very common sentiment echoed by longtime TF2 players is that each class's respective stock weapons, or the weapons every player starts out with without having to invest any time or money into the game, are the objective best-in-slot picks for every class. This is mostly true from my experience. Unlockable weapons in TF2 tend to be side grades or diversions more than anything, and for the most pure, uninhibited version of every class, stock weapons are the way to go. But not always. A few noteworthy exceptions do exist within TF2. Weapons that, through the community's own admission and developed metas, do effectively outclass and replace the stock weapons of their classes. These weapons are very few and far between, and in a game with over 130 unlockables, it's a wonder that so few do exist. But to some extent, they still do, and in this video, I want to talk about them. These are TF2's stock replacement weapons, or best-in-slot weapons that require some sort of investment from the player to earn. I want to stress that I'm not making this video as any sort of indictment or hit on Valve or the game. I'd much rather a free-to-play game use TF2's unlockable system than some other games, and at the end of the day, I unabashedly love this 17-year-old game and just want to review its weapons through a unified filter. That said, let's roll.
Check out who I just met buying a crossbow. This dude is the shit.
I shall use this crossbow to pierce my broken heart.
So we're going to be making this video as kind of a medic sandwich, and I mean that in terms of what weapons we're reviewing in what order, and not some obscure DeviantArt fetish. But yeah, Medic actually has two of these weapons. He's in an interesting position because both his stock primary, the syringe gun, and his stock melee, the bone saw, are often cited as some of the worst and most disposable stock weapons in the game. He's helped tremendously by his stock secondary being far and away the single best stock weapon in the game, but if you're a fresh installed TF2 player, you're objectively not playing Medic at peak performance until you start unlocking some weapons. And when it comes to primaries, you'd be hard-pressed to find a better one than the Crusaders crossbow. The Crusaders crossbow is the unlockable TF2 weapon. It's very often cited as the single best unlockable in the game, and I remember watching videos from as far back as like 2011 declaratively calling it the best tool on offer to any class. It offers so much utility to the average medic player that the opportunity cost of not equipping it is oftentimes a direct detriment to yourself and your team. The overdose and the Blutsauger certainly have merit, but they also have some very stiff competition in the form of the crossbow. It's also, funnily enough, not a crossbow. Like, this is a gun with crossbow furnishings. It doesn't have a drawstring that pulls back or any true crossbow mechanisms. But even with its deceptive design, it's still an amazing weapon. Let's discuss why. The Crusaders crossbow is an unlockable primary weapon for medic, an elaborately decorated gun disguised as a crossbow. This weapon fires singular syringes in a clean, lengthy arc that both heal teammates and deal damage to enemies. The healing and damage are affected by reverse damage falloff, increasing in potency the further away the medic is from his target. The healing is always double the damage this weapon would deal to enemies, and isn't affected in potency based on how recently the target has taken damage, making this weapon exceptionally strong for in-the-moment burst healing from any range. It also builds Ubercharge with successful heals, so the amount is lower than the equivalent healing with the medigun. This weapon's only downsides are a completely negligible no headshot stat, and having 75% less reserve ammo than stock, which doesn't really matter due to being a single shot weapon and not a rapid fire one like the stock syringe gun. It also reloads while it isn't the active weapon for good measure. First thing to mention here, as it's imperative to understanding the crossbow's basic role, is that this is not a hit scan weapon. It's cut from a very similar mechanical cloth to the huntsman, firing a fast moving arced projectile that has to be tracked in lead rather than instantly hitting enemies you click on. This is similar to Medic's other syringe guns to an extent, whereas they shoot rapid fire needles that travel very quickly. The crossbow fires a single big chonkin arrow that sticks into enemies and surfaces. Its firing speed and arc are universal, unlike the huntsman, and don't have a charging mechanism or anything like that, but otherwise, it's basically an air gun that shoots big needles. Learning to aim and land Crusaders crossbow bolts is a medic skill in and of itself. But here's the thing. The Crusaders crossbow is the best unlockable weapon in TF2. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. There certainly are a few stock weapons that might outpace it, but in terms of raw utility afforded to a single class through equipping an unlockable weapon, the Crusaders crossbow is far and away the best singular tool in the game. This thing is medic. If you want to play the most highly optimized, useful to your team version of the best class in the game, you have to run the Crusaders crossbow. Medic does have other unlockable syringe guns that are good, but there's a reason you always get weird looks from your team for equipping them. They are eclipsed in general all-purpose utility by the Crusaders crossbow. To be completely fair though, when it comes specifically to combat and fighting enemies, it is definitely outpaced somewhat by Medic's other syringe guns. The Crusaders crossbow fires singular bolts in a linear arc, and while it certainly is possible to line up an incredibly flex long-range skill shot and pick some fleeing low-health enemy, it's also very committal to fire even a single bolt, and when you're dealing with an average per-shot damage of around 50 per, it's not great for extended, dedicated gunfights. It absolutely can be a fringe burst damage killing tool in the face of an enemy who's already been softened up or just needs that little push into death, but in general, this weapon is best used as a healing tool that can also secure kills, and not the other way around. And when it comes to being a healing tool, well, this thing's just as bad as good as it can possibly be. To put it simply, it is very strong and very useful to be able to heal enemies from a distance as medic. When you first read this thing's stats, you might think that the healing on hit effect is some cheap novelty that heals off like 10 per hit or something, but no, this thing heals in excess of 75 health per syringe at the lowest amounts, and up to 150 at the highest. Getting good at landing crossbow bolts is an important skill check on medic. Being able to consistently throw out skill shots from across the map to instantly top off teammates and keep them in the fight can be vitally important to you and your team's success, and is ultimately just as important of a medic skill as Uber management. Medic is sometimes criticized for being an easy or simple class, but using the crossbow well is a skill that requires practice and good aim. And what's really crazy is that it isn't just good for long-range Hail Mary healing. In the throes of an impactful push or heated team fight, being able to instantly heal someone for 75 or more HP at close to medium range with a single bolt can be just what they need to get back in the fight, and allows you to be much more dynamic in picking your heal targets and popping off multiple teammates. The in-the-moment burst healing afforded by this weapon is tremendous, and if you're ever in the throes of healing your tanky pocket and see an unfortunate wounded light class hobble up to you like a hurt animal, a single crossbow bolt is all you need to send them on their way. It allows you to be incredibly non-committal and consistent in healing multiple teammates extremely quickly, rather than needing to plant your feet and attach your medigun leash to each one for several seconds. And guess what? You still get Uber for this. While it is true that the Uber per healing rate is less than what you get for the same amount of healing on the medigun, you're still gaining Uber either way, which makes quick burst healing with the crossbow an incredibly risk-free and no drawbacks way of doling out heals to your entire team. Fun fact, the only straight-up nerfs this weapon ever received were in Jungle Inferno, surprise surprise, and it was to make its Uber build rate scale based on your heal target's recent damage in the same way as the mediguns. This was a fair change to make, as it did effectively allow the crossbow to completely outpace the medigun before this, but they didn't remember to give its healing the same scaling, so it's still capable of outputting insane burst healing all the same. And that's kind of the thing with the Crusaders crossbow. When it comes to healing specifically, this thing does literally everything the medigun does at an arguably much more flexible and compact pace. While I would never argue that this weapon outpaces or replaces the medigun, you definitely should not follow behind your pocket repeatedly sticking them with crossbow bolts. It most certainly augments and facilitates the medigun in the way that an unlockable weapon in this game can usually only dream of. This is like the single best tool in the game at making the class it's featured on even better at doing what they do naturally. And when what that class does naturally is inarguably the most important role to fill in the game, healing teammates and providing Uber, then you've got the recipe for a very good weapon. While it's not great for straight up combat, Medic is a healer first and foremost, and what this weapon allows him to do in the field of healing makes it without a doubt his most consistent and reliable tool in facilitating his basic job. This thing basically takes Medic's already potent supportive capabilities and just straps rockets to them. In not equipping the Crusaders crossbow, you are objectively depriving you and your team of what could otherwise be very impactful utility and flexibility. There's not a single other weapon in TF2 with this much opportunity cost for not equipping it, and for that, the Crusaders crossbow is probably the best weapon in TF2. Also, it's the only one in this video that's not an achievement item, so have fun getting one.
I never want to leave this bed. Uh-oh. Gotta take away this
I bet you didn't expect to see this one in the video, unless you looked at the thumbnail. Can you tell I script these pretty late? Yeah, the sniper's very iconic Jarate isn't exactly cut from the same cloth as the other weapons in this video. Whereas every other weapon we'll discuss here effectively acts as an augment or extension to their class's natural abilities that only makes those natural abilities stronger, giving up little to nothing when changing from stock, the Jarate teeters much closer to being a side grade. There is a reasonable argument to be made that it is different enough from the sniper stock SMG to not warrant being in this video. That said, I think we'd be kidding ourselves if we pretended that most new sniper players, or even long-term experienced ones, wouldn't take the Jarate over Sniper's SMG 9 times out of 10. Think about it this way. Which one have you, as a TF2 player, been on the receiving end of in casual more? Have you been splashed with Jarate or gunned down by an SMG sniper more times? It is a literal jar of human piss, and yet it's one of the most consistently useful and recognizable tools in TF2. Let's talk about it. The Jarate is an unlockable achievement secondary weapon for Sniper. A mason jar of the sniper's own human pee, this weapon is a throwable that travels in a clean arc and shatters on contact with any surface or enemy it touches. Once shattered, nearby enemies are coated in the glorious yellow nectar within for 10 seconds, which induces a variety of negative effects. Enemies coated in Jarate take mini crits from all sources of damage, including things typically unable to deal crits like sentries or afterburn. Their player model is given a yellow tint, and their view is covered in a warbly yellow overlay effect. Additionally, enemy spies soaked by Jarate have their cloaks and disguises shorted out, revealing their positions through the visual debuffs. Lastly, the Jarate can be used to extinguish both yourself and teammates while on fire, and doing so will reduce its usual cooldown from 20 to 16 seconds. So, before we talk about anything to do with this weapon's gameplay, we need to talk about its design and concept. It certainly demands some degree of attention. TF2 was definitely an irreverent game before Jarate was introduced. It had a wacky and over-the-top sense of humor from the very beginning, but the introduction of Jarate in 2009 was when the game's true sensibilities were put on full display. It was literally revealed as an unassuming background joke in Meet the Sniper, and later as an April Fool's joke, with nobody seriously considering it as a weapon in-game. But then it was, and was given a ton of publicity through a series of very funny satirical comics and ads, and an overall intense spotlight in the game's marketing and branding. Jarate, despite how irreverent and disgusting the concept is a weapon that's greatly demonstrative of TF2's charm, wit, and one-of-a-kind writing and sense of humor. Combine this with its very funny name that completely omits anything to do with it being P from its branding, it's literally just Jar and Karate combined, and you've got a weapon that clearly demonstrates why TF2 was such a keeper even back in the late 2000s. Also, it's P, and that's funny. But in terms of gameplay, what makes the Jarate such a truly noteworthy tool is just how much it erases snipers' typical struggle points as a class. This is a weapon that, through its simple existence, nullifies a ton of snipers' base level hard counters and difficulties. It's actually pretty controversial for this reason. I've heard a lot of people argue that the Jarate is one of the most poorly balanced and ill-conceived weapons in the game, which is funny because very little of that umbrage has to do with it being a jar of human urine. People's issue with the Jarate stems from the fact that it's a very non-committal weapon that allows Sniper, a class infamous for one-shotting at long range, to do the same thing at close range without the required skill investment of quickscope headshots. Should the most oppressive class in the game at long range also be capable of doing the same things at close range? I don't know, I'm a heavy main, I basically eat crayons. But yeah, the Jarate's primary utility to the Sniper is as a Hail Mary panic button for over-encroaching flankers. When combined with the Bushwalker, a weapon that deals guaranteed 195 damage crits whenever it would normally mini-crit, you've basically got a guaranteed one-shot instant death combo on all of the game's most noteworthy flankers that only requires 4 inputs to use properly. Press 2, press mouse 1, press W, and press mouse 1 again. Considering that all of the game's most common flankers have less than 195 HP, and that even a roamer soldier will likely be softened up from rocket jumping to your position, this effectively allows Sniper to mollywop anyone who gets within his personal space. Literally only a heavy and a perfectly healthy soldier can survive the old Jarate chop. This is dubious for multiple reasons, but the most of which is that Sniper is already the most oppressive class in the game at long range. Conventional game design logic would henceforth lead you to believe that he'd naturally be weaker at close range, but TF2 isn't exactly known for being conventional. What this results in is frequent situations where you'll bust your crumb trying to close the distance on a cracked Sniper, only for him to whip out his P-jar and wanker whacker and put you 6 feet down under before you can react. I honestly don't even feel like the Jarate or Bushwalker are especially over-centralizing on their their own, just exceptionally strong as a combo. I understand wanting to design weapons to cover a class's weaknesses, but I also don't think that the game's dedicated long-range instant kill class should also be capable of instant killing at close range. Think about what Sniper's most common hard counters are. A scout getting behind him, shooting him before he can unscope, a soldier rocket jumping to his position and popping him up for a sleek air shot, a spy sneaking behind him and taking advantage of his tunnel vision, etc. All of these things keep Sniper in check under normal, casual gameplay circumstances, yet when put on the receiving end of the old Jarate Bushwalker failsafe, they're suddenly much less capable of safely taking him on one-on-one. While it can be argued that all you need to do is avoid and stay out of the Sniper's melee range, depending on the map and game state, that's not always an option. The Jarate Bushwalker combo really is one of the most effective and dangerous item synergies in the game. That said, when removed from the Bushwalker combo context, I find the Jarate to be a pretty fun and neat weapon that's nowhere near as over-centralizing as it is in that context. Part of my appreciation for the Jarate is just how strong it is as a supportive tool. As I mentioned earlier, the debuff is unique in that it causes enemies to take guaranteed mini-crits from sources that can't usually do that, and they also mitigate damage fall off, meaning that you can be an enormous help to your team by just flashing this item on enemies and setting your team loose. The amount of mileage you can get out of just blind tossing this item at a group of opponents and pissing off is pretty insane, and any teammate will appreciate dealing no frills mini crits just because their sniper took in too many liquids the previous night. If you can angle your throw just right to maximize the amount of enemies you hit with the splash, you can have a surprisingly hefty impact on a push and the results of a match. This is effectively an AoE debuff that you can apply to multiple enemies at a time. While it is tempting to save it for personal selfish use, it can genuinely be a game winner when used proactively. Additionally, this weapon can extinguish teammates, which I'm actually not entirely certain P can do in real life, stay in school kids, and this is an underrated utility in my opinion. A sniper who's on fire is likely unable to perform his basic role without saintly focus due to the constant aim punch that afterburn causes, so in a pinch, tossing Jarate to extinguish yourself can be worth it to stay in the fight and keep sniping. When it comes to a teammate, take note of their health. If a teammate is on death's door, especially a medic or team anchor, and is burning, sacrificing the Jarate for 16 seconds is a worthwhile exchange for keeping them alive. There's nothing like being the golden savior of your team and casting your healing nectar to rescue them from a fiery, narrow death. However, if you're near spawn, a health pack, a healthy medic, or just water, you might want to conserve your Jarate for a more pressing use case. Despite how good it feels to save a teammate, it is pretty embarrassing to waste your Jarate and then have them walk into a resupply cabinet anyways. That's ultimately the Jarate's real negative. It's very committal to use even once due to its lengthy cooldown, and since it's expended after a single use, you have to exercise caution and picky choosiness with enemies and how you use it. Compared to the SMG, which can provide constant pressure to enemies and a safe fallback tool, or the backpacks, which have passive use cases, Sniper's Jarate is a somewhat committal and active weapon that lives and dies by how intelligently you use it. That said, when it is used intelligently, it's without a doubt Sniper's most impactful and consistently useful secondary, and one that can absolutely turn the tides of a round with proper usage. The ease of securing a pick on an important enemy playmaker skyrockets when they're taking 35% extra guaranteed damage from all sources. All in all, the Jarate just barely scrapes its way into this video. If Sniper had a better stock secondary, I could easily see this being more of an argument, but as is, the Jarate's all-around utility compared to how disposable the SMG is really results in a very easy decision for most Sniper players. For reference, I am a stock SMG apologist. I have an Australian one for a reason, but even I can't deny what the true golden god of sniper secondaries is. The Jarate just offers too much for a serious sniper player to not at least consider bringing in most traditional loadouts. While I don't usually discuss competitive on this channel, it is worth noting that the Jarate is fully banned in all traditional comp formats, and is all around not a weapon you see there too often because of it. It's a disgusting, dubiously balanced weapon, yet also one of TF2's most iconic and recognizable staples. This is definitely Sniper's number 1, number 2.
Sandwich, sandwich, I'm in love with you.
Ah, my boy, my dog, my lunch. In case you don't know, Heavy Sandvich is my chalk pick for my personal favorite unlockable weapon in TF2. While I do agree that its general domination over Heavy secondary slot has been mitigated somewhat since the introduction of the second banana, it's still far and away better than any other option in Heavy secondary arsenal, and despite the insistence of some very dedicated fat scout mains, is the secondary you want to be bringing on Heavy for most traditional loadouts. It offers so much to not only the Heavy wielding it, but also to his team, and is ultimately the reason that Heavy is able to function as a standalone class without the constant supervision of a medic. Also, I own it in real life, so that's cool. Let's talk about the Sandvich. The Sandvich is an unlockable achievement secondary for Heavy, a sandwich composed of bread, lettuce, meat, tomato, and cheese, with a pimento olive skewered through it on a toothpick. This is a lunchbox item, meaning that using it requires the Heavy to eat it. Upon either pressing mouse 1 or the taunt button while holding the Sandvich, Heavy will enter a 4-second eating animation, complete with a very funny chomping voice line, at which point his health will be rapidly healed to max in 4 increments of 75. Heavy is healed multiple times throughout the eating animation, and the overall health gain will always equal 300, or the equivalent of Heavy's non-overhealed max health. Afterwards, the sandwich is put on a 30-second recharge timer that can be entirely skipped by picking up any size health kit while at full health. Lastly, Heavy can press mouse 2 to throw the sandwich to teammates or enemies, acting as a medium health kit that restores 50% of their HP. When Heavy is killed while eating the sandwich, he also drops it as a health kit for enemies. So I'm just gonna bury the lead here. The Sandvich is Heavy. While there is merit to the second banana as a more flanking-oriented Heavy secondary, and a lot of people stand by the shotgun or family business, for a Heavy who's working with their team and acting as a dedicated anchor, you will be hard-pressed to find a better secondary option to bring than the Sandvich. It offers so much sustainability and self-sufficiency to the Heavy, making him so much less reliant on medics and health packs, and even comes with the added perk of being able to help teammates in the thick of things. For everything a Heavy wants to be doing in the average casual match, that is soaking up damage, helping his medic, and literally throwing his weight around, the Sandvich is the best secondary option on offer. Starting from the top, having access to an on-command large health kit anytime you may need it is an ability that any class would kill for, yet is especially noteworthy on Heavy, as he's the class whose biggest strength is leveraging his large health pool and damage to outlast enemies in fights. Without it, he'd be entirely reliant on health kits and medics to stay in the fight, and topped off between engagements. While it is true that the required 4-second eating animation is definitely a bit committal, there are certified ways to ensure you can do it safely and stay in the fight where you may need to. If you press your back firmly against a wall and make sure to only eat it in a safe position, or when you notice at the top of the screen that a good portion of the enemy team is in a respawn queue, then you can easily circumvent the danger that comes with the eating animation. Additionally, the Sandvich doesn't actually instantly heal you for 300 health, and you can very easily use this to your advantage. The Sandvich heals the Heavy in 4 increments of 75 health throughout its eating animation, meaning that even if you're found out while eating, depending on the enemy and their weapon, you may be able to outpace their damage and counterattack simply due to the potency of the heals. I feel like a lot of people tend to note the heals Heavy to max stat without actually taking into account the specific numerical bells and whistles of how it's done. Some classes with some weapons literally can't outpace the Sandvich's healing. There's nothing quite as funny as finishing your lunch and immediately aggressing on the poor unfortunate soul who just happened to be trying to interrupt it. Plus, even the Sandvich's most glaring issue, its 30-second cooldown, is easily mitigated with some map knowledge and smart resourcing. You can consume a health pack of any size to instantly refill your Sandvich's charge meter, allowing you to effectively convert either a small or medium health kit to a full 300 health heal with smart usage. Pro tip, if you're near a small or medium health pack as Heavy and have a Sandvich, instead of picking up the health kit, eat the Sandvich and then pick it up. You converted what would be 150 or less HP into 600 this way. And even if you view this as selfish or depriving your team of a health kit, you've still got a guaranteed medium one in your pocket to share with anyone who needs it. Nothing is lost for you or your team by doing this, so long as you're willing to share your Sandvich with them. And speaking of sharing sandwiches with teammates, this is the definitive thing that puts the Sandvich ahead of the second banana for a dedicated team anchor Heavy. When you have a Sandvich, your team always has access to a guaranteed medium health kit. The uses of this are multiple, but the most noteworthy of them is healing medics. Medic is the most important class in the game, and whether or not he's pocketing you or spreading heals around, being able to top him off and keep him in the fight with a quick 2 into M2 is an indispensable trait to help your team's efforts. Being the thing that prevents a med pick is huge, and even when you're not healing a med, you can still be your team's benevolent hero, offering tasty, nutritious treats to anyone who may need them. The Sandvich basically allows Heavy, who's typically the team's tank, to fill a small supportive niche that everyone will appreciate. All said and done, the Sandvich is the weapon that enables Heavy to do everything that he should be able to do. It enables him to sustain himself, stay in the fight, offer support to his team, and especially his medic, and all-around function as a proper tank. I've mentioned this before, but the introduction of the Sandvich into TF2 really does feel like the thing that fully realized Heavy as a gameplay concept. This thing made him a real contender in the game's class lineup. He would be so much worse without it. This is the building block for modern-day self-sustaining tanks and class-based FPSs. When you combine that with its utility, its icon status is in the game's branding, and its hilarious design and concept, you've got a real keeper of a TF2 weapon. But to be fair, it doesn't allow you to shoot enemies while moving at normal speed, so it's bad.
What if the only thing that makes me smile is slowly sawing your head off?
We've now reached the other bread slice of our medic Sandvich and our last weapon for this video. If you're at all familiar with TF2 and its meta, then I shouldn't have to tell you which weapon this is. It's the medic melee weapon, and depending on who you ask, possibly the single best melee weapon in the game, period. I've already put up the title card, so there's no reason for all this dilly-dallying. Our last weapon for this video is the Ubersaw. Now, this will be a shorter section for this video than usual, as the Ubersaw is just about as effective as it is simple. This thing is really good and can probably be properly explained in like 4 sentences or less. It's medic's best melee weapon for a reason, so let's dive in. The Ubersaw is an unlockable achievement melee weapon for medic. A large, rusted, blood-stained surgical saw with a glowing meter within. This weapon's primary trait is that it causes the medic to gain 25% of his maximum uber charge with each successfully landed hit. This means that it only requires 4 swings on an enemy to completely fill an uber from nothing. Additionally, getting a taunt kill with this weapon results in an instant 100% uber. You can regain uber while using it with this weapon by switching to it and attacking enemies, allowing you to indefinitely extend uber charges so long as there are enemies to hit. This weapon's only downside for this incredibly strong positive is a flat 20% slower swing speed, meaning that it takes just under 1 second to throw out each swing. This gives it a lower DPS than stock, but call it a hunch that most people really don't mind. So, just like the crossbow from earlier, this is an extremely useful set of positives for a comparatively negligible negative that results in an insane amount of opportunity cost for not equipping this weapon. For reference, I really like the Solemn Bow, but even I can't deny that you're basically denying you and your team a lot of potential utility by not equipping the Ubersaw. 25% of your uber charge, which let me remind you is the game winner in TF2, the thing that the game is balanced around, is an absolutely tremendous thing to gain for a simple no-frill 65 damage melee swing. If I may bury the lead again here, I genuinely think that the Ubersaw could do with another negative, but I have no idea what you could give it that wouldn't be a buff in disguise. A damage penalty would just mean more swings. In any situation where you can safely and reliably swing on an enemy with this weapon, you're guaranteeing you and your team 1/4 of an uber charge. Even if you only manage to get 1 swing in before an enemy dies or gets away, 25% is still gargantuan. Shaving even 10 or 15% off your uber charge build time would be huge, and 25% for basically nothing is borderline comical. This is an inarguably, indescribably front-loaded weapon design that offers nothing but positives to the medic using it. It also random crits more than RBY Persian Slash, which is very funny. This can actually be a bit of a negative, funnily enough, as instantly killing your enemy means less swings and thus less uber. This is a weapon where getting a random crit and instantly killing your enemy is the negative outcome. If you ever happen upon an AFK enemy, a taunting enemy, a distracted enemy, or a throwing heavy, then you're effectively looking at a guaranteed uber charge. And even if you don't, just throwing in a random swing or two during a fight can be more than enough to top you off. I cannot stress enough how powerful this weapon is at facilitating a medic to constantly have an uber charge up and building. The speed and efficiency with which you can gain it with this thing is insane, and allows medic to both stay on the offensive in situations where he may need to, while also simultaneously working towards his most important ability. This is actually a pretty multifaceted aspect, as it allows him to effectively extend an uber charge duration indefinitely so long as there are enemies to hit. If you're ever using an uber and fighting a tanky enemy, you've got nothing to lose by quickly switching to your Ubersaw, taking a pot shot, and switching back to your medigun. The time spent on uber will likely be brief enough to be safe, and the payoff is a guaranteed 25% of it being replenished. This also allows for uber chaining, which is funny if you're on TF2 YouTube in 2013. And all of this incredible utility being stacked into one stat comes at the sole negative of a 20% slower swing speed. I can see the vision behind this, as it does mean that each swing is more committal and makes it a bit more difficult for a medic to fully mine ubers from enemies before being outgunned, but it's also remarkably lenient for how strong this weapon's positive is. For reference, this weapon has the same swing speed as the Market Gardener, Crit Gloves, and Ullapool Caber, which are all weapons that people generally like. Okay, maybe not the Caber, but you get what I mean. This is a ludicrously lenient negative that is not at all proportionate to this weapon's strengths, but again, I don't really know what else you could give it that wouldn't compromise its design. Fun fact, the Ubersaw has literally never received a mechanical change in TF2. It's virtually the same now as it was when it released in 2008. And honestly, despite how flabbergasted it sounded in this section, I'd probably be pretty bummed if the Ubersaw genuinely did get nerfed. Despite how powerful and over-centralizing it is to Medic, I don't think anyone would argue that it's OP or desperately needs to be changed. Medic kind of needs something like this, a risk versus reward offensive option to help vary up his gameplay and give him some dynamic decision making on the battlefield. Without the Ubersaw, Medic would be a much less fun class to play optimally. I like that a weapon which adds so much variance to Medic's gameplay plan exists. Sometimes it's fun to throw yourself at a heavy for a Hail Mary swing or fish for a taunt kill. Well, it does kind of feel like shit to get killed by this thing and definitively know that you're feeding the enemy medic. I think we can all agree that medic as a class would be way worse without the option of the Ubersaw. It's not brilliantly balanced, but it's far from broken or game ruining, and I can name loads of TF2 weapons that I'd want to see change before this one. It's fundamental to TF2, has existed for longer than some TF2 players have been alive, and truly is the ubermensch of medic melees.
Opal, rate my knife.
Oh,
rate the sharpness of my knife.
Is it you're playing sniper? Let me that's a good, pretty sharp knife. How do you like mine?
I don't know. Here, hold on. Let me. Here, can you?
Hey, that's not me.
Okay.
So there was a look at some best-in-slot unlockable weapons in TF2. Something I noticed about them while writing this video is that, despite how strong they all are, none of them are exactly broken, game-ruining, or problem weapons. They exist in this weird position where they do effectively outpace their class's stock weapons, and are, by all accounts, the true defaults for each class, yet also exist in relative harmony with the rest of the game's balance and don't ruin anything. Maybe the Jarate is a bit much, but otherwise, these weapons are core to TF2. Seeing any of them be nerfed would be like changing the logo or the color of the dirt on Dust Bowl. These weapons are parts of TF2's identity, its DNA, and while we can argue all day about balance or pay-to-win design, I think we'd be kidding ourselves if we pretended that the shotgun or SMG deserve more icon status than the Sandvich or Jarate. They may be stock replacements, but you can't replace them in our hearts. Thanks, hope you all have a fantastic day before, during, and after watching, and I'll catch you all later. Cheers! Subclasses are one of the Team Fortress 2 community's favorite things about the game. The concept of equipping a certain weapon or combination of weapons that completely turn your class of choice on their heads. Oh, do you not want to rev up and move slowly as heavy? Boom, Fat Scout. Do you not want to use explosives as Demo Man? Boom, Demo Knight. Do you not want to build a full nest as Engineer? Boom, Therapy. For real though, subclasses and the existence of them are a huge part of TF2's casual appeal, and are one that I've been pretty uncharitable to in my past videos. I've mentioned a few times that I generally enjoy playing classes optimally or as intended more than indulging subclasses, but that ends today. It's time to give some of TF2's most iconic subclass facilitating weapons their dues. In this long overdue Weapons Subcategories episode, we'll be discussing 3 weapons for 3 classes that fundamentally change how they're played and enable a full subclass playstyle. Are they just goofy gimmicks at best, or worth their weight in effectiveness? Let's find out. I want to stress that we'll be generally discussing the weapons themselves and how they figure into each class and subclass, and not getting into the bells and whistles of the subclasses or their individual nuances. All that said, let's roll.
Welcome to the family, son.
So we're going to be starting this video off on a little bit of controversial ground, for me at least. I've made it no secret in my past videos that I am a heavy main. It's like the main thing that people know about me, apart from having a weird voice. And as a heavy main, I've been a staunch supporter of the Sandvich superiority regime. In both jokes and serious commentary, I've had less than kind things to say about heavy shotguns and their usefulness to him as a class. I just enjoy playing with the Sandvich more. I value the sustainability and support of the Sandvich more than the extra damage of the shotguns. What can I say? The heart wants what it wants, and in this case, I want food. That said, people have been very adamant to call my bluff, giving me a laundry list of both valid and invalid reasons to run a shotgun on heavy that I had not fully considered until having them brought to my attention. Also, apparently Uncle Dane recently made a video hyping up shotgun heavy, which I actually on God didn't know about until Big Joey mentioned it to me, because little known fact about me, I'd rather do many painful and embarrassing things than watch other people's TF2 videos. But yeah, seems like a better time than ever to reevaluate my stance on shotgun heavy. And when it comes to shotgun heavy, you'd be hard pressed to find a better option to bring than the family business. This is definitely one of TF2's more low-key weapons. Outside of being the Fat Scout gun, this is a heavy exclusive unlockable shotgun that most players don't tend to seriously consider due to its generally boring stat lineup and stiff competition in heavy secondary slot. I feel like the only time you ever really see people using this thing are when a group of like 6 heavies rush to point all using it as a meme tool. a real blitzkrieg of overweight gunfighters. I've personally never been terribly impressed by the family business myself, but I've also barely used it outside of fringe Fat Scout sessions on like 2 Fort and Hightower. So to start off this video about subclass weapons, let's take an earnest look at the family business as a TF2 weapon and not as a meme. It is Heavy's only class-specific damage dealing secondary after all, so I'm more than ready to be proven wrong about my prior view on it. The family business is an unlockable secondary weapon for Heavy, a pristine pump-action shotgun with a retractable stock. This weapon's primary attributes are its ability to fire a lot and very fast at the cost of damage per shot. It loads an additional 2 shots in its clip compared to the stock shotgun, granting it a total of 8 shots before needing to reload. It also fires 15% faster, allowing it to repeatedly hammer enemies with frequent punches of burst damage. As its only trade-off, this weapon deals 15% less damage than the stock shotgun, putting its base damage at around 50 per shot. When accounting for shooting and reload times, this results in the stock shotgun having a slightly higher DPS with perfect accuracy, but the family business's larger number of shots allows for more leeway with less than perfect accuracy. Right off the bat, the big question is whether or not the family business is better or worse than the stock shotgun for Heavy, and honestly, I find it to be a pretty even fight. The stock shotgun comes out swinging with a slightly higher DPS with perfect aim, but the vast majority of players will not be able to land every shot, and may in fact find the family business's more forgiving clip size and shot frequency to be a reasonable set of trade-offs for the lower damage. I'll leave this great write-up I found about this exact subject in the description if you're interested. But yeah, the family business functions as a pretty comfortable side grade to the stock shotgun that only begins to falter at inhuman levels of accuracy. Whichever you're more comfortable with and more consistently able to land shots with is the one that you should use, which is how Saxton Hale intended it. No, the real competition for the family business is how it fares against Heavy's other secondaries, the edible ones. Personally, I do enjoy using the Sandvich or Second Banana more even after recording this video, as again, I value the self-sustain and team support more than the additional damage, but I'll be damned, I did come around a lot on the family business after recording this video, and do find it to be really fun in the right situations. One thing that I will hold against it is that it really sucks at first to be reliant on health packs as Heavy, as his slow movement speed makes consistently reaching them at low health kind of risky at best, and I was definitely missing the guaranteed 300 health heal in my pocket at first while recording this video. But once I got adjusted and found myself playing more to the family business's strengths as a weapon, things definitely improved a bit. There are 2 sides to the family business coin, when you're using it as a pure Fat Scout weapon and completely ignoring your minigun, and when you're using it as an augment to your minigun. And if I must be brutally honest for the sake of this video, I gotta say, I still fucking hate the first one. Look, I'm sorry guys, but when I was playing pure Fat Scout for this video, I was just straight up not having a good time. Y'all out here in my comments who main Fat Scout must have stronger constitutions than me, because I can very generously describe this subclass as not for me. I get it, you move faster as Heavy and can still do damage, you can shoot people without revving up, it's less committal, you can leverage your large health pool, I understand. But literally every single time I secured a kill playing this way, I just found myself bemoaning how much easier and more effective it would have been to just shred those same enemies with my minigun. The 50 to 75 damage per shot with the requirement to carefully aim and land each one was just not worth it compared to the over 600 sustain the class is equally capable of by just pressing 1 on the keyboard. Keep in mind that I have several hundred hours playing traditional Heavy and that the minigun and Sandvich are my preferred weapon choices, so I'm not exactly the kind of guy that the Fat Scout playstyle really speaks to, and that's fine. I understand if you like it, but again, I'll give this subclass a very generous not my thing. No, I found that the real enjoyment of the family business comes from using it as an augment to the minigun. Bear in mind, Heavy does not have an item like the Wee Booties for Demo Man. He doesn't have an option that takes away his primary to buff his other weapons. You will literally never be without your minigun if you're playing Heavy and casual, unless you meticulously drain your ammo at the start of each life, and if you're doing that, you should probably be less concerned about what shotgun you're running, and more concerned about seeking serious mental help. Once I realized this and started using the family business to facilitate the minigun Heavy playstyle, I finally did the Danny DeVito meme and really found things clicking. My preferred strategy was as follows. Was I in a hot zone of the map? Was I in a situation where I could reasonably expect to engage multiple enemies? Was I on the front lines? Then it was minigun time. On the flip side, was I moving? Was I repositioning? Was I running to or from a key area? Was I on the flank or susceptible to being flanked? In those cases, it was family business time. For all my grumbling about not finding pure Fat Scout fun, I can 100% vouch for the family business's strength as a fallback tool for cases where you may be caught off guard or engaged unexpectedly. For a long time, I only mentally internalized Heavy shotguns as fight enders for when you ran out of minigun ammo, and didn't really consider using them that often due to Heavy not running out of minigun ammo that often. This was a key logical shortcoming on my part, as shotgun Heavy's true strength is as a fight opener. When an enemy gets the jump on a Heavy, they tend to expect a second long rev before the Heavy can fire back and put them in serious danger. This is how most classes are able to kill him before he can defend himself. So if you're ever in a situation where you may reasonably find yourself caught off guard with your pants down, having the family business primed and ready can be a great adaptation check for your enemies. Those scouts, demos, or soldiers that expect a quick stomp before you can rev up will quickly find themselves up shit creek without a paddle when you start unexpectedly hammering them with family business rounds. Additionally, I actually didn't find aiming with the family business to be too tricky. Here's a little TF2 life hack that I learned. If you hold M1, you will shoot. This means that, by all accounts, you can track with the family business or really any other single shot weapon in the game. Just lock the fuck in, hold M1, and focus on tracking the enemy's movements like you would with any heavy minigun, and you'll find your shots connecting with a consistency that can be pretty staggering at first. I don't know if this is considered controversial or brainless in any way. I've certainly heard some people complain about other similar aiming methods, so I want to reiterate that if you're at all opinionated about the way other people adjust to aiming in a video game that are not cheating, your mother probably smoked while she was pregnant with you. To me, this is much easier and more consistent than treating each individual shot as a make or break Hail Mary that has to be independently lined up and clicked. You should try it, it's pretty neat. Lastly, the family business's damage output actually isn't too big of a deal if you can connect a good number of shots. If you're frequently missing, then you'll probably wind up pretty frustrated at the lack of pure killing power afforded by your 51 damage meat shots, but once you start landing your bullets consistently, I think you'll find that most lighter classes aren't really capable of standing up. Heavy has a lot of health, and you can oftentimes leverage that health pool with this weapon's attack speed and clip size to comfortably outpace enemies in the great DPS race. While I don't often find myself going on crazy kill streaks with the family business due to mainly using it as a fallback tool, I was pleasantly surprised by some of the fights I won with it. I've said it once and I'll say it again, pure damage isn't everything in TF2. The only real shortcoming I found of this entire playstyle is, again, being reliant on health packs and not being able to support teammates. It felt a bit Flog-esque, only being able to stand there and shrug when a nearby teammate or medic was on death's door desperately seeking a sandwich. I mean, I guess I could shoot you. But yeah, as someone who spent the bulk of my time playing heavy with a lunchbox item in my secondary slot, this definitely took some adjustment. But I wouldn't call this a straight up failing of the family business or heavy shotguns, just an alternative playstyle with its own strengths and weaknesses. It wouldn't be fair of me to criticize this gun for not being able to heal, while also ignoring that the Sandvich isn't capable of outputting damage. So all things considered, have my opinions on the family business and shotgun heavy as a whole changed at all? Well, kind of. I'm still unfortunately not a fan of pure Fat Scout. I don't think I'll ever find enjoyment in deliberately handicapping myself for the funny, especially when I know that I have a perfectly good minigun at all times. But to this weapon's credit, I did find a lot of fun in using it as intended, as a secondary damage option to cover the minigun's weaknesses. It's almost like that's what a secondary weapon is designed to do or something. I can definitely see myself trying this playstyle again, which is more than some other stuff I've talked about in the Weapons Subcategories series can say. Do you really think I've used the Airstrike or Man Melter since talking about them? So consider this a win for shotgun heavies everywhere. I walked away from this video respecting and enjoying heavy's damage dealing secondaries more than I did going into it. They have merit. I may still prefer the Sandvich in general, but I can see your point of view now, and y'all have convinced me. Please leave me alone.
I love the Power Glove. It's so bad.
Ah, the Gunslinger, perennial TF2 community punching bag. For those of you who weren't around for it, back in the earlier days of the online TF2 scene, the Gunslinger consistently ranked among the general player base's most hated weapons in the game. This was primarily fueled by a constant smear campaign against it by a certain vintage TF2ber, but to be fair, this weapon's older design was certainly not doing it any favors. For a while, this was the subclass weapon in TF2. It changed engineer so much for so little, and was one of the most contentious weapons in the game as a result. Before a steady stream of reworks and changes in the mid-2010s, it was not uncommon to get screamed out of servers for using this thing. While a good degree of its reputation can be blamed squarely on one person, it would also be disingenuous to call its older design healthy. But, to be fair, it doesn't have that design anymore, and in its current state, I find the Gunslinger to be one of the more layered and interesting singular unlocks in TF2. Also, I bought a strange one, so you better goddamn believe you're gonna listen to me talk about it. The Gunslinger is an unlockable achievement melee weapon for Engineer, a metallic robo hand that takes the place of the engineer's normal gloved right hand. This weapon's primary attribute is that equipping it replaces the engineer's typical upgradable level 3 sentry with the more disposable combat mini sentry. This tiny terror boasts the upsides of building, turning, and shooting faster than a normal level 1, on top of being smaller and easier to hide and only costing 100 metal to build, at the cost of dealing less damage, having only 100 health, and neither being upgradable nor dropping any metal for the engineer when destroyed. Additionally, having the Gunslinger equipped grants the engineer an additional 25 health for a total of 150, and while it can't randomly crit, landing 3 consecutive attacks on enemies without letting go of mouse 1 will always deal a guaranteed critical hit on the 3rd punch. All in all, this bolsters the engineer's survivability and aggressiveness while nerfing his typical defensive utility. So, fun fact, prior to the gunmetal update in mid-2015, the Gunslinger and the combat mini-sentry were incredibly overtuned. If you think they're annoying now, you'd probably have uninstalled in the early 2010s. Currently, mini-sentries start out at 50% HP while building and have to be wrench boosted to reach their maximum construction speed, and don't drop metal gibs when destroyed. Before 2015, however, not only did they always build at their maximum speed, start out at 100% health, and automatically heal while building, but they also dropped metal when killed, making them ridiculously spammable and facilitating the very infamous strategy of just endlessly plopping them down in enemies' faces as they doggedly tried to work through them. This was admittedly super annoying, and Valve was right to nerf it. This old version is where most of the modern day vitriol for the Gunslinger comes from. However, considering that most of these aspects were changed close to a decade ago, I think it's worth analyzing the Gunslinger for what it is and not what it was. And as for what it is, I think it's a pretty damn cool unlock. For starters, before getting into anything to do with the mini-sentry, this thing's base level stats and animations are pretty cool. Bringing the engineer up to the medic's base health value is an incredibly useful bonus for equipping one unlock, and while it doesn't cause him to cross too many important damage thresholds, it can absolutely be the linchpin that allows you to survive some very sticky situations. The niche of battle engineer sometimes gets criticized for just being a slower and less mobile scout, but having 150 health can easily allow you to beat these allegations. And speaking of beating, I fucking love this weapon's attack animations. While it is true, Heavy also punches enemies, his punches often feel sort of limp, kind of like weak little jabs, whereas Engineer's Gunslinger punches feel more like... It is undeniably hilarious and viscerally satisfying to dome someone with a Gunslinger punch, and may just be my favorite thing about the weapon. Hey there, this is Opal from the future here. I scripted this video before the summer update came out, and I had this whole section about the Gunslinger 3-punch combo mechanic not really working due to the lack of lag compensation scripted, but then Valve actually fixed this in the summer update, which alongside the gas passer thing might be the closest thing to a balance update we've gotten in TF2 in many years. So it actually works now, and I am eager to try it out more. Let me know if it works for you. Both of these stats work in unison to articulate the Gunslinger as the aggressive engineer's melee weapon of choice. The extra health and focus on melee attacking enemies makes it clear that this is a more combat and survival-oriented engineer option, and one that rejects the typical turtling engineer playstyle in favor of getting right up in enemies' faces. Full disclosure, out of every subclass we'll be discussing in this video, the Punch-Engineer is far and away my favorite one. It's just so goddamn fun to roam the map, making like Homer in that one last exit to Springfield scene. And that's not even mentioning the key trait of this weapon, which is the thing that really defines its existence: the combat mini-sentry. Mini-sentries are one of the great dichotomies within TF2. When you're using these or have an engineer using them on your team, you'll probably love them and their unique brand of non-committal area denial. But when you're fighting against an especially talented mini-sentry using engineer, well, that'll decide whether or not you're cut out for TF2 or need to go back to Overwatch. Simply put, these things are deceptively strong in the right hands. While it is true they're not nearly as spammable as they were a decade ago, and they're physically weaker than a level 3, that does not mean they're at all useless or gimmicky. Putting a mini-sentry in an impactful location can be the thing that wins you a game. Imagine for a second that you're a scout, a roaming soldier, a spy running low on cloak, or some other flanker, and you've managed to adeptly sneak behind enemy lines. You're getting ready for a clean flank when suddenly you hear those accursed little beeps.
Oh, this ain't good.
The mini-sentry is the thing that keeps overly aggressive enemies or flankers from encroaching on your team's turf, even if it's not securing kills, and it's consistently great for softening up enemies for nearby teammates and putting the fear of God in them when it comes to pushing forward. You might be thinking, well, doesn't level 3 do that even better? And to that, I offer you the advantages of disposability and stealth. The most valuable things about mini-sentries are that they're small, cheap, and deadly, not unlike a razor blade stuffed Halloween candy bar. Costing only 100 metal and a few seconds to plop down, the mini-sentry offers so much impactful area denial for so little investment that it's no wonder they're every scout main's bane. When you've built a mini-sentry, you still have enough metal for either a dispenser or an entire set of teleporters, allowing you to comfortably support your team without committing to an overly resource-intensive defense. I'd personally describe the mini-sentry as the ultimate aggressive defense in TF2. TF2, allowing you to adeptly close off specific areas of the map to enemies with a speed and efficiency that doesn't slow you or your team down. There is so much to gain from a single well thought out mini sentry spot, and very little to lose from a poorly thought out one. And considering how small and inconspicuous it is, even with that little light on top, it's very common for enemies to simply not realize where they're being shot from before it's too late. There are loads of incredibly BM and cheeky sentry spots to take advantage of in TF2. The world is your oyster with this weapon. And you may be thinking, well, isn't it super weak and easy to destroy? It only has 100 health, which means a single huntsman arrow, direct hit rocket, or pipe kills it. And yeah, that is true, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, as it leads to incredibly non-committal repositioning and a very funny combo. The disposable nature of mini sentries and their habits of getting a few kills or assists before being taken out makes them a fantastic pair with the Frontier Justice. And even if you're not patrolling the map with revenge crits, a mini sentry getting found and destroyed just opens up a clean opportunity to place it somewhere else unexpected. Enemies have to be on their toes and facing a competent gunslinger engineer. One of those little devils could be around any corner, in any bush, or on any roof. And even if they kill it, another one likely isn't far behind. And what's crazy too is that even with all of this talk about offense and aggressive play, the gunslinger can absolutely put work in as a defense tool as well. In situations where you have another cooperative engineer running level 3s, or in especially fast-paced games where you can't commit to a whole level 3 before the match shifts, the gunslinger can make for a fantastic short-term area denial tool or companion to your team's dedicated defenders while things calm down. I wouldn't recommend it for long-term defense if you're the only engineer on your team, but in the short term, while things are heated, it can be surprisingly effective. This really is what's on the tin, a mini sentry, with all the traits you'd expect to come with that. It denies areas and keeps flankers out just as well as a level 3, just on a more compact and psychological level. All in all, the Gunslinger is one of the most multifaceted and loaded singular unlocks in TF2. If you're not using the Jag, this is the clear choice for an aggressive, forward-playing engineer who wants to be on the front lines but also still provide support to their team. And while I definitely do understand its reputation to some extent, it can be very annoying to deal with, I wouldn't say it's at all in a position anymore where it's unhealthy or bad for the game. If you're regularly getting killed by mini-sentries, just play more carefully, stick with your team, and be more observant. It may be the fun police weapon, but it's far from broken or overtuned anymore, and there's a reason you see so many people run it. The Gunslinger is a neat little weapon that brings big gameplay perks in a small package.
I love that little gun.
It's not the boots, it's the bootee. I mean the person in the boots.
And our final item for this video is a little bit of a weird one, as I've never actually discussed this specific kind of item in the Weapons Subcategory series before. This is Demoman's Alibaba's Wee Booties, a pair of vintage Middle Eastern inspired shoes that are decidedly not a weapon. These are a type of TF2 item known as a passive weapon, or one that takes the place of a class's entire item slot in exchange for passive buffs that are always active. Instead of a weapon you need to pull out and shoot at people to do damage, you have a tool that occupies your entire item set that's bonuses are always in effect. These items tend to be pretty hit or miss in TF2, like Sniper has some real stinker ones, and I don't know how many people are big fans of the base jumper, but in the case of Demoman's shoes, these things are pretty neat, because I don't feel like we give them the dues they deserve. Let's dive in. The Alibaba's Wee Booties are an unlockable primary weapon for Demoman. A pair of steel-toed boots in the place of Demoman's normal shoes, this item's primary use case is enabling his fabled Demo Knight playstyle. At all times when these boots are equipped, Demoman gains an additional 25 health, putting his total at 200, or the same as a soldier, with an equivalent overheal maximum of 300. In addition, this item grants Demoman with a passive 10% move speed buff if he has a shield equipped in a secondary slot alongside them, making him ever so slightly faster than a sniper, engineer, or pyro. Lastly, this item doubles Demoman's turning control while charging with a shield, and restores 25% of his charge meter on kill, which equates to a cool 100% restoration with the Tide Turner equipped. So, I said at the top of this section that I don't feel like we really give the Alibaba's Wee Booties their dues, and I feel like that statement might have confused some people, because demo players generally tend to equip these things all the time. Anytime you're going to play Demo Knight, you'll likely have these, or their reskin, the Bootlegger, equipped. More so than the shields or any swords, the booties are what turn you from Demo Man or Hybrid Knight into Demo Knight. These funny little shoes are essential to the pure Demo Knight playstyle. The reason we don't tend to give them their dues in my eyes is because I feel like we tend to take them for granted. We just kind kind of equip them to play Demo Knight and forget what they actually grant the subclass. And I think that's kind of silly because I think they give the subclass a whole lot to play with. To start us off though, I want to mention that you technically can use this item without a shield or playing Demo Knight, and that it certainly is a playstyle that exists. You are basically trading your entire primary slot for 25 more health and a pure sticky bomb oriented game plan, which I'm not personally too into and don't really see the fun in, but I'm sure someone will tell me how great and meta it actually is, and how it's amazing and competitive, and how they pub stomp with your 200 health sticky bomb launcher loadout, and how it's actually really good for sticky jumping and how I should try it. And then I'll probably send their comment in my friend server and we'll all laugh at it for a bit. But for real, I'm sure that there is some merit to the 200 health sticky only demo loadout, especially with how strong the sticky bomb launcher is, but call it a hunch that this isn't how most people use the Wii Booties. No, the actual intended use case of the Wii Booties is as the tool that enables Demo Knight. When you equip this item, you're basically flipping the switch for whether or not you'll be playing a subclass for that round. And honestly, I find all of the buffs that the Wii Booties grant to be really impactful and important for Demo Knight in both subtle and bold ways. When you're able to turn to reposition yourself while charging, that's the Wii Booties. When you're able to combo charge kills with the half Zatoichi and Tide Turner, that's the Wii Booties. When you survive a melee crit to stay in the fight for a kill, well, that's again the Wii Booties. For all the things that the shields and melee weapons do for Demo Knight, they're really allowed to flourish by the Alibaba's Wii Booties. Demo Knight did not exist as a subclass until this item was added in 2011. Anytime you're playing pure Demo Knight, you might not notice just how much the Wii Booties are helping you. Due to them being a passive item that aren't on your screen while you use them, it's easy to forget just how much they're enabling you to do. I've hyped up the Tide Turner and half Zatoichi combo a lot in previous videos, but I never considered or acknowledged that the only reason it works so well is because of this item's 25% charge on kill. The Wii Booties are also the thing that allow pure Eylander demo to start at Demo Man's normal health value. And guess what? The reason you're able to chase and secure kills on out of position light classes like snipers or engineers is because of the speed boost these boots grant. These things are like the epitome of that guy protecting the sleeping kid meme for Demo Knight, the thankless hero that really allows his subclass to function in the way that it does. I feel like we can tend to really mix up in our heads what weapons really define Demo Knight. We tend to think it's the shields or the swords more often than not due to the fact that they're the active weapons that we see in gameplay, but you can switch those out for a different shield or sword and still be playing Demo Knight. You can run the Eylander or the half Zatoichi or the Claymore and still be Demo Knight. You can run the Charging Charge or Splendid Screen or Tide Turner and still be Demo Knight, but you can't switch from the Wii Booties and still be Demo Knight. Well, you can for the bootlegger, but you get what I mean. This item is the condition to create the Demo Knight subclass. Whenever you say Demo Knight TF2 or watch an epic Demo Knight montage, it should always be remembered that the Wii Booties are the items that ultimately enable it. They're truly one of the most underappreciated yet popular weapons in TF2. All said and done, while I know this section was definitely a bit shorter and more prosy than my usual entries in this series, it really can't be said enough just how thankless the Alibaba's Wii Booties job is. Demo Knight is seen as a subclass defined by a whole loadout, a combination of items, but in reality, you really only become a Demo Knight when you equip these boots. Otherwise, you're just a hybrid knight, a fate worse than death. I feel like we should really take into account just how much this item does for demo when we talk about its subclass potential more. This is the Demo Knight item, end of story. So if you're ever gonna run around the battlefield using a sword and a shield, remember to take a look down every now and then, and remember which item really is the cock of the walk. Make way for Prince Ali.
Are you fucking kidding me? The millisecond I popped!
And that's it. That's the video. I really don't have much of an outro plan for this one. Usually I script some kind of a ramble about how the items loosely tie together, but this time I think it's pretty obvious. They all enable subclasses and they're all pretty fun. Even the family business, which I've had historically less than charitable things to say about, I came around on after finding its true niche and using for this video. So if you're ever a stick-in-the-mud curmudgeon like I am, and tend to view subclasses as just gimmicky throws, you should really give them a try every now and again. You might have some real fun and find a new playstyle that you didn't enjoy prior. Either way, thanks, hope you all enjoyed, hope you have a fantastic day before, during, and after watching, and I'll catch you all later. Cheers! Team Fortress 2 is a very mechanically rich game. When you've got 9 classes using any combination of over 100 unlockable weapons over a patch period of roughly 20 years, you're bound to run into some very interesting mechanics and funny mechanical interactions. That said, not every stat in TF2 is created equal. For every heal 300 health on use or on hit gain 25% Ubercharge, there are a wide variety of stats and mechanics across TF2's weapons that simply don't work as described. What, do you expect the stat descriptions Valve wrote down specifically to teach you how to play the game to be accurate? What are you, fucking stupid? In this video, I want to talk about some of these exceptions to TF2's typical functionality. I want to know, I am aware that Great Blue made 2 videos of similar concepts to these a few years ago, and while I do enjoy both of those videos, I want to take a bit of a different approach here. Great Blue's videos discuss weapon stats that were functional yet unlikely to matter in the course of an actual match, your 10% slower swing speeds and all that, or your straight up missing stats like on the huntsman or shortstop. I want to instead talk about weapons that either straight up don't work or are otherwise obsoleted by the game's other mechanics. Rather than pointless stats, we're talking about straight up invalid stats. That said, let's roll. Woo! Starting us off is a weapon that I'm piss scared to talk about on this channel because every time that I do, someone finds a reason to get angry at me for it. But to open this video, let's talk about the Force of Nature. This is an extremely fun weapon that's defined by its focus on mobility and displacement over straight up killing power, with its knockback being the core ability that allows Scout to throw off enemies and put himself in an advantageous position. To accentuate this, the weapon is intended to deal 10% less damage than the stock scattergun to enemies, which makes sense as you probably don't want the weapon that can instantly displace any enemy and grant Scout even more mobility to straight up one-shot any given class. That said, due to another stat that this weapon shares, it actually doesn't work that way in practice. In addition to its 10% damage penalty, the Force of Nature also features 20% more pellets per shot, which means that at point-blank range, a meat shot with the Force of Nature ends up dealing slightly more damage than the scattergun. Now, in practice, this doesn't result in a higher damage over time, as the Force of Nature's smaller clip size and lower reload does mean that it ends up with a lower overall DPS output, but the intended stat of it dealing 10% less damage per shot is certifiably incorrect if you're able to connect a good number of pellets. Even from medium to longer ranges, the higher number of pellets can result in more connecting and outputting more damage at that range than the scattergun. So while its overall DPS is lower, its actual per shot damage penalty does not function as intended. I sure hope the Force of Nature cultists don't find a reason to yell at me for this section.
I'm going to blast you into thin gruel.
Next up, let's talk about the Loose Cannon. This is, again, a very fun weapon that moves the goalpost of its class from straight up killing power to displacement and disruption. I love the Loose Cannon. I think it's a shining example of a fun out of 10 weapon in TF2, one that doesn't need to be meta or game defining because it's just so fun to use, but this weapon is also noteworthy for not exactly working the way it's intended to. I've previously described this weapon as misleading, and that's mainly due to its very funny cannonball model. This weapon's projectile model causes so many problems for the weapon that it makes you wonder why it doesn't just cut ties with it like a problematic Discord friend. For starters, its actual projectile hitbox is shared with the stock grenade launcher, meaning that the actual area to hit enemies with the cannonball is much smaller than the model size would lead you to believe. And more importantly, this weapon's proudly displayed 20% faster projectile speed is just straight up incorrect. Due to TF2's projectile physics and air drag mechanics, the cannonball model's size and bulk causes it to experience significantly more drag and air resistance while flying, resulting in a noticeably slower projectile speed than the stock grenade launcher. The 20% faster projectile speed is actually there as a means to articulate them covering for this, but it is still slower in practice than the stock grenade launcher. This is like a straight up failing on a stat conveyance level, as the actual mechanical function of the weapon is exactly the opposite of what the listed stat implies. I don't know why the Source Engine even factors air drag into its projectiles. Like, this video game world doesn't have actual oxygen that the characters need to breathe, but at the very least, you can say that it's realistic in a game where people can rocket jump. I also talked about both of these weapons in my Knockback Weapons video, which is a funny coincidence.
My fists, they are made of steel!
Next up, the Fists of Steel. In typical TF2 winner-stay-winning fashion, this popular meta heavy weapon has some pretty significant mechanical oversights that causes both of its primary negatives to not function properly. This weapon is obviously intended to be a face-tanking weapon that aids in Heavy's projectile soaking capabilities, while conversely being more committal to equip due to its slower holster speed and healing penalties. However, in practice, neither of these fucking work. For starters, any TF2 weapon with a holster speed penalty features features an exploit that allows the user to circumvent it by rapidly switching between your other weapons. For instance, have the Fist of Steel out, quickly switch to your Sandvich, and then switch over to your minigun. The act of doing this is faster than letting the full holster speed penalty of the Fist of Steel complete. This goes for every weapon in TF2 with a holster speed penalty. The game's generous weapon switch speed allows you to mitigate anything that holsters slower. In addition, this weapon's overheal penalty only applies if the heavy had the Fist of Steel out when the medic started healing him, meaning that having any other weapon active and then switching to the Fist of Steel completely negate the overheal penalty. With some very simple communication or conveyance to your medic, you can adeptly capitalize on this and 100% ignore this weapon's only negatives. So yeah, if you ever find yourself being annoyed by the Fist of Steel's restrictive negatives, just remember that half of them do not work. You still get murked by melee attacks though.
Another satisfied customer.
Next up is another popular meta melee weapon with stats that are directly counteracted by another one, being the Jag. This is the Engineer Wrench, even after multiple rounds of attempted nerfs by Valve. I feel like they didn't really realize what they were doing in giving this thing a faster swing speed, as Engineer has more to gain from swinging his melee weapon faster than any other class. It allows him to attack, upgrade, repair, and build significantly faster, and is all around the thing that enables the offensive level 3 Engineer playstyle. That said, Valve did attempt to give this weapon a few concrete downsides in a lower damage, a lower building damage, which results in one extra swing needed to destroy sappers, and a lower repair speed. Seems pretty damning, however, this weapon's faster swing speed tends to pretty comfortably counteract all of them. While it is true these negatives do function properly, the faster swing speed on the Jag pretty comfortably counteracts them, either significantly cutting their threat level to straight up mitigating them. The nerfed repair rate specifically is especially counteracted by this, as the faster swing speed of the Jag results in more swings connecting and more repairing being doled out faster, which makes it so that its overall repair rate isn't too much lower than the stock wrench. The time it takes to do pretty much anything with the Jag isn't too far off the stock wrench even with these downsides, just because of the swing speed. This is one of those sleeper stats where its true nature isn't fully understood until you've used it for yourself. Engineer has so much to gain from attacking with his melee weapon faster, and any stat that attempts to counterbalance it will at least be partially mitigated. There's a reason that attack speed is such a valuable upgrade in MBM.
Piss off, you mongrels!
As our second to last weapon in this video, I want to discuss perennial Ullapool favorite, the Sydney Sleeper. This is a pretty notoriously not good weapon, yet one that I cannot get enough of either way. It is true that debuffing enemies on sniper shot rather than straight up killing them is almost entirely useless, and just extends the amount of time it takes for a sniper round to kill them, but also it can still one-shot light classes, and it's still great for inducing psychological damage on your enemies. That said, geez, I've said that a lot in this video, one thing that I will wholeheartedly agree with is useless on this weapon is its Jarate interaction. Getting a headshot with the Sydney Sleeper will slightly fill up the sniper's bladder, reducing your Jarate cooldown by an astronomical 1 second. When you combine this with Jarate's 20-second cooldown timer, this means that it would take 20 shots or just under the Sydney Sleeper's entire ammo reserve to completely refill your Jarate. Lastly, the Sydney Sleeper was originally in an item set with a Darwin's Danger Shield and not the Jarate, so this stat just kind of seems like putting a square peg into a round hole to begin with. So yeah, while this stat does technically function as intended, it's remarkably useless and arbitrary in practice, and really only exists to add more blue text to this woefully disliked weapon's description. Not every P weapon needs to interact with each other.
Hey, I can see my base from here!
And lastly, to loop back to Scout, because I was originally going to talk about the Spycicle here before I realized that they removed its useless silent killer mechanic 9 years ago, I want to talk about the Atomizer. This weapon received a very funny yet very meaningless buff back in Jungle Inferno to always mini-crit when the Scout is airborne. While this might make you think that you can take on the role of a market gardening bird Scout, I wouldn't be so hasty, as a mini-crit with the Atomizer does exactly 10 more damage for a total of 40. While that one-time 10 damage boost might make a significant difference in a fringe situation, it's worth noting that, due to the Atomizer's baked-in damage penalty, an airborne mini-crit with it will only do a whopping 5 more damage than a swing with the default bat. And when you consider that you'll likely only be landing 1 or 2 guaranteed mini-crits before hitting the ground with the Atomizer, and that the stock bat deals unconditional 35 damage at a base, you'll consistently be dealing more damage over that time by just swinging at enemies with the stock bat, rather than going for fringe Atomizer mini-crits. This assumes you even want to hit enemies with the Atomizer to begin with, which from my experience is generally used as either an escape or mobility tool and not a damage dealer. You could just shoot enemies with your 100+ damage shotgun as well, so while this stat was added in good faith, it is still very useless in practice. At least you can still be a piranha with it though. What are you, fucking stupid? And there we have it, some TF2 weapons with almost completely invalid, useless stats. Again, I tried hard to make this video different and interesting compared to Great Blues. TF2 has a surprisingly large lineup of weapons that don't work either as listed or as intended, so I hope you were either educated or entertained by this video at some point. Either way, thanks, hope you enjoyed, hope you have a fantastic day before, during, and after watching, and I'll catch you all later. Cheers!